Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Deku Became Yuri's Guardian. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fan. There was a lot Yuri couldn't remember. She remembered the day the scary man in his mask took her into his custody and hurt her. Many days before that were hazy on her mind, and several after it felt gone too. The big caterpillar man with the scarf called it something, Torama something, but that it was entirely normal for someone who went through something bad. He also said it was a good thing that she couldn't remember some things. But her daddy had his hands over her ears when he said that, so she wasn't supposed to hear it. But she did, and she asked him what the caterpillar man meant when he called it good. Her daddy, the greatest hero of all time, Deku, was surprised and looked scared when she asked it, and she had to explain that she could still hear the talking as it was happening. Deku had a hard time answering since his mouth was moving too much to make words. But he got himself fixed and told her they thought it was good that many of the bad things that must have happened were lost to her mind. He wasn't happy with what the Birdmen had done, and he wanted to help fight her nightmares of them, and he was worried and mad by how much they must have done. Daddy talked faster than she could keep up with, but he always looked so focused like he did against the bad Birdman that it made her feel safe. But he was even still kinda happy that she was able to leave behind some of those days. But Deku didn't like talking about that, so he had moved the talk onwards to a movie night and got Yuri happy and excited to see something new. It was an old film, one made with something called animation, and it was about this kid who was this princess who lived on an island with her family and all these other people who sing, and then the princess gets this boat and goes out to sea and meets this big man with drawings on his body and who turns into animals like a bird and a fish and a shark and a curved wooden stick, and then they travel together and fight coconuts and a big crab and a big fire monster who turns out to be a big grass lady, and everyone is smiling and happy, and Yuri really liked watching it. And then the movie got Yuri thinking. Princess Monoma had a nice family, complete with a mom and a dad and a grandma and a pet chicken. They all really loved each other. Then Yuri looked to her family and saw it not being the same but still being all love. She had Daddy and Uncle Mirio and Auntie Inko and Uncle Yajanori and Auntie Mitsu and all of Daddy's friend who were really nice, but she wasn't approaching them yet. And Auntie Mitsu had a husband, and Auntie Inko and Uncle Toshi looked really close. But Daddy didn't have someone like that. Deku didn't have someone like Monoma's parents did, or Katsu's parents did, or a lot of parents did. Not that Yuri noticed. He had her, but not someone else like them. Did he have someone like that in his heart? Alien Queen was a very loud lady. Yuri liked her, she really did. Alien Queen was nice and always smiled and always gushed about how cute she was in the light yellow and blue and green dresses she got to wear. But her voice would always be really loud when she wanted it to be, and she moved, she was really loud too. Mina said she got that a lot. People telling her that her voice was always loud and that she moved in a way that mimicked her words and nice emotions. She was apparently a really loud girl growing up, and it contrasted a lot from Yuri when she wasn't alone with Midori, but Mina still really liked Yuri even if she wasn't talking all that much. She was spending more time with Mina around her and Deku ever since she offered her smile and helping Daddy get stronger while he helped Mina study. The girls spent a lot more time in their room studying with Daddy while Uncle Mirio was helping Yuri with her own studies. The pink girl liked the study times, since she had never really got to talk with Uncle Mirio before, so they got to talk more and smile at each other more. And Yuri got to see how smart Deku was. He had a lot of words to say when helping Alien Queen learn, and a lot of big words she didn't understand or know, but he looked so focused and determined and smiled when his eyes were on Yuri, so she thought it was cool. Alien Queen whined a lot and Deku worried a bunch trying to get through their homework, but after a while it would always end up with Mina bouncing and smiling and hugging Deku and saying thanks and such. And when they could, Mina would take Deku and Yuri with him to a larger room somewhere in the school. Mina called it a dance studio where people were allowed to come in and practice dancing, kinda like how they were practicing math and English in Deku's room. And Mina really wanted to help them with it. It's just Deku was slow to say yes. Mina, I'm not sure how this is supposed to help me with my quirk. It's fun to dance and all. I swear, I'm not saying it's bad that you like to dance. Nah, it's cool man, Mina responded with a smile and a swing of her hand. I should have probably explained myself about this beforehand. My B. The pink girl chuckled through her teeth, showing smile as Deku worked to cool himself down and stop his shaking. And you don't have to worry about saying what you think. I know you don't mean any harm. Besides, it's what we're here for. Deku blinked a lot of times at the girl in front of him as she took a pose like Yuri had seen heroes do in pictures. What do you mean? We're here because you, sir. Mina shot a finger forward to point at Deku, who jumped back surprised. Need to loosen up. Talking wise, you've improved. I remember you stuttering a lot back when we started out. You're here, and you've mostly gotten past that. She sounded really loud and proud when she spoke, but it really got Deku to smile and look any less confused. But, in fighting, you're still really straightforward and stiff. You're telegraphing and sparring, and you don't really do much out of the ordinary when you get to use your quirk. What does that mean? It means I am going to teach you how to loosen up and move your body more. Deku stood there silently, hands playing with the helm of his big shirt as his eyes blinked rapidly and his mouth flapped to speak. Oh okay, but what does that have to do with me controlling my quirk? You said before you've had to keep doing physical strength and weight training to get a better handle on using your power quirk, right? Deku gave a slight nod of a response, eyes darting to the side to where he sat against the room mirrors watching the two teens talk. Well, maybe doing aerobics training could benefit you too. The more ease you have using your body, the more ease you have using your quirk, and maybe the more of it you'll be able to use. Deku looked to the ceiling of the room, face stoned in concentration. Did that help you with your quirk? Kinda, Mina announced in a cheer to jump the two others in the room for the moment. I had to continuously practice with creating acid so I could make more in one go without hurting my hands and feet. But also learning how to dance helped me move my body more freely and sporadically, so it's not only easier to use but I get to do more with my acid. My quirk and my body aren't as fully fleshed out or all over my body as yours is, but doing stuff that was more for mobility than lifting strength makes it easier to do more with my body and quirk. The alien queen let out a small snort and lowered her head. God, I think I butchered my explanation of all that. I don't know how you can do that so easily. And she was whining again, but Eri found it funny to watch someone older act so younger. Did any of that make sense? Yeah, I think I understand. His head hadn't lowered from its position, but the face Deku was making had softened. My quirk is a very strength-based quirk, same as yours is a very destructive quirk, being acid at its most basic. I've had to do a lot of training so I had a body fit for handling the full power of it. Eventually, you've had to do the same, but at the same time you're able to use your quirk for mobility, both in scaling vertical surfaces and trekking across flat lands and hills. I've done some of the same since my internship with Gran Torino, and it's helped me move around the same way. His head lowered, eyebrows furrowed and eyes slightly less open to the pink girl. What would dancing help with? Combat. Mostly, Mina began. Yeah, you can run around and jump really cool. And even with your new big boots you look like you can do a lot in a fight. But whenever we've had to not use our quirks and take it easy in sparring and missions, you kinda stiffen up and go head on into them. You get nervous a lot and you're probably overanalyzing in that huge brain of yours even now. Deku sputtered, back curling down as his eyes and the corners of his mouth fell. It's a compliment, I swear, the alien queen was quick to state, waving her arms in front of her with the smallest of smiles. You're really smart all the time, but you do always mumble and take notes of everything, and it is super cool that you can do that. I just think that you think more than you act when acting really fast would get done what needs to be done. The room stuck in silence as Eri watched Mina and Daddy stared back at one another, with the latter leaning where he stood. Eri could see his mouth move and hear the whisper of his voice, just not the words he was saying. She could see his eyes change shape and shrink and darken and lighten in between his words, just not knowing why. And he continued to do that until his own laugh broke him out of it. Only his eyes weren't as bright as they usually were when he laughed. I have been told the opposite by a lot of people, he spoke out, turning his eyes back to the alien queen. That I act more than I think when I do things. One of his hands dragged along his face as he softened his laughs. And you see the opposite from me. Really? The pink girl held back her own laughs with the green boy. Oh yeah, you do kinda do that, don't you? The smile didn't leave her face, but her laughter was replaced with humming that sounded in the room, and Eri shook from the feeling in her ears from it. It was a weird noise. Then maybe you're just doing the opposite of what you should. Thinking too much when you should be acting and acting too soon when you should be thinking it over. Maybe you just gotta figure that out. Eri watched as her daddy lowered his head and looked to the ground, probably thinking again. He didn't hum like Mina did, but his eyes had a shine to them again as the green of them darted about, probably thinking about the pink girl's words, until they darted over and met with Eri's. She looked back to him, his face frozen in a flat look, if not somewhat sad and worried that something the pink girl had said hurt Deku, until his face grew and he sent her a smile, soft and comforting like she remembered and knew of him. He turned his head back to the older girl in front of him, widening his smile and rubbing a hand through the back of his hair with a soft chuckle. Guess I should work on that, shouldn't I? He admitted aloud through his chuckling. You know, that's actually really good advice. Thanks, Ashido. Call me Mina. The pink girl responded with a weak wave of her hand. Eri's allowed to do it. Might as well get the whole family in on it. The hand behind his head scratched faster as Deku gained a bit of red. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Midori. Anything to help you loosen up. Now onwards. I still have to teach you how to dance and I'm not backing down. Alright, Yuri stayed from her spot against the mirror as neither of them started to dance. Instead, the alien queen pushed Deku to the floor and got him to work with her on stretching, which according to the pink girl was always important to do before jumping into physical activities. As the two were trying to reach for their toes, Yuri copied leaning forward in her spot on the ground and trying to wrap her hands around her feet like the alien queen could. Only she couldn't reach far enough down her legs and gave up several seconds later. When she looked back to the two teens, they were staring at her, and the girl of the two invited Yuri over with a smile to join them in stretching if she wanted to, and another smile from Daddy that she would be welcomed if she agreed. And she did, taking a spot beside Deku and trying again to reach her toes. Nina stepped up to help, asking first for permission to place her hands on Yuri's back and give a small push to help her reach further down for a few seconds, and getting a nod from Yuri, who got a nod from Deku when she looked to him. She still couldn't reach far enough down, but she could get closer, and the girl behind her told her doing it more would mean she would succeed eventually. And not to mind that she couldn't do it yet, since Deku couldn't either. Which was then followed by the pink girl jumping on said teen and pushing him further into his stretch as he yelped and flailed at the body out of left field, getting the pink girl to laugh at his antics and infecting the girl beside them to smile as well. Her daddy was funny. Urara was a good cook. Deku told Yuri that Urara was there when they rescued her. She was off to the side helping other heroes save other people that needed saving. She was one of Daddy's closer friends. She was kind, sweet, had a big smile, and Yuri liked that in others. It made it easier to grow nice around them, to not be afraid of them. She still hadn't opened up to Urara, but she wouldn't cower away from her touch all that much. Deku said that was something Yuri could be proud of and that Urara would be there for her like he was. Part of that meant making sure Yuri was fed. Deku was always telling Urara she didn't have to do it. But the girl with pink fingertips often liked to cook something up for the little girl and bring it over as dinner or lunch or even breakfast if she woke up early enough. The food always tasted nice. Yuri liked her cooking and wished it wasn't so hard to give the girl a hug for it every time she looked to the taller girl's shining eyes and wide smile. At least she could watch them cook. Deku had to meet with Uncle Toshi to talk about something and wouldn't be around for a while. And he tried to call in Mirio to spend some time with her, but he wouldn't answer his phone. He was going to call more, but then suddenly Urara appeared in his struggles and opted in to watch over her while he was out. Yuri's daddy was hesitant to pass her over, but Urara told him a bunch it would be fine and she would love to watch over the younger girl while he was busy. Yuri was hesitant to say yes, but the idea was easier to accept with the promise of watching cake baking and making. So Yuri hugged Deku goodbye and got to sit in one of the tall chairs in the kitchen watching Urara and Sugar Man bake a cake together. The two had a bunch of food stuff lying around the counters, and their jobs consisted of Urara pouring together the dry ingredients and the liquid ingredients in separate bowls, and then Sugar Man mixing them into one big bowl at a time and then pouring that stuff into a bunch of little plate bowls. He made a lot and set them about, and when the two teen were done, Yuri was left looking at a bunch of plate bowls filled with chocolate mix. Sugar Man put the bowls 2 at a time in the oven and set the timer above it before turning back to find his classmate holding the spatula with Yuri so the younger girl could taste the chocolate mix. He sighed and strutted over to the two, hanging his towel over his shoulder and leaning on the opposite side of the counter from the two girls. So Midoriya left you in charge of watching over Yuri. Urara looked away from her, leaving the young girl to take the spatula into her grip alone and continue to lick away the chocolate in silence. Yep, apparently All Might needed to talk with him for a bit, and since Deku needed someone to do it, I jumped in and offered. All Might, Satu straightened where he stood and clapped his hands together softly. You know, sometimes I think those two are connected at the hip, though I get why All Might would want to be around Midoriya so much. Really? Uraraka leaned forward in her seat to her classmate. Why is that? Because Midoriya is secretly All Might's child. The two classmates and the young girl turned their attention to the front door of the dorm building, watching the two color-haired classmate walk inside and past them to the stairwell. Satu sighed and kept his body turning to keep his face towards the boy walking past. No, Todoroki, that's not what I was going to say. Every time we talk about this you bring that up. Wait, were you waiting outside the door just to bring that up? When did you even leave? No, and I didn't. Todoroki kept his eyes forward as he disappeared up the stairs. Good luck with the cake. Yuri watched as the bicolored boy left the room and turned her attention back to the other teens, watching as Sugar Man waved a hand in front of himself and moved his mouth without ever speaking, and Urara watching him too and holding back laughter. Yuri didn't understand what they were doing and went back to finishing the chocolate on the spatula. He's your friend, so I'm blaming you for that, Sugar Man finally stated, pointing a finger to Urara, who let out an "aw, come on" before he continued. Anyways, what I meant was that their quirks are so similar, so All Might's probably doing what he can to help Midoriya better use his quirk. All Might has the ability to move in the air with a swing of his arms to propel him, and we've seen Midoriya cause his own air currents with the flick of his fingers. He's probably out there now learning how to use that wind to move himself like All Might does, kind of like Bakugo does. Urara let out a low whistle and leaned down onto the counter. "Don't tell him you said that. Deku told me Bakugo doesn't like it when he copies his style, so it would probably be better to say he's just learning from All Might." "Right, those two have beef. Or Bakugo does. Has Midoriya told you about that stuff yet?" Sugar Man stepped back from the counter, turning to the oven and watching the timer atop it. "No, he hasn't." Eri poked Urara with the handle of the spatula, turning the taller girl's attention to the shorter one and giving her a small smile as she took the cooking tool. The tall girl hovered a hand to Eri and patted the short girl's head gently, and Eri responded by looking down and closing her eyes to accept the pat. "Deku hasn't told me what's gone on between them, but I bet it was Bakugo who started it. I doubt Deku could ever start anything that would have someone yell at him like that. I wouldn't put it past him," Sugar Man admitted, taking the spatula from Urara and moving it into the running water from the sink. "Midoriya can get fierce when he wants to. I would believe it if he took the competition between him and Bakugo too far when they were younger. I can't see that." Eri watched Urara move her hand silently, scooping up a handful of chocolate chips from the bag before them and bringing it closer to the young girl. She looked to the teen, who smiled down at her and nodded, signaling permission, and the young girl took a few chips of her own to start eating. "Deku's too sweet to do anything like that. I bet he always been like that. Of course you would think he's a sweet boy." "What? Nothing." Sugar Man turned back around as he wiped clean the spatula in his hands and stared at his classmate. Said girl started back at him, silently blinking and watching his smile grow by the second. Eri stared back and forth between the two, at the happy Sato and the confused Uraraka, before the teen girl's face lit up red and she jumped out of her seat, stuttering out words and yelling at Sato to take back what he said and that her words didn't mean anything like that, and Eri didn't get it, but she watched on anyways as Sato laughed and Uraraka flailed about, until the brunette huffed, grabbed the bag of chocolate chips and bolted to the stairs with them, a tall man with a spatula and towel chasing after her to bring them back to decorate the cake with them. Eri didn't move from her seat, plucking a chocolate chip at a time from her hand as she agreed with Urara. Deku was always sweet. Momo was a big girl. Eri could see how tall she was compared to Deku and a lot of the other people she got to meet that her daddy knew. Her hair was also really long, and Eri always saw it dressed in a way to show how much of it the big girl had. Close to some of the tall people in Deku's class, Eri felt dwarfed and scared by just their presence. Only their personalities didn't meet that scariness, and the tall girl probably had the most different to that look. Momo liked making things, and she made quite a lot of things for Eri. She made little dolls out of some of Eri's favorite TV characters and went out to buy a doll of another that Eri really liked and played with a lot. She also made Eri some clothing, little hats and mittens for the cold weather outside. Deku didn't seem to like that though, the latter that was about clothing, always trying to tell the tall girl that she didn't have to do what she was doing, but the big girl always insisted that she did and that she didn't mind helping Eri if it was something little to do. Momo was also really good at looks. She helped Eri's daddy learn how to tie her hair into a ponytail, since the young girl only trusted him to do that. She also gave Eri bows to wear with her dress colors, ones that complemented the color Eri was wearing. She was really good at making things and people look good. And Eri always thought she looked pretty when she wasn't dressed in the school uniform and got to wear all these other clothes the big girl had and wore around the dorms. Maybe that's why Momo was in charge of the decorations. Deku told Eri there was a New Year's party coming up for them, one they were planning on holding in their dorm building, and about everyone was pitching in on something or other to help make the party or bring something to it. And he and Momo and Ida, the one with glasses and pipe legs, were in charge of directing and decorating it. Eri didn't know why, and neither did Daddy, but it sounded like most of his friends trusted him and the other two teens to be in charge, and Eri could agree with that much. Ida had the list in hand, pencil in the other, going down the list they had written. Okay, so Sato and Uraraka have made and stored the cakes for the party already. Hagakure, Jiru, Kaminari, and Kirishima have been tasked with bringing in more food for everyone. Todoroki, Tsuyu, and Ajiro bringing drinks, and Koda and Bakugo are making the punch. Shiro and Shoji will make and hang up the decorations and the streamers. Yaoyorozu continued, waving a hand in a circle in front of her, and Aoyama and Ashido will be designing and hanging up the banner. Should there be more? Midoriya piped up, hands rubbing against his elbows and arms wrapped around Eri in his lap with her arms wrapped around the Cleffa doll Momo had given her. I'm not sure what else we could add or bring to the party. I feel kinda bad all we're doing is giving orders. What else is there at parties? Momo placed her chin on her hand and drummed her fingers along her lips. If there is nothing else to bring, you could offer to help one of the other groups, Ida piped up, gesturing a hand to his classmate across him. Eri followed the hand, looking up to Deku as his eyes slid between the two sets on him. I can't think of anything else we may be missing that would be important to have. We could have balloons. Eri shot her head to the taller girl in the room, looking between her classmates following her suggestion. Balloons are usually at a party. If we wanted, we could add those to the decorations. They are, Ada followed up, but I do not know if we would need any around. Eri turned her head to him, tightening her clutches on the doll as the two tall teens talked back and forth about balloons at the party before she looked up to Deku. He looked down at Eri as she let one arm go of the doll to hold his arm as she turned and met her big shining eyes with his. The two stayed silent as they stared at one another, and though her daddy wanted to ask something, his mouth stayed shut and kept his stare into the red of her eyes before rising up to his classmates and simply stating, "Balloons." The two teen looked with Eri to the green teen staring back at them. Ada squinted his eyes. "Balloons." Midoriya nodded. "Balloons." Ieyasu nodded with a look of approval. "Balloons." Ada looked between the two, looking back at him before his eyes lowered and found Eri's. "Balloons." Ada sagged his shoulders and gave his own nod. "All right then, we'll add balloons to the list. I can buy and set them up." Deku spoke up quickly, raising one hand to signal. "I can help with that," Momo offered. "All right. I realize we haven't signed Takoyami into doing anything. Maybe he could help you too with setting those up. What about you then?" Deku placed his hand over Eri's, giving it a small squeeze as his arms held her closer to his chest. Ada looked the list of roles and names for seconds, eyes running up and down before rising and staring into space. "I am opting myself to assist Aoyama and Ashido with the banner. I believe that they can do a good job, but I fear it may be a messier process than it needs to be." Momo hummed and rose from her hand. "You have a point. They could easily decorate the banner, but they will probably try to add too much." Her eyes moved down to Eri and stared at the short girl for a moment before her arm glowed and produced a red ribbon. Momo caught it, tied it, and leaned over to the young girl in Izuku's lap to place the red bow on her head. The hand lowered and patted gently on the shoulder of her green top, and the tall girl sent her a smile as she leaned back to where she was sitting. Deku gulped and nodded. "Yeah, probably. I trust them to decorate it. But they might add too many decorations, arguing it makes it prettier." He had more to say, but he cut himself short as he looked down to Eri, moving her hand about his and tracing along the scars his quirk had earned him. The hand rolled for hers to be in his palm, and the fingers curled gently over hers, with her eyes trained on the intertwined hands and oblivious to the solemn eyes down on her. Deku had been decorated too. Eri thought he was still pretty. Kyle was a really keen girl. Uncle Mirio had used the word once to describe Eri when she wanted to do well in their study sessions or make daddy happy. He explained to her that it was used to tell when someone was interested in something or someone. He thought it fit her passion and drive perfectly. He told Eri it was a good thing to have because it showed that there was something she cared about, and that was something people liked to know other people did. With that now known to the young girl, Eri could say Jiru was also keen. The older girl really liked her music and instruments. The girl also seemed close to the boy with yellow hair. And the tallest girl, so she was probably interested in them too. But she was also keen to Deku. Eri noticed how the purple girl would shoot looks at him when they passed, how closer she would get, and the talking the two teens would do when they were near one another. Daddy never mentioned ever getting texts from the girl, only ever telling Eri it was Urara, Ida, Uncle Mirio, or one of the adults. But he talked with them in person as he did over his phone. They were keen on each other. Kyo only did half of that, and Eri didn't know why. But Eri did know a keyboard looked cool. "This is the A key," Kyo told Eri, leaned over one shoulder and pointing to the white key in the row of white and black keys before the two girls. Eri stuck her hand forward, pressing a finger down on the key noted by the taller girl, and listened to the sound it made. The teen flinched and drew her own hand in front of the keys, turning a dial near the corner of the keyboard before retracting her hand. "Sorry, that was a bit louder than I thought it would be. Try it again." The young girl did, the sound coming from the instrument now softer to hear. The girl beside her nodded and straightened on her feet. "There you go. The keys are repeated after every pattern, so this key is also in a key, and you can follow this picture again to go either way down it. You can play with it as long as you want." "That good?" Eri nodded, looking up at the picture Kyo had placed on top of the keyboard that named the keys and where they were positioned for Eri to work off of. "So, Gyro." Deku was there too, sitting on the other side of Eri, watching her play on the keyboard, but also looking up at the girl who invited them into her room. "Why, you wanted to ask me something about my quirk." "Oh, right." Kyo crouched down beside Eri, sitting on the ground as Deku did and keeping her eyes on him. "You mentioned something a few weeks ago about your quirk that's been bugging me. Sorry I haven't asked this sooner." No, it's fine. Go ahead and ask." The purple-haired girl nodded slowly, turning her eyes away as Eri began playing with the keys to hear how different they sounded. "You said you couldn't use all the power of your quirk as you are now, that you can only use a fraction of it. Do you know what fraction that is compared to all of your quirk's power?" I use about a fifth or a fourth of the whole of it now, compared to when I was using it at the start of the year. Okay. Kyle licked her lips, but Eri kept the sight of the two teens in the corners of her eyes and kept focusing on the keyboard. But is that a quarter of what your full power is now or what it was months ago? One of the jack from Gyro's ears extended to her hand and was twirled around on a finger. Everyone's quirks get stronger, right? And people get stronger too. I'd figure that would be the same with you and your quirk, that the max amount of strength you can reach rises as you get better. Midoriya blinked at his classmate under the sound of Eri clicking away at the various keys of the keyboard to a dismembered tune. I guess. I haven't thought of it that way before. He clicked his tongue and crossed his arms and leaned back where he sat. I guess that does make sense that my quirk would get stronger as I use it, but I don't know if using it at the bare minimum would make the max of it stronger than before. Oh, right. That would make sense. You still have to push through using your quirk before you can push it beyond with you. Eri hit the keys again, following up the pitch of the black keys as the two teens watched on. So how strong are you now? Can your body get stronger as your quirk does, or could be training those separately? Separately, I guess. Deku poked a finger out and pressed on one of the keys, turning Eri's attention to it and pressing the one beside it. I had to train just my body in the hopes of being accepted here. And my quirk made itself known that I could begin using it once I was strong enough to handle the smallest fraction allowed. Oh, you have a situational quirk. I've heard about those. Actually, do you know of Oliver Clark? Oli, and no, I don't think I have. Who is that? Kyo turned where she sat, pulling her knees up to her chest and leaning her head over her knees. He's a British music artist from a few decades back, when quirks were still popping up and becoming common. His quirk was overlay. He could edit the sound of his voice like he was using filters and even to the pitch. He just didn't know he had it until he was in high school and getting into music that it popped up. Dude in an interview said he was introverted growing up and didn't speak out that much. But he put himself through and went through some vocal training, and then his quirk popped up out of nowhere in class and he used it to his advantage. I think that was one of the oldest cases of quirks like that. Pretty rare too. Aren't you lucky? Deku laughed a strained laugh, urging Eri to look over her shoulder at him. I wouldn't call myself lucky with what my quirk has done to me since I've been able to use it. It's a lot stronger than I'm able to handle it. Eri reached out a hand to her daddy, who blinked at it a few times before extending an arm toward her. She took his hand in her own and used her other hand with it to bring it closer and press against her cheek. Maybe. But the fact that you've pushed through the pain it caused you to keep using it means you're still pretty powerful yourself. Midoriya turned his attention away from Eri, nuzzling his hand to Gyro resting on her knees before the girl's eyes blinked wide and her head shot. That's deeper than I meant to go. Sorry. No, it's fine. Deku smiled at her softly and bowed his head. That means a lot to hear. Thank you. Anytime, she decided, lowering her chin back to her knees. Don't mention it, please. I don't need Kaminari on me trying to act more sentimental all the time. Well, that isn't a bad thing, Gyro. You better keep your lips sealed. Eri ignored the two teens as Deku fumbled about his words, and Kyle laughed in good nature, keeping her attention on the warmth of his hands and the bumps of his scars trailing down his arm. Eri's daddy was strong. Eri didn't know what to think of Mei. She had only met the metal girl a few times, and those were more so seeing the girl work and act than actually talking with her. The girl with pink dreads and goggles was always smiling about something and was always dressed in big gloves and a pair of goggles somewhere around her face. She once wore them on backwards, so the strap was around her forehead and the goggles on the back of her head, and Eri rightfully asked if she had eyes back there that needed the goggles too. It was the one time they talked, and Eri was rewarded with a hard hat to take home for her cuteness, as Mei put it. Daddy knew Mei pretty well. She had helped design his costume along with the pro hero she worked under, the one Deku had worn to save her, so she at least knew the older girl was a good one. But also, according to Deku, she was a bit fast and loud and got up close a lot in conversations, so that worried Eri from meeting with her. Finally coming face to face with her had been on hold for a good long while for her sake. But when Deku had planned to talk with the girl about his hero costume, Eri had decided she would come along instead of wait with someone for his return. So the two powered through together and went to the school's workshop with the door right open and the girl in question hammering away. Eri stood back and watched as Deku approached and talked with the other girl, turning her attention away from her invention. Engaging with her in conversation Eri couldn't hear over the noises around them. Somewhere in their talk, Mei had pulled him over to the table and picked out a roll of blue paper and laid it out in front of the two. So Eri got really curious and stalked over before filing between the two to see a lot of writing and drawing around a sketch of her daddy's hero uniform. Mei looked down to the young girl with a smile Eri didn't think was possible. Hey there, unicorn. Was wondering when you were gonna come over. How have you been? Eri hadn't heard anyone else call her unicorn because of the stub of a horn she had, but she knew what a unicorn was and she thought they were really beautiful animals, and it felt nice to hear that directed at her, so instead of vocalizing a response, she blushed and huddled against Deku's leg and sighed while keeping her eyes on the blueprint in front of them. Midoriya placed an arm around her, cupping a hand behind her shoulder and patting her blue dress lightly. Yuri's been doing well, he answered for her, letting his gaze drop to the short girl. She's been growing comfortable around my classmates, but she's still shy with talking. And that's fine. It's nice to see her be comfortable here. Yuri took a handful of his shirt and tried to hide her face against it. That's fantastic. Mei was also pretty loud like Alien Queen, even doing the big poses the pink-skinned girl did. Maybe it was a pink thing. It's great to see this school's third family dynamic catching up to speed. Third family, Dina. What are the other two? Neither here nor there. Anyways, Mei slammed a hand down on the blue paper, jolting the father-daughter duo in place. You said you wanted to fix your mask, right? Well, I bet I know what you're thinking of then. What you need is a multi-purpose air supplying unit in its place. That's exactly what I was going to ask for. Yuri shifted her head slightly to look up at the teens looking at one another. Right now, it's kind of just there for decoration. It hasn't really served that much of a purpose when I've done hero work, so I thought, maybe for water rescues or fire emergencies and such, having a device to help me keep my breath for longer to help if I'm around to would be better for my suit and just further down the line. Excellent then. I've been thinking about giving you one. Only Power Loader isn't letting me make the equipment myself, and getting the devices for the mask are hard to get at the moment, so having it officially added to your uniform won't be happening for a while. Deku blinked a few times over before tilting his head with a hum. Why do I feel like that isn't the end of what you have to say? Mei laughed in a way that concerned Yuri, so she snuggled against Deku more and his hand moved up behind her head, and she just wanted to fall asleep now that she was comfortable under his protective hold. Because I, the humble genius that I am, went ahead and built a functioning air breather in the design of your mask for you to use until it's officially added to your suit, along with goggles to go with it, just in case you need them for swimming and smoky encounters. You did. Is that allowed? The mechanic turned on her heels and walked along the line of desks to a basket with metal and devices piled inside. As long as you don't take it to the field before the real deal comes in, yep. You can practice here on school ground, though, as long as it goes through test runs. This is entirely legal and conforms to the school rules. I made sure to check. The top half of the girl disappeared into the pile with the sound of heavy shuffling signaling anything was happening where she went to. All right. Deku's hand curled through Yuri's hair, brushing it along and behind her back instead of over her shoulder. Will it work? It should. I've run it through, found it. The girl with focused eyes popped back out of the pile with a ring of white and gray in her hands, and connected to it a box of plastic with a think string attached to it. I tried it myself to make sure it works while I was working with the power tools. I don't know how well it works underwater yet, and I've worn it in heat, just not actual fires, but it should be functioning just fine under those conditions. The girl sped back to the small family and handed the mask against Deku's chest. Here you are, 10 million. Your new and improved but not yet official hero mask. Title's a work in progress, he mumbled, taking the device from her hands and examining it in his own. So I can take this and practice with it? As long as you come back to me with results, it's all yours. Hatsune jumped and sat atop the table and blueprint beside them. Need anything else from me, hero? No. This was everything. Thank you. Midoriya colored his face red as he held the mask under one arm and kept the other around his daughter figure. Sorry for coming by for something so short, but I've been wanting to talk with you about it. Don't worry about it, Midoriya, the girl announced in her smile, crossing her arms in the process. It's my future job to furnish you guys for the field. Come by whenever you got something to ask or demand. I'll get it to you. Thanks, Hatsune. Midoriya strained his return of the smile, sliding his arm about Eri until he had her hand in his. Ready to go, Eri. The girl attached to his hip nodded and grasped his fingers close to her head as he guided her out of the workshop. Thank you again, Hatsune. Have a good day. Anytime. Oh, and tell Tenya and Uravity to stop by sometime. I have some ideas I want to run by them for their uniforms. You'll be pro heroes in no time. Will do. The father and daughter walked out the workshop and turned down the hall, leaving behind the sound of metal clanking together and the faint laughter of the girl in the shop. Both Eri's hands took a hold of Deku's, holding the appendage against her head and fingers brushing along her face gently. It was nice and warm against her, and looking up at the smile he held down at her made it warmer. Her daddy was already a hero. Shadow was scary. He wasn't a bad man. Deku trusted him, and he trusted Daddy, but Eri didn't trust him. Shadow was too serious, too cold. He didn't smile, but he did. But his actual smiles were too small to be smiles. And he didn't laugh, just breathe when everyone else was laughing. Eri didn't know why he wouldn't, but he seemed very closed off and it made her suspicious. But Deku did trust him. Anytime the two got to talking, they talked. Eri didn't know if Shadow was honest with what he said, but Deku trusted him, so she would at least believe that the double color man was being honest with her daddy. If the man was kind, he was at least kind to Deku. But the fire Shadow was holding in front of Daddy's face was concerning. Eri got to watch from a safe distance as Deku took a test run with the mask Mei had given him the day before. He had asked Shadow to help him try it out, and after some explaining the other boy had agreed. Deku has explained he had tried it underwater and knows that doesn't deepen and enter his lungs. And he wants to try it under heat and smoke, so he needed Shadow for that. The two-colored boy was against setting anything on fire, and Deku agreed and asked that he just set his arm on fire and let the smoke build up in front of that to see if the smoke was filtered out too. So there the two boys stood, one with his arm extended in a blaze, and the other with a mask and goggles standing directly in front of that fire. Eri sat near the entrance of the training grounds, on one of the chairs they could find, sitting on her hands and kicking her feet and waiting for something to mess up so she could run in and get him to promise to never do something like this again. Eri didn't want Deku to get hurt, and she worried with every breath that the mask wouldn't work or the flames would get too high or Shadow's arm would get too close to Deku or something went wrong. It was probably why Deku didn't want her to come along in the first place. But Eri was smart. She knew she was smart, and she insisted that she went along to protect and prevent him from getting hurt. She didn't say it out loud, but she didn't trust Shadow enough to leave him and her daddy alone. Not when she could be around. Deku didn't look over at her, instead keeping his eyes on the prize that was the fire in front of his face. Shadow watched him and with him, eyes darting between the covered face of his friend and his own arm covered in flames. For a second his eyes diverted away and to the entrance, and then to the girl sitting in the chair beside it, glaring over in their direction. He only stared back in mild confusion, but said nothing about it to his friend and classmate beside him and went back to controlling the fire erupting around his arm. When Deku stepped away, Eri shot up in her seat, filled with alarm and worry. Shadow extinguished the flames he was producing and watched his friend in wait, as Deku removed the mask from his face and left the device to hand from his neck. Deku took a few short breaths before looking to his classmate and smiling. Eri could see it too, but it didn't ease away all her worries just yet. She was raring to bound off the chair and into Deku as he and Shadow approached, the former doing the majority of the talking between them, and she near jumped into Deku's arms when they approached and Deku crouched in front of her. Actually, she did just that. Deku gave a small laugh as he caught Eri, seating her in his arms as she worked around the mask to hug his neck. "You want to head back to the dorm, Eri?" he questioned her. "I told you it would be okay if you wanted to stay back. No one would have minded keeping you company." Eri kept quiet in the hug, settling for the shoulder alone to rest her head on. She closed her eyes and stayed quiet, taking in his warmth through her jacket without a moment's hesitation. Deku shuffled for a moment and asked Eri to lift her head. And when she did, she could feel something soft tap her chest and disappear. So she opened her eyes and found herself staring at Shadow, frozen in place with his hands hovering the jacket he had tossed over Deku's shoulder. Deku moves an arm away to work itself into the sleeve, so Eri rested her head back down on the shoulder, almost hiding behind it as her eyes bore into Shadow's. It wasn't necessarily a glare, but it was a look that held no warmth regardless. Shadow didn't return the look mutually, holding almost nothing in his eyes, judgment or other, as he looked into the red of Eri's. Deku shifted Eri into his other arm, moving her to the other side of his body as he put his other arm in the jacket. Eri helped him, tugging it closer to the center of his chest as his hand came out the sleeve. Deku smiled, leaning his face into Eri's and nuzzling her cheek with his nose, breaking her colder demeanor with a few soft giggles. "Thank you, Eri." Shadow stepped up beside him, closer to the other arm that wasn't holding Eri as he zipped up his own coat. "So that's going to be your new mask." The Midoriyas looked to Shadow at the change of topic, one less pleasant than the other, but Izuku let out the slightest of chuckles all the same. Kinda," he replied, shifting his arms to have a better hold and carry of Eri. "It's really just a prototype to what I want my mask to be. May's letting me test it so I know it fits and works how it's supposed to. It works under heat and around fire, so that's one of the tests down. The other was water, correct?" The child of Endeavor moved forward to the exit, with Midoriya in tow and Eri in his hands. "Yeah, but I haven't tested it under water pressure and depth yet. Not exactly the ideal weather to be doing that in. I would assume as such. Frostbite can be a terrible thing." Deku's head rose and tilted back ever so slightly. "Are you able to get frostbite?" Shadow turned back to look at him with a deadpan expression. "I haven't tried." "Fair enough," Deku resounded, flicking his head to the side. Eri fixes her hold around his neck to keep stable. "But yeah, water is what's next. I'm thinking it should work in the snow as well, but that isn't as big of an issue unless I'll be working the tundra or Arctic, I guess. Winter here isn't that awful to breathe in." Deku turned his face to the young girl in his arms. "What do you think about the snow, Eri?" The girl opened her mouth to respond before the doors before them were opened and the three entered the winter world outside. Immediately, Eri's attention was taken by the soft falling of the snow, reaching out a hand as the flakes fell into her palm. Deku smiled on as he watched her, walking slowly in the snowfall to allow her more time to watch it and be mesmerized by it. She stuck her tongue out, ignoring the two teens beside her as she tried to catch some in her mouth, and her daddy chuckled as she caught some. Her attention turned back to him at the sound, and the smile on his face got one to grow on hers. Sometimes I forget you're seen as her dad. The Midoriyas turned together to the shadow that had been watching them, the youngest hugging onto her daddy's neck in defense and the older blushing and breathing out a nervous laugh at the comment. Why yeah, she does do that. I don't mind it. Izuku tilted his head to press gently against hers. It's nice that she sees me that way. Eri nuzzled her head against his cheek, easing the smile on her daddy's face. I'm surprised at how good you are at it. And the smile fell, just enough that Eri could see it when she backed away and watched Deku as Shadow had turned away and continued walking. What do you mean? You're 16, in high school, training and learning how to be a pro hero and balance your quirk with your body. Finding a spot in there to be a dad sounds like it would be really hard, but you seem to be managing it just fine. Eri could feel Deku stutter as a whole to Shadow's words, though she couldn't tell why he did. But that look was gone in an instant and replaced by a soft smile to the other teen as Deku took forward again to follow. Yeah, that does sound like it would be hard. I guess I'm lucky enough that it works. His eyes turned back to Eri, who had been watching him intently for some time, and in his eyes she could see them soften for the briefest of moments before lighting up again as he placed a kiss to her forehead. Thank you for accepting me as such, Eri. The young girl dived into his shoulder with a blush, hugging onto his coat and digging into him to hide as he continued his way through the soft snowfall, hands holding on loosely but close to Eri to keep her comfortable and close and safe. Eri's daddy was the bestest daddy. Ida reminded Eri of a robot. His movements were not that stiff, but they were enough to make Eri believe he had more metal to him than his armor and legs. She didn't think he was more robot than human, given he ate and breathed and smiled. He was also really smart, but not computer smart, and he always seemed to gain something new when others were talking with him. He was also really kind and understanding, and also open to understanding more. Eri liked him. Deku liked him too. He told Eri that Tenya was one of his first friends at Yuei, and while they weren't the best of friends at first, the two had gone through a lot to become closer to one another. Ada was one of the first people awake in the dorms, usually getting ready for classes and on some occasion going on an early exercise run before he had to get to the first class. Eri only knew that because Deku did it too. He had small workouts he did from the chair of his desk that Eri would watch until he fell asleep, and some he would do on the floor too. And he went running with Ida too. The taller boy had sent messages to Deku on his phone, which the green boy would reply to and get dressed and check to make sure he was tucked in enough to keep sleeping until he got back to get ready for his day and hers. Most of the time, she was on the brink of passing out and did so not too long after he had left, or she would already be asleep and continue to be so as he changed and left. Only on the rare occasion was she still awake and not tired enough to fall asleep then and there and stayed lying in bed sleeping with her Cleffa until he got back. Or on the offset she was against sleeping, she decided to wait and welcome him back when he and Ida were done. Walking out of the bedroom by herself wasn't hard to do. She did so every now and again when she didn't want to bother Deku awake and had to be somewhere else. And for the brief moments where she was left without him or someone asked to look over her in his absence, she left the room to the common area to feel less confined. People were becoming more bearable to directly contact and be around. If talking was still off the table, the teachers and adults were easier to open up to, and a few seemed really weird and fun to watch. Deku's friends were growing on her, each interaction becoming easier to feel free in. But with all of Deku's floor mates' doors closed and no one on the stairs or in the common area, being alone just felt weird. Eri took a seat on the couch, hugging Cleffa to her chest and swinging her legs off the edge as she waited. Her daddy had been gone for a while already, meaning he would return not too long later. But that later was still a long while away, or it at least felt like such, and Eri didn't want to wait for him to come back. She wanted to welcome him back. She wanted to do something to welcome him back, and she had to figure that out, what he could come back to. What is something he would need? Towels. He would need towels. Eri hopped off the couch with Cleffa in hands and ran back up the stairs to the floor above and back into her and Deku's room, grabbing 2 towels from the pile he had in their closet, and carried them back down to the couch for his return. And then she found herself with 2 towels and a plushie in the position she was before and still not feeling like it was enough. She huffed and lowered her head onto her doll, thinking over again the things Deku would need when he came back. But what else would he need after a run? Water. Eri bounded off the couch again, keeping Cleffa in her arms and the towels on the couch as she headed into the kitchenette of the common space to grab a glass to fill with water and give to her daddy when he returned from his jog. Only the cups were in a high shelf that she couldn't reach without someone helping her. She huffed again, looking at the shelves and counters around her, hands fumbling with the doll against her chest as she tried to figure out what to do until she turned to face to big eyes of white with dots of black in their center. Kiro. Eri jumped into the cabinet doors behind her, startled by the sudden appearance of Isui, one of Deku's other friends. Eri hugged the doll closer to her face, hiding behind some of it on instinct, but Isui didn't move forward and stood in her place with a hand raised. It's just me, Eri. The older girl began in a soft voice, waving her hand up and down in a slow motion. Sorry for startling you. I only came down for breakfast. I wasn't expecting to see you here or sneak up on you like that. What are you doing up? Eri kept her face meshed into her doll despite the question. Asui was one of the easier people to be around in Deku's class. The older girl had been a big sister before, and she had offered herself the role as such for Eri whenever she thought she needed it. Eri never vocally appreciated the gesture, but she wasn't opposed to having Asui around when she wanted or had to be. Still, the other girl's blunt nature and blank dominant expression weren't as fun to be with. Deku was happy with Asui's offer, but he didn't push it faster than Eri wanted. He held the leash of their interactions until the young girl was ready to embrace them on her own. And even with the generosity of the frog girl, he continued to do so, just to make sure Eri was okay and comfortable. Is something the matter, Eri? Asui questioned some more, looking around the common room to see the lack of people around them. Where's Midoriya? Eri hummed against her doll and turned in place, her eyes leaving the girl in front of her to the door that led to the outside world. Asui followed her line of sight to the door, letting out a hum of her own in understanding. I'm guessing he and Ida went running. Eri only nodded before her mission clicked in her mind again and turned her attention upright to the cabinet with the cups. Asui followed her to that too, watching the girl spin her whole body around to face the cabinet too high to reach. Eri stepped to the side as Asui joined by, opening the cabinet and grabbing a glass to hand to the young girl beside her. Is this what you needed? Though shy, Eri nodded and set her doll on the counter and took the glass in her hands, carrying it to the fridge and using what height she did have to fill it up with water. When full enough, Eri took care with carrying it again, moving to the seats of the counter and setting it atop there before running back to her doll and taking it with her to hop on and occupy one of the seats. Sui watched the girl with intrigue as she went about her task, and thoroughly ended up not taking a sip of the water as she took her seat and turned her eyes back to the door. Midoriya and Ida were bound to return from any minute now. The frog quirk girl hummed in thought as she took a box out from one of the cabinets, taking with it 2 bowls and pouring the contents of the cereal into both. She stored the box back away, took from a drawer 2 spoons, and brought both with her as she took a seat beside the youngest Midoriya, handing one to her on the counter. The short girl watched the older approach, eyeing her in the bowl as the Cleffa doll rose up her chest. The older girl only smiled to the smaller one, softly and with warmth. You should have something to eat before breakfast, Asui told her. I don't mind sharing some with you. Eri wanted to turn down the offer and wait for her daddy to come back so he could eat too, but the voice of her stomach outweighed the voice in her head as she eyes the bowl of cereal untouched in front of her. A growl emitted from her belly and earned her a blush as the doll pressed to her face once again. But the sound was reason enough for her to reach out to the spoon and take the cereal presented before her as her meal. The 2 girls ate together without talking, the youngest of them slowly easing in her seat as she continued eating. The 2 sat in a soft silence before the door came swinging in, allowing entrance to 2 boys and the cold wind. The taller of the 2 closed the door behind them, shivering slightly with his friend as the boy in green let out a clacking chuckle. Thank you inviting me on that, Ida. The taller boy turned to his friend. Thank you for coming along, he responded, turning his head slightly to the window beside them. We are lucky the snow was forecasted to stay on the ground today instead of falling, or we wouldn't have had this opportunity. If the weather chooses to keep this up for the next few weeks, we may be able to. Oh. Izuku turned to look at his friend but stopped short of stopping on him as his eyes caught sight of the green and white towards the kitchen, and followed the gaze of his classmate to the 2 girls watching their entrance, the older of which was waving a hand in their direction. Good morning, Tsuyu called across the room, drawing the 2 boys towards her and Eri. Good morning, Tsuyu, Ida greeted back. And good morning to you too, Eri. The young girl looked onto him and Deku silently, only giving a curt nod to acknowledge the tall boy's words. You're up fairly early, or at least earlier than I have seen you been, Tsuyu. What brings you down here? I went to bed too early last night, the green girl replied, setting her spoon down into her bowl. My body got all the sleep it needed, and since I wasn't falling back asleep, I thought I could just start my day a bit earlier than usual. Eri turned the 2 teens beside her out as they shared their morning greetings and stories, then followed Deku with her eyes as he approached and walked around the counter to reach Eri. The green boy smiled and crouched slightly beside her, shooting a hand forward to tap her own. Good morning, Eri, he greeted her in a soft voice, somewhat strained as he took in heavy heaves of air. What are you doing up so early? I thought you went back to sleep. Eri didn't respond to him, staring into his warm eyes, and he did with hers before her head jumped in memory and her hands came back to her and shot out over the counter. She took the glass of water in her hands and turned back to Deku, holding the glass out in front of him as he straightened his legs. He blinked at the cup and her several times before smiling and easing the cup out of her hands and into his own. You filled this for me. Eri nodded and Izuku widened his smile, using one of his hands to cup her cheek and ruffle the top of her hair. Thank you, Eri. That's sweet of you. Yuri sat and accepted the hand on her head for several moments before she squeaked and jumped again. This time off the chair and around Deku to run elsewhere. Ada and Tsuyu, who had taken a pause in their conversation to watch Izuku and Yuri interact, continued watching with their classmates as Yuri ran to the couch, picking from it the 2 towels she had left there earlier, and ran back to her daddy and held the stack in her hands up to him. Izuku let out a sound from his lips of surprise before it became a grin again, taking a towel from the top of the 2 and tapping it gently against his forehead. You didn't have to do this, Yuri, Izuku began down to her, but that was kind of you. Yuri smiled back up to him before looking down to the towel still left in her hands. She turned back around the counter and chairs, walking up to the taller boy in the group and looking up to him. Ida blinked down at the young girl as she stared up at him and, with slight hesitation, lifted her arms and the towel in them towards the classmate of Deku. Ida sent a small smile of his own down to the young girl, taking the towel slowly from her and unfolding it in his hand. Why thank you, Yuri. I was planning on heading up to my room to get one for myself. Yuri smiled back slightly before she was lifted into the air and found herself seating in Deku's arms, throwing her own around his neck to keep herself stable. She was startled at first, but the big smile he wore right in front of her face eased her worries and had her enamored. That was very thoughtful of you, Yuri. The young girl collapsed into his shoulder, hugging him by the neck. Yuri zoned out as Izuku continued to talk to her and then to his classmates, the towel between him and the girl in his arms as he went upstairs to their room. He set the young girl back on the bed gently, touching her lightly on the shoulders to secure her attention and ask her if there was anything she needed before he left to wash up for the day. He picked out his clothes and asked her again, and grabbed his towel and asked once more for safekeeping before pressing his mouth to her forehead and heading off. But only for a minute, as he barged right back in and placed the Cleffa doll in her lap before heading to the showers. Yuri hugged the doll to her chest and fell back into the sheets with a light whoom. For her happiness, Deku was very thoughtful. Iji was an open person. Yuri liked him one of the most. He smiled a lot and joked a lot and hugged other a lot that Yuri thought he could be a good friend. Alien Queen had brought him over once to talk and have a Horn Buddies group meeting and went off about getting a pony to join their club. Deku watched from a distance to let Yuri try to interact on her own, and neither of the people beside her rushed her into conversations, but she still didn't talk out loud and kept to writing and drawing her ideas instead. Iji was a calm version of the Alien Queen, Yuri noticed. He had the same happiness the girl did, but he didn't jump and bounce as much as she did. He kept himself seated with the same wild smile and bright eyes, but he kept himself where he wanted to be during it. Yuri liked that more, not having him move around a bunch and not knowing where he would end up. He felt safer to be around than Mina, which was something, though he wouldn't beat Deku in that department. He did seem to try doing so in Hero Talk though. Oh, I remember this one, Space King. Space King. Last hero work he did was 3 years ago, by now. Quirk, gravitation. He was able to change how gravity affected him and was able to turn other surfaces and dimensions as his gravitational pull to run up walls and on ceilings and cliff sides. Aerial work wasn't too outstanding since he could remove himself from a gravitational pull but had a harder time maneuvering and landing during and after hero work. Deku paused, running a latex hand through Yuri's hair as he stared at the ceiling of the common room. His last legal job was in Russia, fighting off against a regular mob of bad guys causing harm in a hotel lobby and trying to take people hostage. Convicted 7 men at once, hospitalized just 1. And no ties to an higher governing body was found to be influencing the men into attacking then and there when they did. Wait. Kirishima put his hands up over the laptop screen, getting Deku to turn his head enough to look at his classmate on the sofa as he lied on the couch. Last legal job. I thought he was retired. He did retire, but a few months after that announcement, a vigilante in Dubai was seen running on walls and taking down common street thugs at night, and it was believed to be him since he stayed in Central Asia for his retirement, or was at least there when he announced retiring. It's only speculation though, because the man in Dubai was never caught or easily followed, somehow disappearing in the dark of night pretty easily. Space King took to hiding with his family after retiring, so no one's been able to question him about it. Iji brought his hands back and scratched his chin. I hadn't heard about that. I only remember it from the news a year ago by now. Several forums were talking about his alleged turn to vigilantism when it made it to headlines, so that alerted me to it going on while I was training. It should be on his page. Did you follow the link? No, not yet. I'll check. Iji got to clicking away, eyes on the screen as Yuri watched the two of them. Her head rested atop Deku's stomach as the majority of her body lied beside his on the cushions. Her hands were wrapped together on her chest while his, hidden beneath thin green gloves, were playing with her straightened hair with one as the other held her close beside. Oh yeah, you're right. They have a whole thing about that down here. They really haven't caught him, huh? Not that I've heard. Next one. Iji let out a low whistle. You really are all knowledge about heroes, huh, Midoriya? Bakugu's mentioned it a lot that I thought he was just bluffing. But you're 8 for 8 already. Deku let out a breath to start his laugh, and Eri looked up to see him shake and smile. Why yeah, it's kind of a hobby I had growing up, and I haven't had a reason to stop it. I don't do it as frequently anymore, but it's still fun to read up about heroes every now and again. I get it. Trust me, they're all amazing. Oh, Iji jumped in his seat, turning Eri's eyes to him after the happy sound he made. Here's a recent hero, Mount Lady. Mount Lady. Deku let out another small laugh. I was actually there for her debut show. Wait, really? Kirishima scooted to the edge of his seat, closer to Midoriya. I only heard about her on the news a few days after her appearance. What was it like? What was she like? What did she do? She came in and stole Kamui Wood's credit. The three sat in a silence for several seconds before Deku's head shot up. Wait, that's rude to say. Iji curled down on his computer with laughter as Deku's face lit up red and he licked his lips to compose himself. What I meant to say was, Deku restarted, Kamui Woods was there, fighting against someone with a shark head and a growth quirk, and they were fighting atop a railway line, and Kamui Woods was about to use his preemptive binding lacquered chain prison to capture them, but Mount Lady came in with her canyon cannon and took the man down in one blow, so the credit was given to her. That was her first appearance on the field. Oh wow, she pulled off that move that early. It's pretty famous with her. What was she like back then? Same as she is now. Deku's hand slid up Eri's back to her shoulder, curling around and rubbing it gently when she shuddered. He looked down to her, curling his neck to look at her eyes. Are you cold? The young girl nodded, snuggling closer to him for warmth as he sat up. Wait here, I'll get you a blanket. The young hero gently pried her hands away, standing as she stayed sitting and patting her hands, shoulders and head as he left her there to grab a blanket. The young girl watched him, anxious for his return, clutching and unclutching her trousers as he shuffled through the pile in the corner. Her gaze turned over to Iji, who almost on instinct looked up from the screen to meet her stare and sent her the warmest smile he had. She put an effort in to smile back, but in her struggles found herself enamored by the cut always hanging over his eye. For a moment her world darkened before the light was back, and so was Deku, wrapping a blanket over her shoulders and bundling the girl up in warmth. Her eyes moved back to Deku's, and the smile he had to her helped warm her up faster as she was lying back down. He sat back down beside her head, placing a hand on her gently, and re-looked to his scars. But they were under the long sleeves of his shirt and the gloves he had bought a few days ago. She took the edge of the blanket and tried pulling it over her daddy's hands and knees, and he noticed quickly what she was doing. You want me to join? The young girl nodded feverishly, and he made no hesitation to loosen the wrapping of the blanket and lie himself down beside her for the blanket to fit them both. Eri pressed her hands and head into his chest, finding herself a spot comfortable enough to close her eyes as his hands and hold washed over her again. Should we continue? Deku looked back over to the classmate who had yet to move, laptop in on his lap as he continued to watch the small family in the class. Sure, Midoriya responded, gently stroking the hair of the girl huddled against him. Kirishima gave his green friend a smile. With all the stories heroes have, I wonder which one will be the most famous of yours. His eyes darted back down to his computer. I bet they'd acknowledge you for the youngest dad to graduate from Yuei. I don't know if they'll. Deku let out a nervous laugh. If they'll ever hear about this, I'll spread the word for you then. Don't worry about it. Why, you don't have to do that. I know, but you deserve some public recognition for being a good dad. Kirishima, please. He retuned the voices of her daddy and his friend as she tried to fall asleep across Deku's chest. His hold on her was gentle, and the presence of him around made her warm and happy, and just being in his arms was enough to tell her to keep sleeping. Iji was right. Deku was good. Tokyo was kinder than Eri thought he would be. A few fears followed Eri around since the day of her freedom, many circulating around the monster at the head of it all. But sometimes his minions, his lackeys, would have something to say about it too. One of the many she feared the most was the short one, Mimikyu. He wasn't actually short. Eri knew that the small doll he took the form of was just a lie to keep his face hidden. Mimikyu was crazy and yelled a bunch, and he was creepy, and Eri never liked him. She never got around to that, and that made her happy. But his powers, his quirk, was also disturbing. She knew the nights where he took over something in her room to watch her and make sure she never left. She knew when the eyes were present and the life was there when there shouldn't be any life at all. It was uncomfortable, unsettling. She couldn't do anything about him without punishment, but she could never ignore him enough to feel safe and calm. It was why she was so terrified of Toko and his dark bird. She had seen the feathery classmate of Deku's a number of times, and she always found herself staring at him for too long. And she always found those memories coming back, just long enough to remind her of the man who sat watching her in the shadows, and it broke her. It was through her, one of the heroes in some papers on the Yakuza, that Deku got to learn of why his classmate scared Eri so. And Eri tried to act brave about it and push past it, but his hands were too warm and comforting, and it was enough to keep her honest with him. If there was a classmate of his Deku kept the relationship slow with, when it involved Eri, it was Toko. He tried to set her up with and around him the least. And any time she and the Birdman were around each other, Deku was there near smack dab in the middle. If Yuri was afraid, then her fears were to be consoled and her company only that which she was comfortable with. Deku insisted it. She and her happiness came first. She wanted to feel bad about doing that to her daddy and the friendships he had. But his comforting hold and soft voice didn't want her doing that. Deku loved her too much to let her take any blame. Even Toko agreed. Deku had told him enough about why she was scared, enough to know the surface-level problem of it all, and he was open to doing things differently when she was around to divert those fears. When she first met him, he stayed off to the side, very quiet in comparison to most others, and he favored sitting or leaning into the more shaded areas in the room if he had the option. But when everything was told, he tried more to be out there in front of her. He looked more awake, attentive but not focused to where she would think he was watching her with intent. Open but not in her face and jumping on her as Mimikyu did with people. Calm but not boring and eerie like Chisaki. His quirk was harder to be convinced over. Dark Shade was a lot louder than the Birdman he was connected to. It jumped out more, especially towards Yuri, and what she was told was in good intent and means to befriend, but Yuri couldn't see its smile. It was a small creature made entirely out of smoky shadows. And Deku told her its size changed with the light source it found itself under. The lack of light made it stronger and bigger, and the presence of light made it weaker and smaller. But it still wasn't calm enough for Yuri to feel comfortable approaching them. That didn't distance her from them. Not entirely. She would still find herself around and beside the Birdman every now and again. And out of courtesy he kept the Dark Shade away and contained from Yuri as to not startle and scare her. Though short, she could look Tokyo in his eyes when he talked to her before she had to look away. And spending a movie night with the most of Deku's class was one day she tried to do more. Deku had been more focused on his homework the past 2 nights, leaving Mirio to accompany her a while longer as his catch-up studies weren't pushing him for winter exams. But even when he was done, Deku said he was surprised how easy and short his tests were, only having to do writing things. A few of his classmates were the same, but it seemed several more were happy to have done what they did and called for a celebration together before everyone went home on Christmas. Several agreed for a movie night. And Sugar Man allowed one of the cakes he made for their return to the dorms during the break to celebrate the new year together could be shared during the film. Yuri stayed with Deku, who decided on staying with Ida, Urara, and 12 of his other classmates from what Yuri counted. They agreed to 2 movies that night and gathered in the common room to eat and enjoy together before heading home the morning after. Yuri got a seat on the couch with Deku, Tokyo, and Zero, with everyone else taking the neighboring sofas, couch or floor between them, all facing the TV. Yuri got her slice of the cake and took up on her daddy's offer to have some of his too when she finished eating before him. Yuri wasn't too into the movie, though. The heroes in it were cool, and it didn't look bad in the slightest, but she didn't find herself excited in it like Deku's classmates on the floor were. Mina, Pika, and Kiri were all having their own hush talk while pointing at the screen, only keeping it down when Uncle Katsu beside them kicked Pika to tell them so. Deku was watching it intently too, sparing a glance to Yuri every now and again before focusing on the screen for another several minutes. Yuri found herself watching the people around her instead, of Deku in his silence instead of his muttering, of Uncle Katsu and his 3 friends, of Urara, Asui, and Ida huddled on a sofa watching with little talking to one another, of Momo, Kaio, Zero, and Sugar Man sharing talk of the hushed question the creation girl asked aloud, and of Tokyo and his shade beside her, the former watching the film and the latter laying on his lap watching her. Yuri blinked at the soft glowing eyes of the shadow bird staring at hers. It looked at her in silence for a moment's notice, then turned its eyes to Toko and lifted itself slowly as it eased onto the couch in between him and the young girl. His eyes were on Yuri again, but all he did was wave a makeshift hand instead of vocalize a greeting. Yuri did the same, although her wave came stuttered and unsure of the situation. Dark Shade looked away to the film for a while before lifting slowly from the couch and looking at her again. "I'm sorry for scaring you last time," came its hushed voice, sounding muffled as though a cloth was over it. Yuri could still understand the words. "When Fumikage said you and Midoriya were attached at the hip, I thought he meant literally and got excited because I've never met someone like him and me before, and I acted rude and irrational. I'm sorry." His apology sounded genuine to Yuri. He didn't advance to meet her as he did before. He diverted his eyes down into the screen after he had finished speaking. The stubs that became hands on his side fiddled with one another. He looked nervous. He looked sad. Yuri knew what that felt like. Yuri curled her hands as she hummed, short and soft, and reached slowly over to Dark Shadow to place a hand atop his head. He didn't look physical, but there was a feeling to him that she could feel and that her hand could touch and pet, as she decided to do. Dark Shadow stared at her, eyes wider in surprise, but made no move to back away. "It's okay," she replied in a whisper, trying to emulate what her daddy did to console her. She didn't want to be afraid. "I'm not mad at you." She tried to find the words to say. "You just sacred me is all." She curled down in the cushion, closer to the shadow quirk. I'm sorry for hurting your feelings. Dark shadow rose in her touch only slightly, but she still retracted her hand as he did so. No, you don't have to apologize, he told her, still in his hushed voice. You didn't hurt my feelings. I almost hurt you. I should have been more mindful. Besides, I can be quite intimidating. It's only natural people can be afraid of me. Yuri frowned more noticeably, sinking where she sat. You're not scary looking. Dark shade followed her back into the cushion. Yes, I am. I think you look cool. Dark shadow enlarges only one of his eyes to make up for not having eyebrows. You can change your shape ... and you can stretch really far and ... and you pick up a lot things I can't. I think you're cool. The expression Dark Shadow was making softened and evened out as his head rose. You think I'm cool? She did, but she was still uncertain of him, afraid that he would jump on or at her. But that didn't mean there wasn't still a coolness to him, one overshadowed by his intimidating nature, one she hoped to see more often than that which startled her. For the sake of being better than that, she nodded to his question, and it seemed to liven him as much as her words would have. Dark Shadow rose higher by the second, muttering something to himself about how awesome he was, and only stopped when an elbow nudged him out of his thoughts. The shade and the girl turned their eyes to Takoyami, staring at his quirk and friend silently, only to move a hand forward and pat the shadow back down to his lap. His eye caught Yuri's, and the student of Yuei sent a small smile and a wink to the young Midoriya girl. She didn't know why he did it, but she thought the gesture was nice and smiled back ever so lightly. And then the night caught up with her and she couldn't hold back the yawn that parted her lips and pushed her backwards. Deku was there to catch her, eyes trained on her instead of the movie as they had been for a while up to then, as he eased her down to lie over his lap. He placed Yuri's head against his leg for a cushion, peeling off the jacket he had kept on for the night and easing it onto her as a blanket. His hands, invisible and covered by the green gloves, rested themselves atop her gently, patting and massaging her shoulders as she snuggled up against him for a bed instead of asking for the one upstairs. Yuri liked her daddy as comfort more, anyways. He was awesome like that. Katsu was odd. Yuri thought a lot of Deku's classmates were weird or quirky. Toru was a girl no one could see, not even herself. Yuri asked if she was copying the superhero from one of the old comics he showed her, but the smile and hug never answered her question. Shoji and his bat wing arms could do a lot, and the fact they could be eyes, ears, mouths and noses was creepy, and why he didn't show his own mouth was confusing. Aoyama was just always confusing, but the most confusing of them all was Deku's oldest friend, not by age but by time, or according to her daddy, past friend. Katsu acted like no one else, yelling at basically everyone other than her, calling people by nicknames like she did, only more wordy and less friendly, and never really smiling. What smiles he did have were creepy and Yuri didn't like them. But somehow she still liked him, kind of. If there was something she didn't like about Katsu, it was how he yelled at Deku. She could always see them out the window when they came back from classes, and Yuri always saw his yelling directed at her daddy and rarely anyone else. She wondered if people were familiar with the end Deku was on in their matches. Anything Katsu had to say to his closer friends were always short, while those with Deku seemed longer. It was like Katsu hated Deku, but Yuri knew that wasn't true. The morning after the movie was a short and quick one for Yuri and her daddy. They would return to the room only 2 weeks later, so there was little of vital importance to pack other than their clothing. The simplicity of their preparations did nothing to settle Yuri's excitement of a Christmas to celebrate. The last one she could remember wasn't a pleasant one, as Chisaki and his companions mocked the celebration of such. Now she had a father and aunt to celebrate the holidays. Uncle Toshi had promised to drive them to Auntie's apartment, and that was their goal for the morning. The tall skeleton of a man would be arriving soon around the time of noon with his car sitting in wait for the travel home. All they needed was to wait for his arrival. With both their bags packed with the essentials, all that was left was to wait for the signal that the older gentleman was ready, and they'd head on their way. Deku decided to take the time telling Yuri of more stories he had on hand. He still had a few hero stories on hand from when he was younger, and Yuri was enticed to listen. There were many tales of all might, rescues he had performed frequently uploaded online for Deku to have seen, fights he had performed both in front of the camera and stories only told in writing that sounded like legends with bows to match. But Deku had many more than him with stories to tell, of Endeavor and the assault on the Juggernauts, of Hawks and the burning tower in Isego, of Eraserhead and the spider-web bat fight. Down the line he had moved on to another hero. One Deku said was related to a classmate of his, Ingenium and the Road of the Art of Hands he called it. They were a group of mercenaries originating from England. His story began. The leader of their mob had been arrested prior, and it was believed many men tried to flee the country, not only after his defeat but before he was arrested. Whether it was an order of the boss or the men fearing the heroes, we have never found the truth to that. But what we do know is that the men who escaped tried going everywhere. A part of the mob was found hiding away in South America. Another had flown to Russia and traveled south into China just to throw off more of their trail. And the last known group came here to Japan. Only they weren't trying to hide. These men wanted to start their revolution again, be it by orders or loyalty to their boss, and slowly they recruited people here to join their cause. Yuri watched the gloved hands of her daddy as the fingers flipped up and down and the hands moved to and from each other as he told his story. The two of them were situated on the bed, with Yuri in his lap and facing the way he did to rest her head against his chest. His hands worked like puppets as he shared his story, and Yuri wanted to watch them intently as it went on so she could imagine it for herself. When they thought they had enough members, they took to the streets and eventually a national highway before setting up a blockade to announce themselves and what they wanted to do. They had taken hostage many families and individuals still in their cars, and the sheer amount of villains they had gathered together had scared even some of the heroes who were being called in to help save them. Izuku put his hands together, one behind the other with his palms facing the both of them and his fingers curled down just enough to cast small shadows down into his hands, and with even more thanks to the scrunching of the glove's fabric. But the first hero to arrive at the call for help was the turbo hero, Ingenium. One hand moved to the left, fingers still curled and facing to the right, where Izuku's hand held up one straightened finger, standing tall under the light. Ingenium had heard the call for help and made his way to the scene as fast as he could, thanks to his quirk, the engines on his arms. Just rushing in alone, he disarmed and knocked out 3 of the villains. Izuku took his lone finger and jabbed at his other hand several fast times. Ri jumped backwards into Deku from surprise. The body over her shifted slightly as Ri felt Deku's head and face press into her hair for a moment before rising. She sunk into his lap as his hands stood opposing one another again. The great hero Ingenium was alone at the scene, up against a horde of villains, and instead of demanding for a ransom and a deal, the apparent leader of this group ordered as many men as he could to take down the pro hero. You know how many succeeded? Yuri shook her head, looking up at her daddy as she did, and received a smile directed right at her before looking to his hands again, drawing her eyes back down to them too. Not. Deku jabbed his index finger into one of his curled fingers, and in doing so brought the finger all the way down to his palm. He did it again. Single, and again, one, and again, until all that was left was the thumb. With his hand now turned, sitting bent at the top, the index finger of the opposing hand towered close and over it, imposing power over the thumb, until all that was left was the boss himself, and the hero Ingenium standing opposite of him with all the other villains out cold from his assault. Does the boss try to fight too? Yuri asked, eyes darting between the 2 fingers. Izuku nodded, unbeknownst to her. He wanted to, but not on even terms. Instead, the boss tried to run away. Izuku moved his thumb away from his other hand, and take a person as a direct hostage to use against Ingenium. Yuri gasped dramatically, earning a small laugh from Deku. She had done some genuinely with the earlier stories, but every story had a turn like that and Deku seemed to like it when she did it, so she only continued to do so just to hear him laugh. But he wasn't fast enough to do so. Before he could reach to the driver of the nearest car, Ingenium had already dashed forward and grabbed the villain by his wrist, announcing, "If you." A ring from beside them cut through Deku's words and turned both heads down to the ringing, vibrating, and glowing cell phone sitting beside them. Deku snatched it up immediately, flicking it open and holding it to his ear as he answered the call. Yuri watched him as he nodded and responded, catching his eyes and smile, and the hand that came up to pet her hair as he continued the call. He only looked away when he finished talking, hanging up on the other end and sliding his phone into his pocket. His eyes trailed over the bags they had prepared before meeting with Yuri's once more to widen his smile. Uncle Toshi is ready to go, he informed her. Ready to go. Yuri nodded, allowing Deku to lift her out of his lap and carry her off the bed so they could walk together. Deku let Yuri take the lead, Yuri holding her Cleffa doll as Deku held both bags in either hand as they left the room and took the stairs down to exit together. But someone else was down there. The duo stopped at the bottom step and stared ahead at the blonde brute that was Deku's classmate. Bakugo stared dead on at his classmate and the young girl in silence for a few seconds before rising to his feet. His hand swiped to the object beside him, big and round, and he clutched it as he made way to the 2 at the stairs. Both had tensed as he approached, but it was Yuri who eased first as she noticed what it was the loud and strong classmate of Deku was carrying. Deku gulped as his oldest friend stopped in front of them. Kaken. But the other boy only spared a second of a look at him before dropping his eyes to the girl between them. Yuri didn't notice the eyes on her for a moment, still staring at the large pink object in the older boy's hand. When she looked up, she found red eyes staring back into hers, and watched as Katsu's face scrunched for a moment before holding his hand and the doll in it out to the girl. "Merry Christmas" came out of his lips like a grumble, but Yuri didn't take any mind to it as she took the Clefairy doll into her arms. Her head jumped up and down between the doll and the teen who gave it to her before she took one doll in each hand and ran into his legs for a hug she could manage. Katsu stood stiff as she did, not crouching down to return it or moving his hands to pat her or pry her off. He just stood silent, accepted it, and watched her as she let go. Many seconds later, Deku stood watching with blank eyes and an open mouth, blinking as he processed the scene before him, and as he moved his mouth to comment, it shut just as fast. Katsu walked past him, hand raised from knocking Deku on the head. "Don't say anything, Deku," he mumbled as he passed back up the steps. "And stop wearing those gloves. You look stupid." Deku dropped a bag and rubbed the top of his head as he watched Katsu leave up the stairs, muttering to himself about why he was waiting on the couch to give Eri the doll, and thinking that reminded him to look at the young girl he came down with who had ignored the confrontation between the two and was trying to find a way to hold both dolls at the same time. Deku helped her, taking both bags in one arm and convincing Eri to let him hold the smaller Cleffa doll so she could carry around her newest toy. The two took again to the door, leaving Deku to open it to the settled cold air without its breeze and the trail between the piles of snow they were to follow to get home. Eri stood with the doll clutched between her arms, snuggling against it for warmth against the freezing air. Deku stood by her for a moment, using the hand holding the doll to help flip up the hood of her jacket, covering her hair with the purple fabric. "Eri," his voice came from above her, turning her head up to look at him. He smiled softly. "Do you want to hear the rest of the story?" She blinked for a moment in thought before nodding, almost throwing the hood off her head. Deku continued to smile, placing the doll in hand he had around her and pulling her by his side, both facing forward to the trail. Before the villain could get the woman who was driving out of the car, Ingenium appeared beside him, grabbing his wrist and announcing, "If you're looking for someone to help you, don't worry. Helping is exactly what I'm here to do." Eri took one of her hands and clutched the base of his jacket as he did her shoulder and walked beside Deku, letting him lead the way to Uncle Toshi and his car. Her head fell to the side, leaning on her shoulder and his side. The hand on her shoulder raised just for a moment, and Eri could feel his thumb gently press on the hood and slide down the side of her head. Eri knew what her daddy was here to do, and Eri knew Uncle Katsu was wrong and Deku wasn't stupid. Izuku thought he shouldn't have been surprised Eri didn't wake up earlier than him and shake him awake at the sight of the other side of the room. But when he woke up to find his little sister still fast asleep against his chest, he was surprised nonetheless. He didn't wake her up, though, instead opting to let her sleep continue until she woke up by herself. A hand rose to her hair, tracing the strands lightly and brushing them behind her ears. She hummed, hands clutching at the doll stuffed close to her chin. Izuku chuckled as a foot tapped against his knee and the girl rolled onto her back, stuffed Cleffa trapped between her arms as drool slipped from the corner of her lips. He turned his attention away from the girl to the desk, and the small tree with wrapped boxes stacked beside it. The apartment he and his mother called home wasn't exactly the biggest, and buying a full-size tree for the winter season and its holiday wasn't an option they ever had. They didn't have the space to fit one in their living room or their kitchen, but there was spirit enough to get one for Izuku, a small one they could sit atop his desk and lay the presents around to celebrate Christmas. To let young Izuku celebrate Christmas, small in scale, big in the emotions they stirred in his heart, especially as the years passed by. Once he had been accepted into Yuei, he did spend a day or two in class to ponder on what Christmas would be like having the people around him that he did, people who weren't shunning him from their lives. He wasn't necessarily expecting piles of presents, or any at all, but knowing he would have something of high emotion to return to after a winter break of equally high emotions was reassuring. Izuku didn't know when his hand had moved to cup the top of Eri's head, but when her eyes fluttered open she became his center of attention once again. His thumb moved slowly along her hairline and his mouth stayed shut as she took her time readjusting to both the real world and the room she wasn't too familiar sleeping in, with posters she was all too familiar with seeing back at the dorms. The knuckles of her free hand rubbed against her eyes and brushed away their tired self and turned her head slightly to find the face watching her. Izuku smiled his greeting. "Good morning, Eri," his voice came out softly. "Merry Christmas." The young girl only groaned in response, closing her eyes again and turning back to press her face into Izuku's shirt, a muffled good morning of her own hidden somewhere in the fabric. He pet her hair, following from the top of her head and cupping it along to trail down her back, and could feel as her head nuzzled against his chest, ducking away under the bedsheet. Still tired, he chuckled to the nod ruffling his shirt. "It's only a bit until 8, Eri. Mom might be up already and cooking breakfast for us." Against her will, Izuku pulled the covers away, exposing Eri to the air of the room. She still tried to hide away against his shirt. "And I think you have something waiting for you." Hesitantly she rose her head to his, and he gestured with his chin across the room, guiding Eri's eyes until she caught sight of the stacks of boxes beside the desk and tree. Tiredness dissipated as her eyes widened, head flicking back to the teen boy who nodded to her unspoken question. She flailed out of the boy's grip and hopped off the bed before dashing across the room to crouch by the presents wrapped for the holiday. Izuku joined soon after, plopping down to her side as her eyes darted from gift to gift, reading over the name tags, addressed them and in co. The small gasp she made at the size of some gifts, the awe in her eyes towards the ones directed to her, how her hands clasped and unclasped by her sides as she debated which to open first. It was an adorable sight to see, for Izuku. It was the first Christmas they would be spending together. Maybe the first she had ever had, for all he knew. Her life beforehand still remained undetailed aside from what he had been there to experience and hear other outsiders comment on. How long she had been with the Precepts was unclear. The origins of her blood family impossible to detail, and what days were like when she wasn't being used for her blood vague at best and disheartening at worst. Seeing her still smile for what Izuku believed was the first Christmas she would remember was the light at the end of the tunnel of baggage she left Chisaki with. Pushing past those thoughts and days were all he wanted to do with and for her. Can I? Iri hummed, closing the space between her hands below her chin and turning to look at the green teen. Can I open one? Izuku hummed with her, dipping the corners of his smile as he looked to the closed bedroom door. I think you can open one, he responded. A finger rose between them. But only one. I think Mom would want to be here to see you and I open the rest. And get to open her own as well. Iri nodded feverishly in understanding. Turning back to the pile and grabbing the closest present that stood almost half her height, Izuku watched as she tore away the decorated paper to reveal the bland cardboard box it covered. Before throwing open the top flaps and gasping in probably over-exaggerated delight as her hands dove inside. As they flew back out, they carried between them a detailed, humanoid action figure of black, red, and yellow, covered in tiny drills and a pair of red, sharp sunglasses over the chest, resting on the face that made up its torso. Iri hugged the figurine to her chest, wrapping her arms with extra care not to poke herself or the Nilo Hawk's shirt she was wearing. I got Gurren Lagann, she whispered in excitement, locking her eyes on the toy and gently moving about its limbs to test just how much she was able to play with it. Every movement it could make elicited another squeak from her lips, and only grew Izuku's smile wider each time. I take it you're happy with it, Iri. The girl bounced her head in an almost blur to Izuku's question, and the teen turned his attention to the pile of ripped wrapping. Do you know who sent it to you? The young girl paused her playtime, truly turning her attention to Izuku before dragging it slowly to her shoulder and the pile of paper she tossed to the floor. Izuku stayed silent as she lowered her new toy to stand in her lap as the other hand shuffled slowly through the gift wrapping. She looked at the Santa drawings on one ripped piece, and then on another, and then another before it occurred to Izuku that Iri might not know what exactly to look for. Still in silence, Izuku crawled over and dived through the wrappings with her until he found the folded white paper taped onto a scrap. Oh, Momo, Izuku read aloud, turning the cards writing for Iri to see. You do remember who she is, right? I know you haven't spent the most time actually around her and getting to know her name, but it seems Yaoyorozu trusts you enough with her first name instead of her family's. Iri nodded again. Momo's the big girl. Iri threw a hand up to the air, palm facing back down to herself before rolling back behind her head, with the long hair tail. You mean ponytail? Izuku questioned, a smirk on his face directed to Iri's choice of words. The girl shook her head, dipping the corners of Izuku's grin. Momo isn't the pony girl at school. Only for them to come right back up with a sputter of laughter. Izuku recomposed his expression behind an arm as Iri watched, confused as to what was so funny when she knew she was right in her declaration. No, Iri, that's... Izuku coughed into the crook of his arm. Iri, that hairstyle is called a ponytail. I don't mean an actual tail like Tsunotori's. The young girl in front of him parted her lips in a O and tilted her head back in exaggeration of understanding. The green teen stifled another laugh as she drew out the reaction, leaning further and further back where she sat until her back pressed against the carpet floor. Izuku took a look to the pool of hair around Iri's head. The girl stayed lying down, tilting her new toy to lie on top of her as she continued to play with it. Do you want your hair in a ponytail today? Iri hummed as she played, spinning the drills on the toy mecha's arms without twisting them off. No, she responded, her head turned over, brushing her face into the pillow of white locks she had made. I like it this way. Izuku dropped down beside her, startling the girl at his sudden appearance and the heavy sound that came with him hitting the floor. I'll be honest, I do too. He nudged his head closer, pressing his own face into the rest of her hair until his nose was against her forehead. You know, it is very comfy right here. I could probably just lay here the rest of the day. Iri giggled and shook as she rolled her body over more to face his. You can't sleep a whole day, Daddy, she responded in her laughs. I can try, Izuku spoke against her hair, one arm draped over her and her new toy, moving her closer to him and vice versa. Maybe we can sleep the whole day, and when we wake up tomorrow we'll just have to celebrate Christmas all over again. It'll be like having 2 Christmases. The audible gasp from Iri made him laugh too, and the really she spoke within her breath had him nodding. Who knows? Guess we just have to sleep to find out. You up for the challenge? A small hand made its way to grasp onto his shirt and pull her and the new toy against his chest. I'll take that as a yes. Izuku slid his other arm underneath her, letting the young girl use his muscles as a pillow as his arm and the extra cloth of his shirt makeshifted as a blanket. He gave a peek to her face, seeing her eyes close to show just how committed she was to the idea of a second Christmas. His eyes closed too, pinching together as the corners of his lips pushed his cheeks up against his eyelid. All that remained of sound was their soft breathing, and the weather gently beating against the window of his bedroom and the creaking out in the hall of his bedroom door. The knock his door was given was soft, and Izuku dared to lift his head and eyelids to look over as his mother peeked her head in. Izuku, are you awake? Oh. Inko softened her voice as she took notice of the cuddled bodies on the floor of the room. Izuku, is everything all right? Her son nodded, blowing a soft wind through his teeth attempting to quiet the mother. We're sleeping in so that way Christmas can't start yet, so it can start tomorrow and we can have Christmas morning again, Izuku explained in a hushed voice, only to be given the same shushing treatment from the girl in his arms blowing wind through her teeth up at him. Sorry, wanna join us? Inko chuckled softly into the palm of her hand, giving the two kids a look over before speaking again. I would love to, but I've just finished making breakfast and was coming in to see if you two were ready to eat. I thought some pancakes would sound nice for a Christmas breakfast, don't they? After a moment of thought, Izuku nodded and looked down to the girl in his arms as she attempted to sleep. I know we were about to bend space and time to our will so Christmas would forever be ours, but would you like to save that for a later date and have pancakes instead? He could feel the rumbling of her hums against his chest signaling the decisions being made in her head until he felt confirmation and saw the red of her eyes gleam up to him. With blueberries, came her question in a whisper. Izuku looked to his mother and repeated the question for her to hear. Inko smiled and nodded to the two kids. Blueberry pancakes, like you asked yesterday. I remembered. She tapped a finger to her head for emphasis, before adding, and I think there is something for you in the stocking in the living room, if you want to see it, too. Izuku made sure to lift his head as he darted up, action figure still in hand, and darted out the room past their mother, her short shouts of glee trailing behind her. Son smiled at mother and informed her he'd be right behind. And Inko left after Eri sounding off in happy cheers down the hall. Slowly he picked the rest of himself off the floor, swaying as he stood on his feet. He looked over and scanned the other presents with his eyes, taking note of which boxes were addressed to him, which were listed for Eri, and which were listed for his mother. In the corner atop a box with a sticker labeled with his mother's name was an envelope. Izuku took a closer look at the writing atop it before taking the envelope altogether. He knew the penmanship on the front, with the address of their apartment across the front, and a smaller font of words written at the top so it could be returned to America. He knew the name of the sender and the feeling in his stomach reading it in his head gave him. He knew exactly what was going to be on the letter inside. The only thing he didn't know was why he kept sending anything. Izuku's fingers curled under the edges of the flap on the back, tugging gently to peel it open, but he stopped short. He wanted to see the money he sent them. He wanted to see the words of good wishes he supposedly wrote in repetition. He wanted to see if he even knew about Eri, of his technically stepdaughter, but he didn't open it. His wrist flicked the letter back onto the present and he watched it slide across the top before coming to a stop thanks to the ribbon on top. The hand he flicked stayed where it was last, and he looked over the scar that wrapped around his knuckles and palm. He turned to his desk, opened the highest shelf, pulled from it the thin green gloves and snapped them over his hands. His fingers flexed a moment before he stuffed them in the pockets of his shorts and turned out his room, knocking the light off with his elbow and leaving the lights of the tree to illuminate the name of Hisashi Kasuku. Aoyama and Mina stole the show, dancing across the table from one another to the music Kaminari set up for the night. Uraraka, Shiro, Kirishima and Minta cheered from the couch with the electric generating boy and sulking explosive boy as the bright boy and alien girl tried one-upping the other to each verse and chorus and beat. A separate couch holding the quartet of Shoji, Jiru, Momo and Ida watched on further away, short conversation happening between the four, directed at the crew of 7 in their small party. Takoyami, Asui and Hagakure took station at the window by the door watching the snow fall and waiting and planning which show of fireworks to watch when the new year started. Izuku didn't watch any of them from his place beside the kitchen with Eri and Sato. Izuku chuckled to himself, watching the young girl chomp into her candy apple piece by piece. She didn't take any big bites in. She just sunk her teeth and scraped away small amount of caramel until the apple underneath showed itself and she could nibble away at that too. Izuku took a napkin from across the common room counter and rubbed across her cheek to clean away some of the caramel that hadn't made it with the rest. The young girl smiled up at her older brother as thanks before digging back into her treat, and smiled back and continued to watch in his silence. Well, isn't this the most tooth-rotting scene I've seen all break? Sadu's comment among the commotion around the common area and across the counter to draw Izuku and Eri's eyes up to him. The sugar-corked boy ignored the brightening cheeks of the super-powered teen as he continued to top and decorate the 5-layered cake in front of him. Keep it up and my quirk will be active 24/7 for the next 2 years we have together. Izuku let out a strained chuckle and rubbed his gloved hands against the sleeves of his blue turtleneck. Yeah, he stuttered out, nodding along his words. Well, actually that wouldn't be a good thing, given its whiplash effect on your nerves. It's a good thing your body shuts down manually so you don't hurt yourself any more than you push yourself already. Same with your quirk. It would be bad if it didn't have a manual off switch that is you being conscious or not. Or does it continue to work when you're unconscious? Does it keep you asleep longer the more sugar you intake? Does it stop at a certain point when you're not consciously using it or continuing to fuel it? If the sugar causes degradation on your mind and senses when you intake sugar, how do you reimburse that loss to be able to use your quirk again? Does your body have a natural function to regrow any lost or depleted tissue and brain cognition? Does xylitol intake reduce the effects and regrow your cognitive abilities sooner than naturally? Sadu, Eri, and Cyril watched us together as Izuku's chin fell into his hands and his being fell into a storm of muttering and pondering. Another several seconds of his mumbling passed before Sadu turned on Ciro with a hand darting onto the countertop. "How long have you been here?" he asked the tape-making boy over the music and the laughter, turning even Eri's attention away from the thought-filled green teenager. "Oh, I've been here for like 2 minutes." Ciro shrugged and kept his eyes on Izuku. But watching him go on like this is timeless. Sadu squinted at the other boy as he leaned away and back to the half-decorated cake. "All right, just don't get lost in his eyes there, Chief. Don't tempt me." Eri looked between the two bantering boys, nibbling away the last bit of the first quarter of her apple. Most of their words went over her head, both in meaning and in height as their conversation carried on. After a while it became as gibberish as the words from the partying teens behind her, so she turned herself back to facing Izuku. He continued sprouting words that thinned between his fingers that she barely got to hear, but she didn't mind or turn her eyes away from the sides of his. He must have noticed her trained stare, as he toned down his muttering and lowered his hands and turned in and with his seat to face the young girl facing him. "What is it, Eri?" Izuku questioned, leaning down and forward closer to the girl. The young girl lowered her candy apple, revealing her slightly parted lips and the small caramel streak along her cheek. "I'm lost in your eyes." Izuku blinked, jaw-dropping as color rose up from his neck, and a whistle sounded from the peanut gallery of the two boys watching. "Guess I warned the wrong person," Sadu muttered out the corner of his mouth to Ciro. The latter curled onto the counter in laughter, darting the eyes of Izuku to the two boys and Eri, trying to form a sentence to ask what he had missed. Eri didn't answer as the sugar boy and tape boy explained to Izuku what they were talking about while he was in his zone, instead doing her best to carefully and discreetly climb from her chair onto Izuku's and sit in his lap. The green teen helped her over regardless, wrapping an arm around her to keep her seated between his legs while also keeping his attention on the other boy's words. "Also, Midoriya." Sadu turned the conversation when the boy in question was caught up and pointed a finger at him. "You know what xylitol is?" Izuku blinked and nodded hastily. "Why yeah, I looked it up when I was training to get into Yuei," he started. "My instructor didn't put it on my plan, but I was supposed to be eating more and healthier to get in Yuei, and I looked up if there was a product opposite of sugar, and I came across that and looked into having gum of it when I was doing my homework." "Where did you get it?" Sadu leaned with a hand pressed against the countertop. "I have been trying to find anywhere that sells that gum, and I just can't. And it is way too overpriced trying to buy a box of it online." "Oh, there's a convenience store close by where I went to school before coming here." Izuku pressed his fingers into Eri's side, curling her into his stomach with giggles hiding in her candy apple. "It's all the way back in Musutafu, though. I'm pretty sure I know the address of it though, so I can give you that to go to when you have the time." "That would be great, thank you." "Wait, is there actually an opposite of sugar?" Sarah whipped his head between the two teens. "Is that possible?" "It technically is," Sadu explained, cutting Midoriya before he could speak it off and leaving the green teen to turn his eyes on Eri as she tried turning in his lap. "It's mainly the opposite of sugar that it won't rot your teeth. But with how my quirk intakes raw sugar and sugary foods, I've been meaning to find and practice with xylitol to see if it keeps me steady in hero work." "Huh." Ciro crossed his arms and leaned against the countertop. "Would that work, though? I thought your quirk only takes in sugar as the compound to power. How would you get another element, I guess, to work on your quirk?" "Xylitol is labeled as a sugar substitute." Izuku cut back in, eyes kept on Eri as he talked. "It's only a hypothesis that quirks can be tricked into working inversely or unnaturally, but given that it's sugar that gives Sadu super strength, despite what it does for most everyone else, to believe its supposed polar opposite could reduce the after effects of his quirk or even weaken the whiplash in the moment of using his quirk isn't out of the realm of possibilities." Ciro blinked slowly, turned his head to Sadu for a minute to look at him, and turned back to Izuku when he was done. "All right, can you say that again but in smaller words so I know what you're talking about?" "No." Sadu was the one to answer, turning his back to the two boys to finish decorating the cake. Ciro threw out both his arms and furrowed his eyebrows to the sugar-powered boy. Ida does it, kind of, Izuku piped back up, looking a moment to Shiro before turning to the teen he mentioned. Ida. Both he and Shiro blinked at the sight across the room and the dance-off between Uraraka and Ashido, to Ida and Shoji standing locked in a competition of who could speak with the most absurd hand gestures behind their words. Momo was still seated on the couch, a hand loosely in front of her mouth to hide the grin still visible in her eyes. But Jiru had slid off and fallen from the couch, face pressed into the taller girl's leg to conceal the laughter behind her shaking body. Izuku turned away and back to Shiro, who with Eri continued to watch the two games in the room. Ida drinks a lot of orange juice, and it actually helps his quirk function better between uses. Despite the fact engines don't run on orange juice, Ida can't actually drink oil. His quirk just functions off a different source for its power and continues to work, like Sada with super strength induced by sugar. Only Ida isn't looking for something else to either trick his quirk into assuming it's the same source of power, only for the outcome and effect to not be what usually happens. Shiro sighed through his teeth and turned to Izuku with a tired look. You had me, only to lose me. But I think I get it, so thank you. Any time. No, please don't. Before Izuku could form a response to that, Sadu called out that the cake was done, which turned every head in the room to him and brought most of the class stampeding to the line between the kitchen and the carpet. Sadu held them back like cattle, leaving Tsuyu, Takoyami, Momo, Shoji, and Ida to stand by where Izuku and Shiro sat watching the chaos. The vice and president of Class 1 shared a sigh into their hands as they tried to calm down their classmates' hunger. It was Shoji who was able to calm them down, though, talking over them with an elongated arm and turning on the TV with another to one of the broadcast presentations getting ready for the fireworks shows in 5 minutes. The class scrambled to their spots, Sadu and Momo working together to cut everyone a slice of their own. Izuku kept Eri clutched to his chest, his eyes closed as she kept hers wide open watching the madness of her father's classmate. The candy apple stayed clutched to her cheek and she sunk into Izuku's arms and lap, hiding away even as he turned down the offer for a slice of cake. As the Midoriyas stayed seated on the stools, everyone else took place along the couches and tables watching the TV, and the reporter waiting with the countdown clock. Izuku ran a hand through Eri's hair, rubbing gently the top of her scalp with his fingers, easing her and himself as the countdown reached the minute mark. When it did, Izuku turned Eri on his lap, making it better that she could face him directly. The young girl looked up to him with wonder, but Izuku gave no reply as both his hands cupped the top of her head and he gave her a smile. It's going to be a bit loud, Eri, he whispered to her. Will you be okay with that? She nodded, holding the candy apple in front of her face with a grip so tight her knuckles were matching the stick between them. His hands overlapped hers, gently, letting them ease their hold as the reporter announced the 30-second mark. The clock continued to count as Izuku lowered his head onto Eri's, softly kissing the top as it reached 10 seconds. The young girl giggled for 9 and 8, reached higher for 7 and 6, nuzzled her caramel-covered lips and cheek against for 5 and 4, getting them both to laugh for 3, 2, and 1 before Izuku cupped his hands beneath Eri's shoulders and lifted her up with but a small amount of his quirk as the clock struck and his classmates cheered with the crowd on TV to the fireworks above them. Eri came back down to his lap with a smile and laughter, issuing Izuku some of his own in return as she settled into sitting once again, with her back to him again. Leaning on him and nibbling away at what was still left of the apple in her hands, Izuku leaned down and whispered her a happy new year that she returned just as softly. Letting her be, Izuku looked around the common room, to his classmates still hugging and cheering on their first New Year's together, despite the few missing and at home with their families. Next year we'll lock everyone here, he heard one of his classmates promise. The shared happiness and warmth of his friends fueled the smile still on his face, until his eyes came across a pair of red staring back at him. Katsuki didn't look at him for long, only keeping the shared eye contact for a few seconds before returning to his slice of cake quietly. Kirishima, Kaminari, Ashido, Toru and Shiro cheered with one another the new year and the start to their last semester of the first year at Yuei, but Katsuki did nothing but watch. A small comment Izuku couldn't hear was made when Kirishima directed a question at him that also wasn't clear enough to understand from across the room. When he was done eating, Katsuki stood with his fork and plate and left, telling the few he was with he was going upstairs to do something for a bit and he'd be back later. None of them questioned it, but Izuku watched as Katsuki hesitated when he threw away his trash. His ruby eyes turned to his emeralds once more before turning with the rest of his body up the stairwell. Izuku watched his retreat a moment, only to be taken out of ponderings to what Katsuki was looking at him for when Eri tugged on his sleeve. She handed him the remains of her candy apple, asking if there was a way to save what was left so she could eat it later. Izuku promised just that, taking the apple and leaving her on the seat as he put it in a plastic container to wait within the fridge. When he returned they to resituate in their spot, ready to relax and watch the communion of the class, until a buzz came from his pocket and Izuku checked to see the message on his phone. I want to talk. I'll be on the roof. Izuku blinked at Katsuki's text, His eyes rolled to the stairwell he had ascended moments ago. Then they moved to the crowd of his classmates, still chattering and laughing among one another as they watched the fireworks on TV and ate their cake. Izuku was the only one on his phone. He lowered the device to his hip, on the other side of where he faced. He wrapped an arm around her to keep her facing that way as he replied, "Can Eri come with me?" He bit his lip as he waited and rocked slightly in the shared seat, earning a small fit of giggles, and Eri leaned back against his chest and wrapped both her arms around his one. He hugged her tighter and pressed his fingers to her side to increase her laughter and giggles, and only looked away from the squirming child in his arm when his phone buzzed. "No, just you." The rocking and the tickling stopped as he stared at the text. His thumb hovered over the screen to text again, but it stopped short of the first letter. Eri wiggled in his arm and he slackened his grip so she could reposition herself on his lap. Why did Katsuki want to talk on the roof, and now of all times? They hadn't even talked with one another that night, just the glance before the blonde boy had left to do something. Was he up to something? Was there a surprise waiting for him? That didn't seem right or fit with the time. Not like they had anything memorable with the other about New Year's before. This was the first one they celebrated together on the date. Was it a surprise for Eri? Was that why she couldn't come along? Is that why no one thought anything of Katsuki's leave? Was everyone in on it? A surprise celebration for her first New Year's celebration with the class family. The first feeling in his gut didn't have him believe that. The second feeling was just Eri poking him for attention. Izuku turned away from his phone and looked down to the young girl looking up at him. Her bright red eyes shone with questions, none of which she asked aloud. Her hands pressed against him through the shirt and her head tilted down towards his other hand and the phone in it. He pressed the device against his leg and slid it about until it was back in his pocket and used the diversion to lower his own head and plant a soft kiss on the top of Eri's. That brought her attention back up to him and his small smile. "Uncle Katsu wants to talk with me for a bit," he whispered to her, bringing his now free hand to join the first one and hugging her closer. "But he wants to talk alone. Would you be all right if I go for a few minutes to do that?" Eri blinked at him with a frown on her face and a tilt of her head. "What does he want to talk about?" She muttered back, only slightly louder than Izuku but not enough that it caught attention, or more worrisome, suspicion. Izuku gulped and licked his lips. He did. "Usually," he started, eyes darting about her face to look at anything other than her own eyes. "On New Year's, Kakin and I share our wishes and promises for the new year. It's a tradition of ours that we started when we were younger. He likes doing it, but he doesn't like doing it around other people. He's a bit shy, isn't he?" He put on a small, empty smile he hoped she'd buy, and she did when nodding to his question. "I'll only be with him for a few minutes or so, and then I'll come right back down. Is that all right?" Eri hummed and curled her head down to her chin, puffing out her cheeks with a huff. Despite the less than happy expression she wore, she nodded against his shirt. He sighed and kissed the top of her head again. "I promise I'll come right back to you when we're done. We can do what you want until we sleep, okay?" Izuku received another nod against his chest and a small surprise as her arms tried their best to wrap around his chest in a hug. Izuku smiled and rose his head as he hugged back and came to meet Jiru's eyes close by. The ear-jack girl blinked as her hands moved and pushed a second slice of cake onto her plate as quietly as she could. "Hey," she drew out quietly, to the point where Izuku almost didn't hear her over the other chatter. Hey," he responded just as quietly. "Sorry, didn't notice you there." "No, it's fine." Kyoka waved his concern away. "I wasn't trying to get your attention, just watching." The green boy blinked at her and the two gained red as her words sunk in. "I mean, I thought you and Eri looked sweet." She growled to herself, the fork in her hand twitching with her fingers. "God, this sounds creepy any way I put it." It's fine, Kyoka," Izuku informed her with a flustered wave of his hand. "I understand what you mean. You don't have to keep trying." The purple-haired girl bowed her head with a sigh. "Sorry about that, Midoriya. Didn't mean to freak you out with that." No, it's fine, I promise." The green teen gave off a nervous laugh. I get what. "Hey, can I ask something of you?" "I'm sorry that I am. I'll take an apology after I know what it is." Jiru rose head eyes back up to him. "What do you need? Can you watch over Eri for me, for a little while?" The young girl in question lifted her head at mention of her name, turning to the teen girl who lowered her eyes down to hers. "I kinda have to go upstairs and do something for a bit, and I didn't want to have to run up and leave her on her own. I trust her, and I trust all you guys, but I'd rather someone knows why I won't be around for a couple of minutes, so if it isn't too much to ask." "Yeah, I'll take her," Kyoka cut him off. She walked away from the cake and around the counter, taking up the seat beside the Midoriya's. "It's fine with me, dude. Don't worry about it." "You sure?" She gave a nod to Izuku's question, to which he bowed his head. "Thank you. Here you go, Eri." The young girl was hoisted into his arms as he dropped from the seat and set her in his place. Eri situated herself comfortably and looked up at Izuku. I'll be right back, Eri. Couple of minutes, I promise. The little girl gave no words of a response, and instead surprised both teens beside her by holding her hand up to Izuku with only her pinky finger sticking out. He blinked at it a moment before smiling softly and wrapping his own gloved pinky around hers. It got a smile to cover her face, too, so he was happy about that. He kissed her temple one last time, thanked Kyoka again and swerved around the back of the common room and traversed up the stairwell. Once on the next floor, he let his smile drop and his hand drop into his pocket and pull out his phone. I'm on my way. Opening the door to the roof, Izuku was hit by a gust of cold wind. He shivered, using his foot to keep the door open while his hands brushed along his arms to stay warm. The snow stayed back thanks to the patio cover awning connected above the door and the lone lamp light between them. Said light stayed solid and illuminating the space in front of him, shining on the snowbank building along most of the roof's surface area, and shining on the back of Katsuki sitting and facing the edge of the snowbank. Izuku lowered beside Katsuki, crossing his legs and facing the same direction the blonde did. Said boy blinked a look in Izuku's direction before focusing back on the dark, snowing sky, unaffected by the lamp hanging above the door behind them. Izuku fidgeted his thumbs against one another, looking back and forth between the yin-yang horizon and his first friend. He gulped and rolled his tongue in his mouth before it opened. Kaka, don't. Katsuki's interjection cut Izuku short. The latter blinked, surprised at the soft tone the word came with. Don't talk. Just listen for now, all right. Izuku nodded slowly, and the deepening frown of Katsuki gave away that he saw it. He looked away a moment, the back of his head facing Izuku as he looked over the side of the horizon. And all Izuku could notice was the tensing of Katsuki's neck as he gulped and turned back forward. Why didn't you jump? The question froze Izuku faster than the pelting cold around them could, widening the boy's eyes and gaping his mouth. He tried stumbling out a word, and only made a sound incomprehensible to both boys before Katsuki's scoff silenced him again, and the blonde continued to talk. The fucking Hero Association knows about it. The guy they sent to talk to us told me he knew what I said to you, only apparently they don't fucking know it was me. Those extras were cowards and didn't single me out, probably thinking I would drag them down with me for their shit too. His scoff deepened as he shook his head. I wouldn't stoop that fucking low. Unlike them, I have some semblance of fucking dignity. His scoff turned to a sneer. One Izuku could see only spread across his face as far as his lips. Yet I didn't have the guts to admit I said it. Made up some shit that some other idiot said it. The look of disgust faded and left behind something somber that looked at the sheet of snow building across the roof in front of them. I fucking hated that I said it. I hated it more than I hated looking at you. And that should have been impossible to top. A dry laugh sneaked through Izuku's laugh. He was the only one laughing. Katsuki balled his fingers to fists. I didn't give it a second thought until that sludge piece of shit tried to kill me. And then did I know what I fucking said? And I didn't take it back or apologize or say shit to you until we got into the school. With the last word his voice dropped and cut, leaving the two to the soft blowing wind and the distant beat of music and laughing all the way down the flight of stairs. Neither said a word immediately, not following or in response. Izuku wasn't sure what to say, and he didn't know if Katsuki knew how to word what he was getting at, or if he had anything to say at all. The blind rolled his shoulders and scoffed. Everyone was a fucking dick to you. Everyone hated you. I hated you. Your own fucking dad isn't even around for you. Izuku flinched violently enough to cup his hands over his elbows and hug his chest. Katsuki gripped the sleeves of his forearms. The only person you had looking out for you was Auntie. You were crying all the damn time. You couldn't stand up for yourself. You couldn't do fucking anything. Izuku could see the steam rising from the cloth of Katsuki's shirt. With all the shit you had against you, why didn't you kill yourself? Izuku eyed the edge of the snow bank. Did you want me to? No? Were you even fucking listening? Katsuki turned on Izuku in a heartbeat, throwing a hand up with sparks. Just as fast, he growled and turned away, curling his fingers to his palm and shoving the heated limb into the snow beside him. This isn't about whether you should have or not. That's not what I'm fucking asking. What I want to know is why you didn't. What the hell was there to keep you going on with this shit? He shut his mouth tight after the question, and gave another few seconds of silence between them before piping back up. You can speak now. Can't exactly answer my question keeping your mouth shut like that. Oh, Izuku's arms dropped down against his legs and rested atop them. His eyes dropped to his shoes, curled at the toes in thought. Yeah, it was hard. Just, everyone was mean to me, even you. His eyes darted once to Katsuki, who did not tempt looking towards him, but too wasn't, like, that depressed, you know. I was sad, but I wasn't always sad. I was happy growing up, even if I didn't get to show it when anyone else was around. I had the heroes to look up to, you know. I also the notebooks I was making. Izuku rubbed a thumb along his thigh, mentally and carefully deciding on his words. Even though everyone was trying to bring me down, it's not like I listened. You know that better than anyone else. I still cared about heroes. I still cared about being a hero. Everyone said whatever they wanted to me about how I couldn't be one, but I didn't listen because I didn't want to. The same went for what you said. He shrugged his shoulders, though neither boys were looking at the other. I didn't listen because I didn't want to. You all said so much over the years, it was kinda easy to turn down the threats after a while. So none of that shit ever got to you. Katsuki piped back up with his question. You just listened and ignored what everyone said to you. You just turned away from the crap I said to you. No. Izuku inhaled a long breath through his nose, scrunching it up as the cold air blew it strong. I listened to everything you had to say. I didn't ignore your words. That's not the right word. I didn't turn away from them. I turned them down. Your words, Kaken. What you said was its own belief, your beliefs. You believed I wouldn't be a hero. You believed I couldn't be one. You believed I was pathetic and wouldn't be anything at all, and I actively fought against that. You believed all of it, and because of that I didn't. It got to me, everything you said, but I didn't hit me like that. I didn't take it for fact in an instant when you said them. And I don't think you think them anymore. Those words are gone. They don't mean anything anymore. And I've only thought of that threat since the Hero Association brought it back up, and it's not anything I believe in. Katsuki clicked his tongue and glared at the snow pile by his feet. So you didn't let it, any of it, get to you, even though it got to you. Not I didn't let it get me that deep, Izuku admitted. It hurt, yeah, but I was able to push it down just watching heroes work and holding on to that dream that I could be one too. For the first time that night Katsuki looked over at him, his dim red irises locked with the emeralds in Izuku's. And the two stayed staring before the blonde turned away again with a frown. What Kaken, what brought this abu? Don't call me that. Katsuki cut in harsher than he looked to be pleased with. His fingers drummed along his legs. Don't. We've known each other long enough. You might as fucking well call me by my actual name, Izuku. Izuku watched in shock as Katsuki stumbled over his name, scrunching up the lower half of his face to get through the syllables before calming back down to his normal sneer of a placated look. Katsuki, it felt foreign on his tongue, but somehow saying it aloud calmed the blonde's expression. Izuku sighed out his nose. What brought this about now? But Katsuki didn't respond. He kept his glare, as soft as it was, forward to roam over the snowbank in his silence. His thumbs edged the wrists of his sleeves, and his turning neck pulled at the collar gently. Fuck it. This is stupid. Never mind. In a second he was on his feet, turned on his heel and walking back to the roof-accessible door. Izuku had to blink to register as Katsuki got up, and shot to his own feet in response. Wait. To Izuku's surprise, he did, stopping as his hand rested on the door's handle. Katsuki. The name turned the blonde's head slightly back to the other teen, without turning face away from the entrance. Izuku bit his lip and gulped, arms half stretched out to the other boy and fingers curling down as his shoulders dropped. You brought me up here to talk. Here, on the roof of all places, to ask me why I didn't jump off when you suggested I did. Looking at it meant more than irony in Izuku's eyes. I know you probably don't care if I of all people ask, but is something wrong? Katsuki's hand dropped from the handle and hung lazily by his side. His head dipped an inch after it, towards it, silently staring down in its direction. His fingers pinched together slowly, the thumb rubbing along the tips of each other finger. Izuku watched within his own silence, a bubble of worry in his throat watching his old friend hold back his tongue. It felt out of character to watch Katsuki act so calm, so diluted from his usual and high-octane self, that when the blonde turned around with a newly formed fist and a snarl of his teeth, Izuku felt relief within his initial reaction of fear. I want to be a fucking hero, Katsuki declared, stabbing a thumb against his chest and baring his teeth. I have grown up being told I can become one, and I've grown up wanting nothing more than to become one, and not just one, but the best one, greater than even fucking All Might. He took a pause to catch his breath in the cold air, swiping a thumb into his nose with a sniffle. I can become a fucking hero, and I was fucking set to. My quirk was the strongest out of all our classmates. So I trained it to be even stronger. I trained to be even stronger. I trained to get into Yuei, into here, and become the greatest hero, greater than the greatest hero they had ever seen. He stomped forward, once, twice, then a third before jabbing a finger into Izuku's chest. And then you got accepted too. And you stayed. Katsuki's voice lowered over the hush of the winter winds, his eyes a blank stare down on Izuku. No matter what shit you went through, that we all went through, you stayed. I found out you had a quirk, and then I found out it wasn't yours. I found out you weren't weak, and then I found out you were even stronger than me. His finger trailed down the front of Izuku's turtleneck before dropping to his side once again. I found out you were using the shit past you had grown up with as your motivation to become a hero. And then I found that same past coming to me to tell me I can't become a hero. Izuku had to blink to realize, but Katsuki was shaking, lightly. He didn't think it was from the cold air. The red of his eyes were spreading past the iris. Every time I think back to that shit past, you know what I think? I think I fucking hated it. I hated every fucking second of it. What the fuck was there to like about it? I got praised for having a powerful quirk. I used to beat the people I didn't like into the ground and scare others into submission to follow and keep praising me. I announced myself as a winner by beating up other kids into the dirt whether they did something or not. I did what I wanted to weed out anyone who thought of themselves as competition, and it meant telling your ass to kill yourself. And you're in all three fucking categories. I beat the shit out of you, scared you into following me blindly, and told you to off yourself like it was fucking nothing. And I thought I could be a fucking hero. Katsuki laughed a dry laugh, turning away from the green teen and stalking up to the edge of the snow piling around them. And you don't even give a shit about all that. It happened, all of it, to you, and apparently it didn't mean jack shit to begin with, because here you are acting like it never happened. Here you are acting like you haven't been a target all your fucking life and have always been destined to be a hero. He kicked into the snow, sending chunks flying further into the bank. I thought I could do that shit. I thought I could keep where I was, where I wanted to be, and act like your shitty past never happened. Like I wasn't a fucking monster. Then the fucking Hero Association comes in bringing that shit back up, talking to me about the death threat, not knowing it was me, and I highly fucking doubt they don't. He looked back over his shoulder to Izuku, blinking nothing to the blank stare of surprise the green teen wore across his face. It sounds like something right up my alley, doesn't it? Yelling die every other fucking attack. Telling people to piss off and shit. What's a detailed death threat to add to the list other than expect it? Not like your friends don't already know about it, with the way they've been huddling you. Izuku dropped his gaze between the boys, dragging between their boots. I never told anyone you said it, Katsuki. He mumbled out, almost incoherent in the cold blowing winds. I wouldn't tell anyone it. What does that fucking matter? Katsuki's hands dipped into his pockets and an elbow darted towards the door behind them. Like I said, you apparently don't want shit to do with the past. You dropped that harder than Pinky does her grades. But the instant Squirrel Girl and Mr. Robot find out I was the one who told you that shit, you and I both know they would be on my ass to get me out of here for that. It'd be shared around the school faster than Dark could ever accomplish. I'd be expelled in a fucking heartbeat, but I doubt anyone would care if I even had one to begin with. They've been tiptoeing around me all fucking year. They'd probably fucking celebrate the opportunity to bite me in the ass. If not grape stain, then I'd do just fine. He shrugged with more emotion than the action normally called for. I ain't gonna become a fucking hero. No matter what I do to lose that fucking past of me. And that part of me, move on and actually try to be a decent fucking human being. That shit I did keeps coming back to remind me I wasn't shit and I never will be. And you want to know the worst fucking part? A hand rose back out from a pocket and pointed, weakly, to Izuku. My first thought was to blame you. Blame the fucking kid who was being harmed, not the kid doing the harm. And that just says it all, doesn't it? Izuku thought it did, even though it left out a lot too. That past, their past, though Katsuki continued to exempt himself from it, had been, frankly, quite shit. Izuku knew exactly what would come of them both were it to be detailed and shared to their classmates and their teachers, and even their parents. And, once, he had thought of doing just that, sharing the truth to his mother not too long after he and Katsuki entered junior high and letting her take the wheel and dealing with the world against him instead of it being him against it. In the end, he didn't, because he didn't feel the need to. He felt the bruises, he felt the scars, he felt the blood, he felt the aching in his chest every time he had to deal with someone complaining about having to deal with him. But he didn't feel the need to admit defeat and let it all change his life. And yet here was Katsuki, about to hand the win over to the past. Izuku remembered Katsuki, young and brave and brash, and he remembered little good about him. Strong and fearless and headstrong, on their own, redeemable qualities that in Kaken's hands were weapons he used to pummel Izuku into the dirt. A quirk that could make anyone a hero, that made him a sobbing mess in the sand. A smile that Katsuki had learned from All Might, that had become a twisted, glee-filled smile from the joy of beating Izuku blue and purple. Izuku hated remembering that Kaken existed like that, though the thought never went away. But Izuku remembered seeing that Kaken die, slowly, since the day he could declare a win over the blonde boy. How his sharp edges smoothed over the months they spent learning together under Aizawa and All Might. How his crass language and harsh words died in his throat every time he spoke them. How he had real friends, actual people he talked to that didn't follow him blindly. How he was changing, truly. And in some way understanding what a hero was, that wasn't what he was acting like before. How the Kaken he remembered melted and molded into a new, refined, rough but truly heroic Katsuki. And that Katsuki was bowing his head to let the past ruin him. When you don't even have shit to say, I can tell I fucked up. Katsuki's voice brought Izuku back to the real world. Make the fucking mumble kid a mute. Why don't I? They'd expect that, too. D fit right up their alley. But this is what I fucking get, isn't it? For all the shit I did. All the crap I told you that you could never become a hero, I'm the one who takes the fucking hit and loses his chances, right? How fucking poetic. Izuku watched the pale breath of air he released against the dim and dark horizon. I'm the fucking villain here. The fuck do I get feeling any remorse if it won't change shit? There's nothing to change with you, nothing to change with your friends, and nothing to change the minds of the teachers or auntie or the old hag when they find out. Word gets out and everything is set in stone ready to read my name. Here lies Katsuki Bakugo, that asshole who thought he could be a hero by tearing down every fucking child who tried to stand in his way. What a fucking legend. He glared at the school buildings and dormitories lit up by the lamp posts scattered about. And far off in the distance where fireworks were booming and sounding off from another corner of the city. Do you even have anything to fucking say? With his question he turned around, his soft red eyes shining under the lamp they had above the door. Anything at all. Izuku met his eyes with another gulp, fists balled gently against his sides. I do, he responded with a small nod. Katsuki waved a hand lazily at him, and Izuku took that as the right to speak his mind, starting with a question. Do you know why I didn't? Why I haven't told anyone what you did? You already fucking told me that. I meant now, Kakin. The reversion to his nickname pressed Katsuki's lips together. Why I haven't told anyone here, All Might or Mom, what happened. Why, now that I have friends and people and adults I can turn to for whatever help they can give, I haven't told any of them about us. Do you know why? The blonde stayed silent and shook his head to answer Izuku's question, so he continued. If you were to go to anyone, the staff, the principal, All Might, our parents, you'd be giving them an apology, right? You'd be admitting to what you did, and that would basically be you're sorry to them, but you don't have to tell them you're sorry. The furrowed and raised eyebrow didn't interrupt any more than they did stand out on Katsuki's face. What do you have to apologize to Aizawa-sensei for? You've done nothing to him other than yell. But you do that to everyone and he doesn't ... He doesn't stand for that attitude, does he? What do you have to apologize to your friends for? Kaminari, Shiro, Kirishima, Ashido, they genuinely like you and like spending time with you. They don't follow you blindly and they're not really afraid of you like everyone else was. You've done nothing but humor them and make them smile. What do you have to apologize to them for? Izuku inhaled the frigid air and shuddered as it went down his neck. You haven't really wronged anyone else. You have no one else to apologize to. A loose shrug pushed up his shoulders. It's just me. A soft chuckle passed out his lips when he turned his head. It's just saying sorry won't be enough for me to forgive you, entirely, at least, and I don't know what will make up for everything. He blinked past his own watering eyes and looked back to Katsuki's clearing orbs. Can I make one suggestion though? That maybe it will be enough. The blonde boy exhaled sharply through his nose. Yeah, fine. He coughed into his shoulder. I mean ... Yeah. Don't give up. The answer came from Izuku's lips as soon as he got his out of Katsuki's. You, being here at Yuei has. Honestly, if you were to leave Yuei, I don't think you'd get better. I don't think the nagging reminder that you were dropped from the school of your dreams would help you in shaping yourself into someone better if this place wasn't already shaping you into that by keeping you here. A small smile stayed on his lips. If you stay here and you keep trying and you do what you do best and you don't give up ... That would be the best way to start any apology. If you leave you can't ... Do any of that. And I don't think you want to let this keeping being a part of our lives, do you? Katsuki's shoulders squared. Be it from the words Izuku used or something, neither of them would admit it being Izuku who was saying it all. Of course I don't. That isn't me. Then stay, Izuku stated, softly. This can stay between us, forever, for all I care. No one ever has to know the truth other than us, because this is just about us. And it will go away faster if we are at least around each other to know it's really gone for good. That's all I ask. The two boys stood silent, facing each other in a soft standoff. Katsuki's eyes dropped away from Izuku's, the contemplation in his head evident in his features before they turned back up. So I just ... Stay here and act like nothing ever happened. Kinda. Izuku laughed as he thought more about what was being said. Maybe ... Act like the hero you want to be, that you think you should be, so you don't have to be what you don't want to be and never wanted to be ever again. The red-eyed boy blinked to the green teen with a more stoic face. That is the sappiest shit I think I've ever heard you say. And I've fucking listened to your stories you tell, Eri. I didn't think you could top any of that sap. But here we fucking are. Izuku sputtered like an engine, red growing on the red cheeks he'd already gained from the cold air. Kakin, I'm trying to be serious here. I'll do it, Katsuki told him quickly, helping to call the other teen's outburst. I didn't say I wouldn't. I just have to ... Stay her and prove myself to you. His eyes flickered to the side in thought for a brief second. Prove to you that I mean it when I say I want to be better. Izuku nodded slowly and licked his lips. Yeah, just ... That. Fine, I can do that, I guess. Katsuki scoffed a moan laugh. I don't really have a choice, do I? Either I try or I don't. Really not that much else to it. His lips flatlined again. Is it really that hard for you to say my name and stop calling me that childish shit? Izuku blinked. His hands came in front of his chest, indexes swirling about as he talked. It's just natural for me to say, you know. I can't help it sometimes. Izuku. Katsuki said his name, tilting his head back and looking at the awning they had to keep the snow off of them. He repeated the other boy's name one time and then another, lips jutting out as the last syllable left his lips. He looked back down to the boy he was naming. I'll keep calling you Deku in front of everyone else so I don't have to hear them debate what shit we're talking about just because I'm saying your fucking name. But when it's just you and me, I'm not calling you anything else other than Izuku. I expect the same fucking thing from you. A finger jabbed in the green boy's direction, a scowl and frown marking his face as he continued. I don't deserve shit from you, but I'm asking for this anyways. That fair? Izuku couldn't help but let his lips stretch into a brighter smile than the boys had made in the past several minutes. Yeah, alright, Katsuki. He tried the name for himself, again, noting just how different it was from what he was used to. If it means you're staying. Of fucking course I'm staying. And I'll start by staying inside. You too. Katsuki lumbered forward, pressing his hands to Izuku's shoulder to turn him around and push him to the door. Keep standing out here and you'll get pneumonia before I do, and I don't want to have to deal with your sick ass for the rest of the break. We have classes in 2 days, and I don't need you sneezing all over me before we get back. Fucking move. You have your own goddamn feet. Izuku laughed to himself, and held back laughing harder as Katsuki scoffed and knocked him in the back of the head to keep him walking. He rubbed his head and kept a pace beside Katsuki down the stairs, but he didn't cease his smiling. The blonde boy kept his eyes on the stairs as they descended in a hard stare as he always did, but his body was still eased and slouched their way down. Izuku wanted to comment on it, but he kept his words of happiness beneath his throat. As they continued their downward spiral, the two boys came across the ascending Kyoka Inari. The young girl dashed into Izuku's legs, hugging them and trapping him in place as Katsuki carried on down the stairwell. The blonde boy said his piece to the green boy as he disappeared around the bend, seemingly ignoring the parting words of Izuku and the placid stare of Jiryu. The young girl kept most of Izuku's attention instead, climbing into his arms as he picked her up and clutching his shirt when telling him Kyoka invited her to the older teen's room to play piano. The purple-haired girl told him he was welcome to join, and much coercing from Eri only solidified his agreement on their way to Jiryu's room. All for one kept his breathing low, the hum of the sensors and cameras still buzzing in his marred ears. The joints of the mounted guns clicked and fidgeted every other second, sending short waves through the walls with each move. Cursed with attentiveness, he learned when he had taken the quirk. It was too useful a power, an ability, a fallback to give up just because so much went on around him. It worked sufficiently well in the place of his eyes. It was also one of the few quirks he could still manage to use in his weakened state. All Might had left him reeling in whiplash, his body catching up to the years upon years of suppressed injuries and losses and medical examination and procedures he had experienced since their first and brutal fight. The second fight only worsened the pain, but he had the quirks to dilute those, enough so to prevent from passing out from his wounds. The pain wouldn't stop him, though. There was still much to be done. Shigaraki had taken control of the underworld, or was at least said to do so sooner than later. With the death and murder of Chisaki and the arrest of the Precepts of Death, one of if not the most fearsome competition had been taken down, leaving the League the free space to grow in name and power in its wake. While the outside world held many opportunities for possible followers and companions, there were many more of higher fame and power surrounding All for One now. Muscular had been kept alive following his battle at the training camp. Thought he did not know who specifically had taken down the man of body mass. Moonfish was in worse conditions, but he could still function properly enough to kill again. That would work just fine. Stain, sadly enough, was power wasted on a single ideal, noted the wielder of taking. His strength and speed would be very useful under his wing, under Shigaraki's more fine-tuned guidance now that he was learning how to take the reins of the League. He would take convincing, he knew that. For some time, All for One plotted his escape. Said plan changed every few days or so, the growing information he gained of his prison and its true inner workings coming to light and forming another piece to the puzzle of his revival. He would need time to do so, however. The quirks he had to use, his body was too weak to handle at their best when he recovered under police treatment. And it was a when he would take advantage of their pity as his means of leave. He wouldn't have the same control or reign with fear he had before, even when he returned to his loyal crew. But it was in Shigaraki's hands now. The job to take had fallen to Tamura. The fitting quirk would come his way soon, to truly give him the iron fist his collection needed. The whirling stopped. All for One dared to turn his head as the sensors lessened, tracking his movements as the detectors and vibrations calmed and the guns removed their clips. The belligerent and numerous, always on security turning off. In the world's most dangerous and highly guarded facility, he smiled under the plastic mask and rolled his head as the door behind him opened. Meal time, at midnight. The old villain chuckled darkly in the dim lighting. Am I finally being treated like my age? I'm only several dozen years old and it has taken this long to catch up with me. He extended his senses, bouncing images off his surroundings and taking notice of the two empty-handed and safely armed unusual guards walk up beside him. Food is usually required to have a meal at any given time. so I believe it is safe to assume you're not here to feed me." One man took stance beside him, facing too fuzzy to picture but shoulders and hands tense as the folded behind his back. The other kept walking forward and turned on heel in front of first-generation quirk gentlemen, all for one side, fogging the mask that funneled him air. I must say, I was not expecting company so soon. I would have guessed a few more weeks, maybe months before anyone came my way. I would have at least expected Tamura to come and visit me himself. But no matter, better to err on the side of caution, even when the game is in your favor. No shame in that. The man in front swiped a hand behind himself, a grin forming on All for One's face as he readied for release. Then the man beside him turned by the waist and took hold of his breathing mask, yanking it up and off the old villain's face and yanking him out of his moment of satisfaction. Then the man in front of him pointed a gun to his chest and fired. All for One jolted under his binds, turning down to face where the spike in his chest had appeared. The first shot was followed by nothing but his own reactions, his mix of surprise and the small boil of anger that he felt very rarely. And then the two were overshadowed by the giddy feeling of glee he last remembered watching All Might's smile fade at Nana's name. A bullet. Really? The elder villain lifted his head, easing back up in his seat and facing the man in front of him, who showed no signs of backing down. "I can take the strongest punch the world's greatest hero had to offer in live, and you come in here to shoot me." He took a breath of the pristine and fabric-scented air of his cell, exhaling in a cough to settle his lungs. The sensors didn't register in his head, and no movement to rearm themselves were being made. He smiled widely and flexed his body to push the bullet out of his skin. "I thank you for the opportunity to..." A violent cough shook his lungs and the whole of his body, and a liquid rose up his throat was spat out against his leg. The taste of iron lingered on his tongue. All for One turned back to the bullet in his chest. Feeling the prick still there, unremoved though he had tried, he could see the bullet. He couldn't picture it. He extended his sense. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't feel the sensors that watched over his shoulders. He couldn't form a figure in the place of the two men that were supposed to be in front of him. His quirk was failing him. How was his quirk fail? His head whipped violently to the man in front of him, an uncommon snarl gracing his lips. Another bang rang through his ears, though muffled it was registered. His body convulsed again, a sound that must have been a scream or a cry that he wasn't used to making anymore. Pain shot through his arms, and the two limbs slackened in their binds in the chair arms. A shout resonated in front of him, yelling out a plea in a name he recognized but didn't have time to ponder as a third bullet contacted his center and another his shoulder. Through his burning blood and cooling bones he tried to call for his quirks. But his senses did not return, his claws did not grow, his muscles did not expand. His quirks did not respond. The shouting was lost in a soft ring that grew louder and louder. A second voice could not be made out. A click and a barrage of muffled booms or bangs or whacks couldn't be determined as his body shook and bleed out the mouth and the few holes ridding his chest and the small pricks where needles of bullets had stuck in him. Light flashed and burned on his skin as the heat left his body. Sensations dropped to charring to freezing to nothing. His body slouched and fell into the bonds that tied him to his chair, oblivious to the shouts of two men and more gunshots and more flashing lights and more screaming. Around him, the rest of the world died out in his ears. To the rest of the world, All for One died at 36 on January 1st in his own cell. If Toru appreciated anything about her quirk, it was her ability to avoid problems. She wasn't born with her quirk, like most children were, and she knew her family couldn't be happier about that. Had empty space come out of her mother, Toru was sure everyone in the room during her birth would have had a panic attack. Her quirk was but a strange mashing of her parents' quirks, an ability to see through walls and the ability to refract light. Her own quirk was but a freak mutation of the two, the likes of which not even the doctors were able to guess before it appeared. It had its uses, though. While she never gained her mother's ability as a side effect, the power to refract light as her father did proved useful enough in the way her quirk managed it. A classmate back in elementary had the ability to shoot lasers from his eyes like an ancient comic book character, only with the control to turn them on and off. It was Toru's own idea for him to shoot them at her, believing she could redirect them, and her own fault when she glowed red and almost gave one of the other children a problem with their epilepsy. It proved as a useful means in training for heroics, blinding the opponent for long enough to approach and take them down. She had learned basic martial arts to apply in those scenarios in training, but really nothing more. Her physique, while impossible to judge at a passing glance through her abdomen, needed a more mature body to function within the spectrum she needed it to be more powerful and quick to taking people down and make up for the lack of a strength boost other people got with their quirks. The problem, as well, with having to strip down to best utilize not only her invisibility but her second nature of light refraction, was something adults and other children still disliked, even despite her situation. She kept quiet about her ideas the few years building up to Yuei, doing her best to avoid any more teasing on the situation until she could prove its usefulness. That same teasing is how she found out how useful it was to get away from bullies. People who mocked her more cheery nature and attitude at practically everything, along with taunting her and insulting her for her lack of modesty compared to the other boys and girls in her school. Despite their words mocking her invisible physique, she still used the tactic of going nude to run away from anyone who tried to follow her after school, and after several times learned better how to keep quiet in steps, voice, and tears to avoid them. In the 3 years before joining Yuei, she had moved to a school where she knew virtually no one from before, so her classmates then were respectful, minus the few exceptions and perverted, hormonal teens she had as classmates. Then in joining Yuei had she been surrounded by people who were respectful and kind and nice, even if they had their own problems with her lack of a uniform. No one mocked her or teased her or bullied her about it. The only real concern she had was Minta, whose comments were more tasteless than they were offensive, and he was held back on a leash that was Tsuyu's tongue choking him until he's the color of his hair. So with her quirk she had left the New Year's party early for the night, trickling out with the few others before her. Excluding the few who couldn't make it to the party, for better or for worse, the duo family of the class and the rocker girl, who was one of the many little Eri clung to, were the only ones who left the common room before anyone else, especially within the hour of the new year. By the time the clock struck 1, everyone else was still lounging around in the dead of night, including the explosive boy who had been the first to disappear and the only one to return. Only when Mina declared to do a game of truth or dare did Toru book it out of the room without so much as a word. She loved the pink-skinned girl like a sister, but she knew how dangerous the teenage girl could be when given the opportunity to find or make any new gossip. Hagakure had promptly passed out in her room not even a few minutes after entering, still dressed in her daily clothes and hogging the giant plushie under the covers for the rest of the night, a move she came to regret the following morning, somehow tangled against it and rolling off the comforter and onto the carpet floor of her room. She lifted herself up with a groan from her lips and another in her arms, trying to climb the side of the bed. She crawled to the blink screen of her phone like a moth to the flame, and groaned in her head as the comparison had her picturing Kaminari jumping to the nearest source of light to keep up with the modern internet. She scrolled past the few unimportant notifications she had on, just in case one day something interesting, and clicked through the class group chat, reading over the few messages her classmates left before all crashing for the night themselves. Mina and Denki had left a few images and captions from the after party she had bailed on, the former leaving Hagakure a direct message in their own chat for ditching so soon on her. She sent a small apology message for the pink girl to find when she was out of her sugar coma. Toru, remember, a lot of cake could go around, and a lot of it found its home in the pink girl's stomach. A ding of a new notification appeared at the top of her phone, and Toru was prepared to swipe it away before reading the words Tartarus and All Might within the same sentence. She followed it into social media before following the link to the article, and skimmed through the words to the sentences that jumped out at her. Villain who faced All Might found dead in Tartarus. At 12:34 on January 1, 2164, an alarm went off inside the high-security villain housing prison of Japan, Tartarus, alerting the night shift officers of action within the cell of the most dangerous villain in their custody, the unnamed and faceless man who had fought the previous #1 hero of the world, All Might, before said hero's retirement. Officers on the scene took the warning as none like it before, taking every precaution and putting every man they had to the cell in an instant, even calling in what pro heroes they could into booking their way over. The sight they found in the cell was not what they were expecting to find. The man who had been tied to his chair and locked away from the world was found dead in his seat the moment any officer entered the room, shot by 2 men dressed in the same uniform as any other officer working the night shift before anyone else could arrive. The 2 men surrendered without a fight. No sign of any struggle or damage reported by any of the officers or heroes who arrived on the scene. Endeavor, the current #1 hero of Japan and of the world, was on the scene and present at the prison, seemingly recovered from his city encounter just months ago, but had nothing to say or add to the matter until the 2 perpetrators could be questioned for their crimes of breaking into the prison and taking the laws into their own hands. We've reached out to All Might for word on the matter, but we have yet to receive a response. She skipped past the stock photo of the villain, noting the press didn't have one to use more fitting of the headline, all the way down to the bottom of the page, and the 2 identified men who had stirred up the story. Edit. 1056. The 2 men who had infiltrated Tartarus and shot the high-profiled villain are Reka Wadatsu and Teo, brothers and former members of the Yakuza tied to the raid and arrest of the Precepts of Death earlier this year. The Reka brothers are 2 of 5 Yakuza reported as Mia following the raid and following captures of Yakuza members in August of this year. On the inside, Hagakure could hear her inner thoughts jumping for joy. The Yakuza, a relatively dangerous group if acted correctly, was dwindling by the numbers, and the most dangerous man alive was now no longer. To hear news implying the easing safety in the world was something she wanted to jump on her bed and shout for the whole dorms to hear. Only one thing held her back, and the thoughts of it sent her barreling out of her room and down the hall to the only other girl on her floor. A few knocks on Jiru's door had the invisible girl flinching at the loud impact, leading her to soften the pounding of her fist against wood. The door swung open in response, and Toru was happy her body was invisible and her reflexes were sharp enough that she didn't hit a groggy and pouting Jiru on the head to knock again. The earjack girl rubbed her eyes to the sight of floating clothing. Toru, it's too early in the morning for this, Kyoka grumbled out. What do you want? Hey Jiru. Sorry for waking you if I did. The invisible girl chuckled softly and rubbed the back of her hair. It's also midday already, by the way. It is. A whine in Jiru's words could be heard. God, I stayed up way too late. Did you know Eri doesn't sleep? She doesn't. I'm inclined to believe so if she decided to keep playing until 5 in the morning. Jiru leaned against the frame of her room. What do you need, Hagakure? I don't think I slept long enough. Eri was actually the person I came to see. Toru tilted body and head to try and peer over Jiru's shoulder. I thought I heard her with you and Midoriya last night, and I was wondering if they spent the night with you or... Jiru coughed into her shoulder as a hand pulled the door closer against her, hiding the room behind her while simultaneously trying to hide a blush against the shoulder of her shirt. And no, neither of them are here. When Eri got tuckered out, Midoriya took her back to his room. I'm pretty sure the two of them went there. Probably still are. Toru groaned and turned to the staircase beside the door. Now I gotta walk more. The girl moved into a small jog down the stairs, calling over her shoulder, thanks Jiru. Sorry for waking you. The purple-haired girl sunk her head to her shoulders, hiding the jacks of her earlobes under the cloth of her shirt, grumbling, you could have just texted him up. You don't have to be so loud. She knew the invisible girl couldn't hear here though, and didn't bother to shout after her. As if I'd let a boy sleep in my room. Izuku was used to less sleep than the norm, especially for someone his age. He hadn't gotten a night of 8 hours for a few months, from what he could remember. He didn't mind it, though, given the work he was putting into becoming a hero and the payoff his work was showing. He wished he could do more and perform more and better than he did, given how lackluster he truly was compared to his goal. But he told himself he had the time to spend to get there. Even if the walls were closing in around him, Izuku was holding them off from ever truly pressuring him. It was motivation to put in more work, knowing one day he'd get there. And he made sure to spend that time wisely, like putting in an extra hour of training or catching ahead of homework and assignments like a few of his classmates, or just watching Eri sleep as he did now. The older Midoriya child scooped up Eri's hair with a finger, pushing it back behind her ear and out of her face when it had tried to cover her. He had no idea she had the energy to stay up so late, even for something such as New Year's, so he assumed Sato had something of his own in the cake to give the class more energy to try and make it to daybreak. Izuku doubted it could have been a drug. The taller boy wasn't someone like that to his classmates, especially with a child around the class. He gently tugged on the Clefairy plushie blocking him from her, bringing it to tap the bottom of her chin and elicit her to hug the doll tighter. What words she mumbled out were incoherent, but the sight alone was all he wanted. Relax and smile to. A knock on his door turned his attention away from Eri, and had him climb out of the covers gently enough as to not awaken the little girl. Slipping on his green gloves as he passed his desk, he pulled the door open slowly, having to lower his gaze a moment to the floating shirt and pants and back up to where he believed Toru's face was. Hey Toru, Midoriya greeted, rubbing a hand on the back of his neck. What's up? Hey, Midoriya. I didn't wake you, did I? Izuku shook his head and looked back to the still sleeping form of Eri. No, I've been awake for a while already. And Eri's still sleeping, so it's fine. Is there something wrong? Not really, just, okay maybe kind of, but can I talk to you alone? Hagakure uses her phone to gesture him out into the hall. I don't want Eri to hear this. Izuku gave a look of furrowed eyebrows to his classmate before dropping the stare as he turned to the girl still in bed. With a sigh, he snuck between the door and the frame and eased it closed before turning to the invisible girl. What's wrong? The straps of Toru's top bounced. Wow, dad mode already, she commented, gaining the immediate reaction of sending the boy in front of her spiraling to pull back on his tone. Nah, dude, it's cool. It's kinda appropriate anyways. It's just, instead of letting her words do the talking, she left the job to the phone in her hand, the news tab still open on screen. Izuku took the phone cautiously, easing it into his own grip and reading over the headline. That alone got his eyes bulging and sent him scrolling down the page in a hurry. Hagakure only nodded in sympathy, noticing the signs of horror, surprise, and bafflement on her classmate's face, covering over his inner thoughts of realization at the many points the article made and brought up with his own secrets and life. All for one dead at the hands of the Yakuza. Weren't they conspiring with one another, working together in collecting the serum made from Eri's blood and mass-producing it to affect the rest of the world? What spurred this on? Even if their teamwork was rough around the edges, nothing in the news suggested the two were entirely disconnected from an alliance with one another. What chain reaction brought both sides to this end? Midoriya. The words of the girl in front of him took Izuku's attention out of his thoughts. Are you okay? You're looking a little pale there, buddy. The green boy nodded with a gulp and handed the phone back to its owner. Yeah, I just need to process it a bit. None of this is good, Izuku mused in his head, pushing the sight of Toru's clothing and the phone slipping into her pocket a second to his thoughts. All for One is dead, but that doesn't change anything about Shigaraki. The League's been radio silent for a few weeks now. This news will probably spur a response out of them sooner than later. And with the leader dead, that means total control of the League is supposed to follow Tamura if everyone does follow him. It's something, all right, Toru hushed aloud. If anything, the turn of her shirt went left and right. Think it's good that the man isn't around to terrorize us anymore. If anything, that just makes Shigaraki our main enemy. And we have no idea what he can do now. That Namu that fought Endeavor proved they still have tricks up their sleeves, even if All for One's quirk and the many he took with it aren't available to them anymore, unless he already passed them on in some way to Tamura. Would he have? And that means the League of Villains is now weaker than they were before, and they'll probably just fall apart with their leader gone. They're not weaker at all. Tamura's matured by now, I'm sure of it. He's got a grasp on the League in some way, even if not fully. I doubt even one non-believer on their team will stop the whole of their group or even harm Shigaraki from getting what he wants. Now they just don't have the distraction of getting their old leader out of prison. This death is just going to be motivation to attack us with more reason in their hearts. And that the Yakuza are losing more and more members by the day. But that means they're still around and capable of getting whatever they want, just as before. 2 of their men, within the walls of what's supposed to be the strongest fortress of a prison in the world, with the same quirk-neutralizing bullets they were making before their arrest, which the last of which were supposed to have gone missing in the hands of the League of Villains, of who the Yakuza were supposed to be working with before they killed the former's leader. The fact they had any power at all after the death of their leader in Overhaul should have been impossible, but that didn't seem to stop them. At least we'll have less to worry about these next few years until we get to graduate. And then maybe by then some other league or whatever will show up and be our threat to face as real heroes. We don't have that kind of time. I don't have that kind of time. Shigaraki knows who I am. And he without doubt should know what I'm supposed to become. The old era of this fight is now over, and the titles have fallen to me and Tamura to finish this. All Might's words are coming true sooner than I thought they would have. If I stand any chance in ending this feud between All for One and One for All, then I need to be prepared sooner than later to stop Shigaraki. I'm trying to find something to say to make you calm down, but I'm just making this worse, aren't I? I'm so sorry, Midoriya. The green-haired teen startled and fell back against his door, and bounced right back to his feet the instant he made contact. And then no, Toru. His hands waved as blurs between him and the invisible girl. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I got lost in my thoughts. I'm sorry. A finger jolted over his shoulder to the room behind him. I don't want her to get roped back into this mess. The sigh of defeat was audible from the girl. Yeah, that's why I hurried down here. Thought you might want to hear it so it doesn't sneak up on the 2 of you. And I don't really know if it would be okay for Eri to hear. Anyways, and no. I know. Izuku nodded and wiped a hand over his mouth. I don't think she can hear of it right now. Not like this. I can't do that to her. Fair enough, Toru tacked on at the end. Do you want me to send a message through the class chat to keep quiet about it too? I know you don't really talk often in it. Which you totally should, because Denki wants to know if you have any memes to top his own. It'll be cool, I promise, but I can go ahead and do it if you want. Yeah, please. That would be great, thanks. And sorry for not, talking on there more. Been kinda busy, And, it's not something I'm really too. Their conversation cut short as the door to Izuku's room squeaked open, prompting the 2 teens to turn and stare down at the face peeking through the opening. Eri shuffled through the doorway, almost swaying out with the big Clefairy doll hugged to her chest. Her eyelids stayed over half her eyes as she yawned and leaned towards the teenage boy. Daddy. Izuku was down on his knees and hovering over the young girl, arms circled around her to keep her stable on her feet. Sorry, Eri, he spoke to her, softly. Did we wake you? She nodded into her doll, leaning against his arms and falling against him to stay up. Sorry about that. Hagakure wanted to talk with me a moment. You looked like you could have used some more sleep, so I didn't want to wake you. She moved with his arms, sitting her down on his lap to be more comfortable. Do you want to go back to bed? She nodded again and hummed as Izuku lifted her into the air when he stood and turned to his classmate. Please, if you could, he pleaded to Toru. And thanks. She nodded with her upper body, probably because it made her action clearer, Izuku guessed. Don't mention it, dude, she responded. I'll make sure none of us do. Izuku couldn't help the less than pleased look he gave her for that, though she seemingly brushed it off as she turned back to the stairwell. Sorry for waking you both. Sleep well, you too. Izuku watched as she took off down the steps. And as Eri lifted one hand and waved, "Bye, Violet," he carried her back through the door and tucked her back into bed, as she cuddled between her pillow and plushie. He moved to leave her be, but the hand that shot out and clutched his shirt said otherwise, and he found himself lying down atop the covers beside her. In silence, he watched her attempt to sleep, hands fumbling about between the blanket and the doll in his own hands. She settled on him, gripping two of his fingers as she kept her eyes closed to sleep again. And Izuku said nothing to disturb her. He said nothing as she turned over with her toy to face him. He said nothing as his eyes opened sluggishly. He said nothing as she looked down to their intertwined hands, with his free fingers resting atop those holding onto him. He only spoke when she tried to pull off the glove. Izuku's other hand came up to cover hers, stopping her motion while attempting to slide his hand back into the glove. "Eri, what are you doing?" he questioned, a laugh cutting through his perplexion. The young girl in question hummed what Izuku thought could have been annoyance as she tried to pull on the glove again, only for his hands to keep her from making any progress. So Izuku pressed. "Eri, I want to see your hand," was the soft response she gave. Izuku could hear the whine in her voice, and kept his hand placed atop hers despite her physical protests. She kept her eyes down and away from his. "Eri, you should ask something like that with words, not try to force it." He lowered his body more onto the bed, leaning his head down towards Eri's and provoking her to curl in further on her grip. "If you just asked, I would have taken them off. You know that, right?" The hand he held atop hers used one finger to stroke her knuckles, what he had hoped would have been a good attempt at calming her down, but she stayed adamant on hiding away under the covers and her toy. "If you talk to me, I'll listen. I promise, Eri. I'm not mad at you." Those words seemed to strike something in the young girl, as her eyes snapped up to his with the surprise he wasn't too happy to see. "Tell me why, and I'll take them off for you." "Okay." With a swallow, she looked back to their layered hands, and Izuku could feel her attempts to remove his glove cease. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "You're hiding your scars." There was no doubt to her words, no question to her statement, and Izuku couldn't find a way to tiptoe around her words. "Yes." His nod along the pillow was slow between his words. "I am." "Why?" Her grip slackened, but Izuku made no move away from her hands. He kept himself where he was. Azuri made no attempt to move away either. "You told me I don't have to hide my scars." That he did. He remembered that well. Having to undo and redo her bandages until her arms were fully healed of the wounds her captors left her with happened almost as often as she changed clothes. She wanted nothing but to wear sleeves and jackets and long pants to hide as much skin as possible. She thought they were an embarrassment compared to the unscathed skin of many of Izuku's classmates. Kirishima's scar was barely noticeable above his eye, and Shadows blended in with his hair and skin color combination. Compared to them, her scars stood out like a sore thumb. The closest person she resembled was Izuku, though she never thought that as a bad thing. The thought alone wasn't enough to convince her she had nothing to worry about or fear. It did take Izuku stepping in to change that. Despite what had caused those scars, Izuku thought they were a sign for more than the people that hurt her. She had come out of their grasp. She had not only escaped but fought her way out. And the scars only helped to show just how much of her was freed from her captors. Izuku saw Eri's scars as showcasing her bravery, for not breaking under Chisaki's iron grip, for not succumbing to his words and his lies and leaving him behind for freedom. Unofficially, she was the 21st student in the class of one at Yuei High, and according to her legal sibling, the strongest of everyone around her. It was an early issue they had tackled, after she had been adopted into the Midoriya family, but before she had started to see Izuku as the father figure she referred to him as. Before Izuku was told, people thought he was trying to get himself killed. "My scars aren't anything like yours, Eri," Izuku started with a soft voice. Slowly he pulled his hand free from the rest of the glove, leaving the stretchy green material to fall slack between their fingers. His now bare hand sunk between her and the bed, cupping against the cheek on her face. "Your scars were given to you by someone else. I am the reason I have these scars." One of Eri's hands drew back to her face, pressing against the back of his hand and tracing along the scar that curved around it. "I have scars because I couldn't do anything to stop them, other than to do nothing at all, and I couldn't just do that. I had to step in when I had to step in, when no one else would, even if that meant paying a price like this." He did nothing to fight as she pulled off his other glove with her free hand, leaving both green rubbers to lie empty between them as her hands cupped along the backs of his. "I've worried people by getting them, and I continue to do by having them. I am hiding them, out of sight, out of mind. Anything to let them worry less." Eri pulled on his other hand, bringing it close to cup on the other side of her face and letting them squish her cheeks. "I don't mind your scars," she mumbled between his palms, succeeding in drawing a laugh out of the teen. "I think they make you look pretty." "Thank you, Eri." Izuku curled in closer to the young girl and pecked the top of her head. Her face pressed into his hands more as she failed to escape it. "That means a lot to me," she hummed in satisfaction and nuzzled against his palms as her eyes were cast down. And the two rested in a short silence before Eri spoke up again. "Daddy." Her short question was met with a small hum from Izuku, urging her to continue. "Can I have something?" Of course, Iri. Izuku scooted himself closer to her, moving his arms out to encase her and her doll in a loose hug, one where she got to use his triceps as a pillow. Though selfish of him, Izuku did want to leave the conversation behind. The news his classmate had given him was still fresh in his mind, and he'd rather do anything that could make Iri smile than linger on something that would make her cry. With how soft her voice had been, he'd panicked several times when he thought she was about to. You can have whatever you want. Really, there was a sparkle in her eyes as she looked up at him, one getting him to widen his smile and nod. Really, he confirmed with a nod. It only made her glow brighter. And Izuku didn't think he could be any happier to see her so happy and excited than ever before. I want a mommy. Iri liked to think she knew her daddy Deku well. While her memories were small in numbers, and her social skills were getting better, she was able to read her daddy's face when he wasn't talking. She could guess pretty well what Deku was feeling from the looks on his face, and she could usually get right how to respond to make everything better, even when everything was good. Smile to widen his smile, dance to move his feet more, jump him and cuddle him to keep him from frowning. Whatever worked, at least it worked. She also knew how to get some secrets out of him, how to make him talk about things she wanted to know too, things that she could tell were important but sometimes not enough to tell her about right away. It was how she found out about her memory problems, and how she found out about the New Year's surprise party, and how she found out about the cake slice that was waiting for her in the refrigerator that Deku wasn't going to eat. And it was how she found out about his feelings for his own scars, something that seemed opposite to how she was told to feel about her scars, a fear she didn't have for them. But Iri couldn't think differently of her daddy for having those feelings. She had the same emotions to the idea of a mommy. Truth be told, Iri was scared of having a mommy, or at least a new one. She couldn't remember who her first mommy was, what she did, what she looked like, or anything else about her, except for the feelings that lingered trying to remember her. Someone who no longer loved her, someone who had abandoned her, someone who had given her up and let her fall into Chisaki's hands. Iri didn't like to think about her mommy, always trying to push the feelings and the thoughts away and not think about them again. As much as she wanted to get rid of those emotions, they were in charge of how she saw everyone around her already. Iri doesn't remember who they were, or what they did, or what they looked like, but Iri knew she had a grandparent, a parent to one of her parents, which she couldn't remember, who loved her very much, who spent time with her only a few short times when she had her mommy and daddy, but someone she remembered being around her with a pretty smile, who tried to protect her when her parents were gone and Chisaki was there to take over. But Iri didn't think of them as gone, just taken. That person and their love never went away, they just couldn't reach her. It was why Iri saw so many people and called them her aunt and uncle. They were all like one big family, and Iri didn't want to replace the feeling of her grandparent, but get it back to her and have it again. The only other person she had in her life was her daddy, and that was a different case from her mommy and grandparent. But those two, their love for her was taken, one replaced by scary emotions and another pulled out of her fingers. But for her daddy, everything was just gone. She could barely remember the feeling of love connected to the idea of her old daddy, but before the other two emotions of love were gone, his was gone, and all that she had left was something empty. Emotions for her daddy were as gone as her hold on the love from her grandparent, and she did not know why or where it went. So to fill the space, she tried to find another daddy. A lot of the people who surrounded her now could have been her daddy. Sleepy Caterpillar Man had a soft voice and gave her a good amount of attention. Mirio spent a lot of time with her, helping her learn what she had missed out on for other kids her age. Big Toshi had a weird but big smile that went with his big hands, and he too had the voice and attention-giving things Caterpillar gave her. But, in the end, she chose Deku to be her daddy. When she was still stuck at the hospital, he would come by just as often as everyone else would, and she loved all of their visits. But her favorite day was when he and Auntie came in and told her she was a part of their family now. For their first few days together, Deku gave her more attention than anyone must have given her before. He gave her a place to sleep in his arms, gave her toys to play with that she loved a whole bunch, gave her food, gave her clothing, gave her baths, and gave her love. Auntie and Co had told her Deku was acting like a helicopter parent, but Iri knew he couldn't fly like that, so Auntie told her that it meant he cared for her a lot and would do anything for her. Auntie said some kinds didn't like it when their parents acted like that, and Iri couldn't imagine why anyone wouldn't like all of that love and attention. Everything Iri needed and wanted was in Deku, all of it was in Izuku, and she couldn't think of anyone better to be her daddy than him. So Iri became his helicopter princess and did her best to return the love, all the smiles and hugs and bouncing and dancing and cuddling, all to tell him how much she loved him too. And with Deku telling her how he felt about his scars, she now had to tackle her fears and find a mommy. If not for her, then for her daddy. Because mommies are supposed to love daddies, and they are supposed to love each other, and everyone was supposed to be happy. It's what the book said, and it's what Iri wanted to be true. And Iri knew who she wanted her mommy to be. If Iri's question wasn't embarrassing enough for Izuku, he had to live with the fact he nearly blacked out in front of her following it. His brain had gone and shut down on itself for all of what must have been 3 seconds before Aries, panicking and fumbling against him, snapped him back into consciousness. A quick and fumbled apology atop a really long hug patted away any worry the young girl was showing, and got her to ask what she had previously stated. Luckily for Izuku, he did not pass out a second time. Surprise decided to grow prominent within him, taking into account Aries' words, the lack of sleep just previously on Aries' face, and what deeper meanings her question could have. Aries wanted a mother, and that was fine and all, but in what ways did she want one? Did she want a girl or woman to look up as she herself was growing up? Did she think the family she had was somehow a broken one, with the role of a mother vacant for too long, that she just wanted someone there to think of their family as whole? And taking into account the people she had been around, of his class and his friends, did she want her daddy to act more like one and actually have a significant other like most fantasies? Izuku wasn't fond of thinking it as something bad or unhealthy or even somehow manipulative, so he gave Eri a yes before he could truly bring his internal squabbling to a calm. Real panic, that he was actually aware of feeling, had to be contained behind his lips as Eri cheered and stumbled to crawl over him and off the bed. Apparently the approval of having a mother wiped away any sleep. Eri still had to have her bouncing around the room to grab some actual clothes and whatever toy or figurine she could to tell them the good news. And Izuku stayed seated on the bed, smiling a wobbly smile externally and trying to break down the situation internally. After reviewing the evidence before him and only breathing through his nose, Izuku concluded that Eri just wanted a woman figure to look up to. That was, there was and could not be any deeper meaning to her wanting a mommy than for her own benefit. He could accept that, and keeping that in mind would do his best to help her find one. Unless, that is, she already had someone in mind, in which case Izuku would have to tell them what Eri really wants out of them, so they don't need to feel pressured at the idea that her mommy and daddy only have to fill the roles as models and not as a couple. That's a panic Izuku doesn't want to have in the middle of the day in front of his friends. It was the gargling of her stomach that inclined Izuku to take Eri downstairs once she was fully dressed. She smiled a beam of light at him as she settled in his arms for the trip, instead of walking by his side down the steps. Izuku had to agree it was probably for the best, given he wasn't sure in Eri bouncing off the walls until she landed in the arms of the girl she wanted to be her mommy. Least he could do was contain her excitement with the best grip he had for the situation. And he hoped that, just maybe, he and Eri wouldn't have to approach the girl the young one was thinking about until another day vanished as they descended to the common room and found it stacked with half the class. Ada, Anjiro, and Takoyami populated the kitchenette, each preparing their own meals for the time of day, off in their own conversations as they pass ingredients off to one another. And every girl in his class were lined up together on the long couch conversing over their own food and drinks. Izuku could feel himself sweat the bullets he wished he could load up and fire off to wake up from this fate. But the seemingly vibrating child in his arms was enough to convince him that, yes, this was real, and it was likely one of them. "Oh, wow, you two are actually awake," Ashido commented as she spotted the pair descend the last step. "Mornin' Midori." "Hey, Horn Pal." Izuku greeted back with a grunt of a hello as the other girls greeted them as well. Eri waved back to them as she was carried towards the kitchen, her hand flicking left and right at the wrist in excitement. Yep, it was one of them. Izuku gulped as he entered the kitchen as sat Eri on one of the open counter spaces. "Good afternoon, Midoriya." Ada greeted him, turning only a second away from his preparations before turning back to his work. Midoriya gave a soft greeting to him and the following gestures from the other two boys before the girl on the couch spoke up again. "It's supposed to be good morning, Ada," Ashido called out to the class president. "You greeted him wrong. It's an hour past noon," Anjiro commented as he finished his bowl and turned out to the seating area. "I don't think it's morning anymore. Morning ends when I say it ends." There was a slur to Mina's words. She must still be waking up, Izuku thought as he prepared Eri her own food. "That's how mafia works. Mina, I swear to God I will hit you for that," Jiro groaned beside her. The glare beneath her bangs was visible at all angles, and the aura around it more so. "It is too early." Again, hour past noon. Mashura plopped into the single-seated couch following his intrusion back into the conversation. "My body tells me it's only 9, so I'll trust that," Jiro countered, taking a long sip of her cup afterwards. "Such trust between body and spirit is a blessing to be had in our modern times," Takoyami noted in his ominous tone, giving the crowd on the couches a look over his shoulder. "There is not enough coffee in the world to let me take that seriously." The ear-jacked girl sighed into her drink. "There'll be even less if you keep drinking at all," the crow-headed classmate replied. Izuku tuned out of the continuing banter of his classmates as he worked on Eri's food, only stealing glances up to the girl in question not watching him. Her own eyes darted around the room, lingering on each person in sight as they spoke and moving on to the next when they followed with something of their own. The smile gracing her lips never died, never faltered, never changed. Watching her be so happy around people could warm his heart. but the notion she was about to see one of them as something more lingered in Izuku's head through and through. Izuku wished he wasn't as on edge on the subject as he was. As much as he wanted the situation to go right, he felt as though something could go wrong. Some huge misunderstanding could occur before Izuku could explain it to them or anyone. Or maybe the one he wants to look up to isn't comfortable with being called a mother. Or something Izuku couldn't even plan for would happen and no one would know what to do. As much faith as he had in Eri, the same couldn't be said for the universe for there to be any smooth sailing moving forward. With a bowl of katsudon prepped, Izuku carried Eri carrying her food towards the couches, hogging up a single seater for themselves. He kept quiet as she dug into her bowl. "Huh, Deku, aren't you going to eat anything?" Uraraka questioned. Noticing the teen in question frozen in his seat while the child in his lap ate, Izuku shook his head, hoping it hit his gulp. "No, I am not that hungry right now," he answered. He thought his stomach would probably reject any food he tried to eat with how he was feeling. "Skipping a meal is unhealthy for you, Midoriya." Ida chopped a hand towards his classmate in the common area. "See," you hummed out before Ida could interject more. "Most of us weren't even awake for the first meal of the day. You might be the only one here who was awake for breakfast." "I was awake for breakfast," Jiru piped up again. "I just finally went to bed instead of staying up anymore." Momo looked almost aghast beside her friend, commenting on how skipping sleep was unhealthy. Kyoka only grunted and pointed across to the small girl finishing her noodles. "Blame her. She didn't want to sleep until then. And neither of them look even remotely tired, so don't ask me what they did to wake up actually alive, cause I just slept." Izuku's arm wrapped around Eri in a protective gesture as the eyes in the room turned to them, and while he agreed that everyone else looked equally tired for people who stayed up late and got up later, he wasn't going to comment on that. I got my usual 5 hours of sleep." The president and the vice pres of the class both jolted, the latter holding back from a spit take. Izuku already knew what was to come, because it was what he feared hearing if he had told his own mother. 5 hours. Midoriya, that isn't enough sleep. Yaoyorozu looked borderline frantic as she placed her drink on the table before her and leaned forward. "Teenagers like us, especially as pro heroes in training, should be getting 8 hours a night. Our bodies need the rest in between all the work we do just getting ready to do work." I know. Midoriya tried sinking into the cushions behind him. He knew enough from his classmates about disrupting what was the bubbly Yaoyorozu personality. The hard stare of Ishido behind her warned him enough about worrying that. Or at least he hoped it was about that and not his sleeping habits. "But I'm just used to it by now, for my training. I feel like I'm getting enough." "Midoriya, pardon my blunt disregard, but I cannot believe you are." Ida came zipping out the kitchen with 2 bowls in his hands. Izuku wasn't sure when his friend had the time to make a bowl for him as much as he did himself, but given the hard stare Tenya had, he didn't turn it away when handed a bowl. "Everyone else here manages to get the sleep we all need to perform our best as students and as heroes. Bold of you to assume Fumi gets more than 4 hours a night." The chirping voice of Dark Shadow cut in, receiving himself a smack on the head from his host trying to hide with his other forearm. Ida and Yamomo turned both their attentions to Takoyami and his quirk for some words regarding his sleep too, but Izuku tuned out the conversation. When he moved the bowl he received down to his lap, his gaze lingered on Eri and he watched her as she watched the rest of the room. The eager aura she had when they entered the room was still there, but he noticed her hands shuffling against each other. How she fiddled between his legs, leaning one way or the other. How her head snapped from one of his classmates to the next and her mouth hung ajar as though she had something to say. Izuku felt that same tension in his chest. "Eri," Izuku whispered, turning the girl's face to his. "Are you still thinking about what I said earlier?" The young girl tilted her head down with a hum for her thoughts before she looked back up. "That we can watch a movie tonight." A soft laugh broke through his chest, easing up on his prior worries. "Well, yeah, we'll definitely do that, but I meant when you asked that you wanted a mommy." Eri nodded and he took a deep breath to continue. "You want to ask them right now, don't you?" The white-haired girl sported a blush as she turned away and nodded again. Izuku could see her eyes dart to the crowd still conversing before them. He smiled and poked her cheek, getting her to lean away with a mumble of embarrassment equal to what he hoped he wasn't showing on his own face. "I told you yes, but you need to ask them. It's only fair to you and them if you're the one who does it." When Eri looked back to him, her eyes shined with a new sense of wonder. "I get to pick the mommy?" she asked in a hushed voice, a finger pointed at herself. Izuku nodded, and she looked down and thought again. Before asking, "Is that how you got your mommy?" Izuku blinked in surprise, and looked away only a moment to see if any one of his classmates were watching him. None looked to be, but he leaned in closer regardless. "No, she was given me. I was her choice." A pause, and one he took to raise a hand atop her head. "I'm happy I was." She hummed and nuzzled up at the hand. Her face betrayed the sound of pleasure, though. "What about your daddy?" Izuku froze, though only externally. His hand rested on Eri's head, but it didn't move with her, or move when she tried to make it. The glint of a happy expression on his face drained away for something blank, and he turned his head away a moment from Eri's as he thought on her question. He never had mentioned his own father, had he? The closest mention of it came from Todoroki's jokes of it being All Might. But that was it. Not even his own mom had bothered to talk about him to Eri, and she probably knew more about what he was really doing across the sea more than Izuku did. But what was there to tell Eri about him when he barely knew anything himself? I have you, Izuku responded instead, trying a different approach as it built in his head. I have Mom. I have All Might and Mirio and Katsuki. He looked up again to the room of his classmates, and by the looks of it they were filtering out of their conversation. And I have everyone else here. I didn't get to choose any of them, but I'm happy I have them. And I'm happy I have you. He looked back down to Eri and met with her eyes shining up at him. And he smiled. I'm happy with what I've been given. And I trust you enough. His hand eased on her head again and pushed forward, pushing lightly against her horn and jolting her shoulders in response. I trust you enough to do this for me. Eri curled into Izuku's chest, pulling his fingers into her hands and holding them against her horn. Unlucky for him, Izuku didn't have the same ability to hide his face as his classmates took notice of him again, and he tried his best to hide what blush he felt against his hand and her head. Through the coos of the few in the crowd and what sounded like the quietest slap to quit it, he could hear Eri speak, "Can I do it right now?" This was it, and with a sharp inhale, Izuku replied, "Yes, you can." Izuku watched on in bated breath as Eri pressed into his hand one more time before climbing off his lap. The few seconds it took for Eri to move away from his were spent readjusting how he sat, realigning his clothing, messing with his hair, doing his best to balance his breathing. Whatever he could to make him feel externally comfortable so he could be so internally. But he didn't feel ready. Not when she turned away. Not when she walked towards the girls on the long couch. Not when she stopped in front of the girl closest to him, Ochako. While other classmates were looking between the three, Uraraka stayed watching Eri, who stayed watching her, as Izuku only looked back and forth between the two, afraid of looking any of his other classmates in the eyes. It went as naturally as it could have at the start. Uraraka smiled down at the young girl, placing her hands on top of Eri's, placed on top of her knees to grab the older girl's attention. "Hey Eri," she greeted the child. "What do you need?" The girl being questioned shied away a moment, looking down at their overlapping hands, before her courage returned and she looked up into the older girl's brown eyes. "Will you be my mommy?" The shattering of her icebreaker could be heard across the room, and all Izuku could manage was an uneasy smile, trying to act like nothing was happening. The only way he was able to keep that face was ignoring the wide-eyed stares when they turned his way. Ochako was one of the many shocked faces, understandably tomato red while looking at the answer expectantly. The brown bob-haired teen looked up to Izuku, at a loss for words at the little girl's request, and it was there Izuku couldn't keep it up. Before his face could falter, he threw his head back and stared at the ceiling, not wanting to respond to the continuing coos of Mina, Toru in dark shadow or have any fingers pointed at him for the cause of it. Though the corner of his eye he could still see the couch ahead of him, and watched as Uraraka sputtered at the looks of their classmates and turned back down to the young girl still waiting for an answer. Why you want me to be your Mommy?" Eri nodded, still not off-put by anyone else's reactions to her question. She seemed determined to get a reply. "Daddy said I could, but I had to ask," she replied. Izuku did his best not to act like he was watching when Ochako and the rest looked at him, but he felt every inch of tension leave his body as Uraraka looked back down to Eri, and struggling through her words again, told Eri, "Okay." Eri all but jumped and cheered at the older girl's approval, and that eased the smile he forced ever so warmly. For all of 5 seconds as he ignored the confused but otherwise happy reactions of his classmates, the continuous teasing of deep love in the air from Ishido, and the uneasy but still happy expression from Ochako. Turning his head back down to see Eri moved over a foot to be in front of Tsuyu, hands placed on the girl's knees as they were on Uraraka's, and she asked, "Will you be my mommy too?" The room went so quiet Izuku could hear his heart stop beating for the few seconds following Eri's repeated question. He was but frozen in his seat, back straight, feet planted, hands in his lap, and a smile on his face, losing all joy and content until it was a blank and hollow smile. The scene before him replayed itself, though with less stuttering on Tsuyu's side, and with the same response from Eri, word for word, until Isui accepted and added to the shock going around the room. And it repeated itself again and again, down the line of girls, each accepting with their own hesitation to Eri's question. Any embarrassment present in the room prior had been swapped with confusion, and none more so than in Izuku. He said nothing as Eri went from girl to girl, not to the child or to any of the pleading looks for answers any of his classmates shot him. The smile he had enforced wiped away every passing second until he looked as lost as the rest of the room, par the young girl. When Momo had finished off the couch in the line of accepting the girl's request for a mom, Izuku let his brain go to work. The most sense he could make of everything that had occurred was that maybe Eri just thought all of the girls as good role models. The white-haired girl interacted little with Toru or Tsuyu, despite the latter girl having the experience of dealing and caring for little siblings. but Iri asked them both right after Uraraka, given they sat both seats after her. And she seemed equally excited for having all girls except being her mom's. So she had to see something out of all of them that enticed her to ask them all the same question. But since they all accepted and all seemed confused on the situation, Izuku could at least hope any assumptions of undertones were thrown out the window. And then she had to go a step further, stop in front of Ajiro on the solo couch beside the girls, place her hands on his tail, and ask, "Can you be my mommy too?" If Izuku could mark down the day he was most confused about everything he knew, it would be this day. Ajiro looked equally confused, and Izuku felt so sorry he couldn't answer the silent cry for help the tailed student was giving him. He looked to the rest of the room in Izuku's place, and with the conclusion that no one knew what was happening, and Ashido's go-on gesture with her still trying to keep her cool, he sighed out and went along with the situation, giving Iri his own okay to her question. And Iri lost nothing of happiness to hear those words. Takoyami was asked the same question, much to the same bewilderment from the rest of the room, but it was Dark Shadow who answered yes. To his host's raised eyebrow of a glance, he replied, "I've been waiting for the day we get to be mama birds, and I'll take this. I have been waiting long enough." Taking the quirk's answer as final, Iri left the bird-headed student to bicker with his quirk about the wording and moved on to Ida, still standing by and watching the scenes before him play out. She stood in front of the tall teen, looking up to the sky to meet his eyes as she asked, "Will you be my mommy too?" And with Ida did the train end as he crouched down to be closer to Iri's eye level. "Iri, pardon me if my question comes off as rude, but why are you asking us to be your mommy?" "Daddy said I could," she responded, repeating the mantra she had from the start. "He said it was my choice. So you wanted to ask everyone in this room to be your mother?" The engine teen questioned, receiving a nod as the start of her response. "Not everyone is here, but I really wanted to ask." Iri turned shy again, curling her head to her shoulder and twisting her foot at the toes. Izuku could feel the amount of surprise in the room rising, and he was half tempted to shove it back down and cut in before anything could go further, but he couldn't find the energy in his voice to do so. And so he watched on mute as the conversation between the two went on. "You want to ask everyone in the class to be your mommy?" Iri nodded, and all Izuku did was choke on the air he was already struggling to take in. Because what else was there to do? But Ida continued, blind to Izuku's physically lurching forward to Iri's answer. "All right, but I am a male." Iri nodded again, and Ida faltered in response to that, but didn't let it deter him from continuing. "Boys cannot really be mothers. That is how it works, genetically. What I can be is a father. But I don't want another daddy," Iri cut him off, flipping from shy to confident. "Daddy is already the best daddy. I want a mommy." Before Ida could go on again, the couch across from him cut in. "Iri," Yaoyorozu piped up, turning attention over to her. Under every gaze except Izuku's on her, she flinched, but she carried on. "Can you tell us why you want us all to be your mommy?" "Because all of Daddy's classmates like Daddy," Iri responded matter-of-factly. She didn't seem to notice every one of them lean into their faces of confusion and surprise. And went on, "Everyone looks out for Daddy and cares for him, kinda like mamas do. And Daddy likes everyone too ... And then if Daddy trusts everyone, then ... then I should too. I think Daddy likes being with all of you." The more she spoke, the more shy she became under everyone's stares. "I think you would all be good mommies." Iri. For the first time in what felt like the past several hours in only 10 minutes, Izuku spoke again, returning attention to himself. He ignored a lot of it, though, only caring to see Iri's ruby eyes face him again. Any other words he tried to say got lost in every breath he took, leaving only gasps of air to come out his mouth. Eventually he sputtered a laugh to his own struggles, falling his face into his hand and shaking his head. The few seconds his eyes were closed were all Iri needed to jump into his lap before he saw her coming. He flew back with her arrival, using his other arm to catch her and wrap around her as she fussed over him, thinking he was crying again. He did do that a lot, didn't he? Iri, he finally got out again, enough for the young girl to calm down in his arms and give him room to speak. "You know, you don't have to force yourself to be around everyone if you're not comfortable with that." "But I want to," she argued, surprisingly louder than she was with her cheering. "Daddy likes being around everyone, and I want Daddy to be happy." "I want you to be happy too," Izuku reasoned with her. "That doesn't mean you need to make everyone your mom. But Daddies need a mommy, and everyone's important to you. I don't want to leave anyone out and be rude." The small pout Iri made at the end of her sentence only heaved a heavy breath out of Izuku, followed by both his arms wrapping around her in a hug. "You can never be rude, Iri. I don't even think that's possible if you're gonna have a heart like that." Izuku closed his eyes as he felt Iri return the hug, letting himself calm down from all the panicking he had been doing building up to this moment. "Thank you for looking out for me like this, Iri." He leaned closer down to her, stopping his head right beside hers once he felt her shoulder, and whispered, "Thank you for being a good daughter." Izuku breathed another laugh as Iri hugged him tighter in response. At least he knew overcompensating as a father in place of his own wasn't doing anything bad to Iri's view of love and care. Before he could open his eyes, Izuku felt weight drop onto him and Eri and try to wrap themselves around them. When he did open them, he was greeted to the sight of Ashido hugging them, and he could feel the flush rise in his face. Ashido, what are yo? Family group hug, she exclaimed, and at the very least it wasn't loud enough to burst either of his eardrums. She was probably close to cracking a rib, though. If we're gonna be one big family now, then we should celebrate it with a big hug. Because you'll be getting these a lot more now, little horn buddy. Izuku could feel Eri shake in his arms, and right when he was about to pipe up in worry did she throw her head back and press her own flushed face into Mina's shoulder. The pink-skinned girl took it as a sign to smile brighter and hug the two tighter. Toru jumped on the pile next, placed beside Ashido so Izuku could at least have some breathing room and not feel completely crushed, and the people only piled on from there until all the girls had trapped the father and daughter against the couch. The three boys trickled in afterwards, given the urgings of the first two girls of the pile and the convincing of the rest, until all nine were piling and smiling with the beet-red family in the center, and watching Eri slowly ease into the crowd around her and smile softly from the girls closest, cooing and complimenting her. Izuku knew it was worth the new bruise on his side to accept the family she was making for him. It was strange watching a building fly past his head but feeling no wind as it passed. It played with his senses, but he couldn't say he didn't expect it. Building after building, and lone stone after lone stone passed him in the black and purple haze that blew on for miles. Packs of towers and shops would scatter apart and brush past him, only to reform back into a city block once away again. Izuku recognized the tattered and thick smoke-infested world around him, along with his own hazy body still incomplete. Both his hands were visible, and he assumed a good chunk of his head was, but it irritated his nose to have smoke wisping from where his mouth was supposed to be. The need to sneeze was far too detailed of a phantom urge he knew wouldn't happen regardless if he gave into it or not. It has felt like far too long since I've last seen you here, a voice spoke out from behind him. Izuku suppressed the need in his nose and turned around, finding the first holder of One for All sitting behind him, on the same jagged rock that overlooked the decaying and fallen city of the dreamscape. You've been quite the busy man, kid. If Izuku could have laughed, he would have, since he last saw any of his quirk's previous wielders, back when Class B and his own had a battle competition in the middle of last semester. He had been focused on his schoolwork and catching Eri up to speed on the holiday checklist of the winter season. For all his practice and thought he had been putting into his quirk, making use of full cowl had dropped for his academic studies, and Black Whip had yet to reappear in any of his class's physical training exercises. He was beginning to wonder if the previous uses were hiding from him since then. The frail man in front of him laughed weakly as he dropped his legs to cross one over the other. Hiding wouldn't be too far off, he commented, startling Izuku from his thoughts. We're always watching you, kid, no matter what you do. Your school's been taking it easy on you, and you've been thinking of your own things to do with One for All and your kid, so we decided to step back and let you pace yourself again. He appreciated that. Izuku couldn't help but lean back at the no matter what you do portion of his speech, but he was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that they were at least mindful of his privacy. But the last two times he had been in this scenario picked at his brain. The first holder and the user of Black Whip had called him in for a purpose. He assumed they had some kind of power still to bring him out of his conscious state and talk to him directly. If he was a betting boy, the previous holders were going to stay 3 for 3 on having him in this desolate place for a reason. I wish I was the one that brought you here, the first holder sighed, casting a glance over his shoulder absent-mindedly. The rest are still hesitant to meet with you, I must admit. Hiro had no intention of talking with you so soon until you forced his quirk into your hands. You've been ever hesitant since to play with what this quirk offers you completely. I wasn't planning to bring you again until you were certain on your next course of action, but this wasn't my choice. Izuku squinted his eyes at the older man in confusion, trying to decipher the man's words. If it wasn't his choice, and it wasn't one of the other holders, and it didn't sound like a possibility, then why was he here? Had he somehow managed to bring himself into this demented place just by having his quirk, and what he could do to improve his use of it plague his mind every so often? The shake of the first holder's head was a sign Izuku took the man was reading his thoughts again. And while the man flinching where he sat didn't stir a thought out of Izuku, the voice behind him snapped his eyes wide open. You must be the young man everyone was talking about. He knew that voice. It wasn't a perfect replica from his memory, but the smooth accent over it couldn't hide the difference. Ignoring the grimace of the first holder and the shiver down where his own spine would be, Izuku turned around to find the source of the voice and the other man standing among the pluming haze and smoke. He didn't recognize the man's face, or any detail of his head for that matter, and the snow-white suit he wore was a stark contrast from the one he wore in Kamino. The man in total was failing to strike a chord in Izuku's memory, but it struck a far more fearful chord in the back of his mind. This wasn't his memory of the man, was it? I wasn't expecting my brother's quirk to be in the hands of someone so young, All for One commented, looking Izuku's hazy form up and down. But with how long I've been gone, I think it's only fair my little brother surprises me with his new friends. It was 2 in the morning when Izuku jolted awake, greeted to the sight of his room dimly lit by the moonlight shining in between the clouds and pelting snow. Everything was still in one piece. It all fared better than the last time he had woken up from the dreamscape, Izuku noted. The soft breathing behind him was enough to know his own abrupt jump awake hadn't done the same to the one-horned girl beside him, hugging onto her cleffery pillow tighter than any she'd given to him. It wasn't like the plush doll had to breathe, though, so you win some you lose some, he reasoned. He crawled carefully out of his bed not to wake Yuri. Keeping his arm away from her grasp was the most he had to watch out for, and tiptoed to his desk. He nearly collapsed into his chair with a sigh and winced as it creaked when it took the whole of his weight. But the noise hadn't woken the young girl either, so he took what he could get. He looked over his belongings. His eyes trailed over every notebook strewn about, each stack of papers that were his homework assignments, each collectible he had standing about to decorate the place as his. The first thing he reached for was his phone. Happy New Year, young Midoriya. Thanks all might. Happy New Year. His fingers lingered over the keypad, hesitant to type something, anything, out. It had been a whole day since news had surfaced of All For One's death, but All Might hadn't mentioned even a notion about it to Izuku. Why hadn't he? The late villain was the origin of their quirk, and his death alone probably meant more than the new inheritor had even pondered over, having spent the time hiding Yuri from the news than focusing more on it. But All For One was All Might's enemy first and Izuku's no more, and he knew that. There was probably a lot the former number one hero had to manage and look over, personally and publicly, regarding the passing of his enemy. He had visited the villain in Tartarus before, and Izuku wondered if he visited again to see what was left of his mortal enemy. All Might would have good reason not to bring Izuku into the matter. Didn't mean the radio silence panged his heart any less. He tossed his phone to the side and took a notebook and a pen into his hands. He clicked on his overhead lamp and flipped his book to an empty set of pages. If he was going to tell All Might about what he saw, he should at least have his own understanding of what he was going to talk about. It's what he did for his first dream with the original holder of One for All and a wielder of the quirk in between then and now. It's probably something he should do when it was about the man who gave the quirk at the start. Izuku had seen the All For Ones recreated from the first holder's memory, a near replica to the man he had seen in his dream from what felt like moments ago. Had it interacted only with his brother, the first holder of the combined quirk, Izuku would have been convinced it was just another memory reenactment. But All For One had interacted with him, he had talked about him. Izuku doubted a simple recreation from scratch would do that, and he doubted the other wielders would play a prank like that on him without good reason if at all. It had to be traces of All For One himself left over in the stockpiling quirk he passed on to his brother. But how? Izuku assumed One For All was a strange quirk from the start. It was the first he had heard of a quirk possessing the ability to be passed on from one person to another in a means not related to birth and blood. Then he learned not only was it not one quirk but two, a quirk that stockpiles and a quirk that can pass down quirks. He'd then later learned they weren't the only quirks he had access to. But the revelation that it was combined with a stockpiling quirk had implanted itself in his mind the most. What was his quirk stockpiling? Power was one thing he knew for certain, given how familiar he had become to wielding the strength All Might himself could output. That didn't exactly encompass the souls of the previous wielders and their quirks, plus the man who originally had the quirk and the man who passed it along to his brother. All Might hadn't mentioned the quirk being capable of holding souls. The hero hadn't experienced the quirk the way Izuku had in under a year's time of having it. And he had yet to see any signs that All For One and the man he stole the quirk from were resting alongside the other wielders of One For All. Was there more information All Might was holding back from telling him? Or would any of these theories fly over his head too? Word of mouth wasn't exactly the most reliable form of information passing. How much more to the quirk was there that neither of them knew about yet? Who's that? Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin and seat at Yuri's voice. The young girl had climbed out of bed and was supporting herself on her toes to look over the desk edge with her doll. She seemed oblivious to the heart attack she almost gave him, focused instead on the notebook he had lying open. As he eased back into his seat did he process what she had asked. And looking down at the notebook he found the rough sketch he had made of All For One. Why had he drawn that? Izuku's hands fumbled as he dropped them into his lap and Yuri's bright, though tired, red eyes turned over to him. He's a grandfather of mine. He passed away some time ago. It's been a while since I last saw him. Wanted to try and remember him somehow. Yuri bought it without argument, turning back to the drawing he made with the same placid expression. What are you doing up, Yuri? It's barely past 2 in the morning. You weren't in bed, she responded, easing back down to her feet and leaning her head on her plushie. And it was cold. And you were talking a lot. Oh, I'm sorry for waking you. He scooped Yuri up into his arms, setting the girl down on his lap. She melted against him, leaning against his body. He wasn't aware he was muttering out loud again. Heck, he didn't even realize he was drawing All For One while he was thinking. I was trying not to do that. That's on me. Come on, let's get you back to bed. Why were you awake? Eri asked Izuku as he set her back in bed. His fingers twitched as they passed under her and pulled away so he could walk back to his desk and click off his lamp. He wasn't exactly keen on cover stories. The drawing on his desk caught his eye before the light flicked off. Too much was floating around, all for one: his death. The Yakuza who killed him, and the appearance of him again while he slept, possibly within his quirk to boot. Why did he have to be involved in it at all? A dream, he admitted as he returned to the bed and climbed beside Eri. Got startled in it and it woke me up. She bundled up against him, turning her back away to keep the doll from getting in the way and humming as he pulled the comforter over them. Was it a bad one? I don't think it was. His arm curled under her and the doll to lay a hand over hers. I'm just trying to process it still. But I don't think it was a bad one. Frightening. Yes, Izuku wouldn't call his encounter with the soul of All for One anything less. A nightmare. Not yet. Not until he knew what impact it was going to have on his quirk, if any at all. Besides, I got you here to protect me if anything bad happens. I have nothing to be afraid of with a hero protecting me. But you're my hero. Eri giggled out in response, brushing her head into Izuku's chin to cite a laugh from him. You're supposed to protect me. Then we'll protect each other, Izuku suggested. I saved you, you saved me. We can be our own little hero group. The Midoriya heroes. Eri yawned through another giggle. I get to be a hero. Of course you do. I couldn't think of a better person to be my partner against crime. Eri dipped her head back into her doll, curling around it so Izuku could curl in on her. Even with a quirk like mine, Izuku's gaze dipped to the horn peeking over her hair. It had steadied its length at a few inches tall before, though far from the foot-long spike of bone Aizawa had told him it had grown the day of the Yakuza raid. It looked far shorter now, though still visible enough to disassociate from the same stark white of her own hair. The winter weather blew outside the patio, letting the nightlight dance around in specks over Eri's hair. Even with a quirk like yours. His eyelids drooped as he eased his head over hers. In the morning ... we'll come up with your hero name ... okay. I must admit my surprise to hear you prefer a name made as an insult, even if made up, to be what the public should call you. It was his voice Izuku noticed first, not the haze of the world around him or that which made his body. Not even the cyclone of structures had made it into his eyes before All for One's words reached his ears. If he had a mouth, Izuku was sure he would have sighed before anything else. The smoke that blew out in front of his face acted as a good enough fallback instead. It seems my efforts to stop the pitiful phenomenon of heroes did not happen by my own hand. The deceased villain carried on. Izuku gazed over his smoky shoulder to the man, standing on the edge of their rock and watching the dreamscape roll by. The first wielder sat between them, one shoulder to Izuku and the other to All for One. But my efforts do not stop with me. Those loyal to my cause will see out my wishes. Izuku squinted. Had he retained all his memories from before his death? No, the first wielder butted in, looking at Izuku between his white locks of hair. He's sorting through the other memories of all who have carried this quirk. You and your mentor were the most recent people to come in range of him and any news about him, so he started with your master. His memories were cut in between when he gave the quirk to me and what he's last seen. It will be a while for him. I have all the time in the world to watch my life flash before my eyes. Brother. All for One looked behind to the two of them. I remember a time you said you would stop me. You have grown far more lazed than when I last saw you. His brother smiled thinly and looked back to the villain. There's no need for me to stop you now. And with the promising world around this boy, I have no reason to be worried of his future or the challenges he will be facing. He looked away, out through the sea of smoke and watched as buildings huddled together to form a city. You're no longer a threat to anyone. It would be pointless to be afraid of you now. That was a weight off Izuku's absent chest. If he couldn't trust the form of All for One, he should at least be able to trust the first wielder. So he truly was dead and present within the quirk, but relatively useless to the man he was when alive. His followers and believers live on. Still, the first wielder commented. That was true, Izuku agreed. Shigaraki and the League had been silent ever since the raid of Kamino, though hushed whispers of their involvement could be heard in the Yakuza raid and the Deka City incident. If they were reacting at all about the news of All for One's death, if they were even paying attention to the news over their own actions to begin with, they were keeping quiet on their response. Izuku remembered how emotional every action of Shigaraki's were, how rooted in himself his outbursts and arrivals were. Maybe a response within a day's time of the news was too much to ask for, but it sounded more in character for bad to become worse instantaneously when the League was involved. Suddenly, All for One flickered out of sight, leaving Izuku with the first wielder of One for All. He spun around, looking for any sight of the villain, but found not a trace of the man among the floating cityscapes. He's digging further through the memories of the other wielders. The first wielder was standing by his side in an instant, looking out over the bellowing smoke. He hadn't the quirk for long, so his own time with the stockpiling power he passed on was short. I believe he had given it away not even a day after finding it. His presence here is nothing more than the memory of the man he was before he had passed it on. I have known of his presence within this quirk since I came here, but it's always been fleeting and minute in the crowd of other memories. Never believed it would take on the same state as we have. The answers Izuku was given was only piling on questions. So All for One and the other wielders of One for All were only the memories of them before they passed on the quirk. Was the man in front of him not the real soul of the first wielder? Then were none of them. Then the memory of All for One was the man running around in the quirk and not the actual soul of his mentor's long-time sworn enemy. If everything in the quirk was built off memories, then how was he able to harness the quirks of others, or it at all? When quirks were supposed to be a direct genetic trait passed down in natural ways, while One for All was unnatural in its conception. Izuku was grateful to have his hands so he could massage his temple. You are the first of the wielders to approach One for All in this way, the first wielder mentioned as he looked his way. When I had told you that you would be different from the rest of us, I meant it. All Might has said you would usher in a new wave of heroes, a new age for the profession to become. The death of my brother changes little of my hopes for you. It has only helped to reinforce who you will become. He set a hand out before them both, letting his palm glow before them. Izuku remembered it the same way All Might's had glowed when he first told him about the quirk almost 2 years ago. Do you know why One for All has continued to be passed on from person to person? To defeat All for One, Izuku recalled. The topic had come up several times before, as he remembered the villain's father vowing to defeat him and All Might's own promise to do the same. It was probably the same mantra every wielder between them had carried. Even when the big bad was locked away in Tartarus, the lingering fear he would break out and he would be a problem. His problem didn't leave Izuku. He was dead now. A memory of him was all that remained within Izuku's mind. Both the man he once was and the man the new wielder of One for All briefly knew. Not just in your mind. The first wielder's interruption brought Izuku to look at him, finding the man's face wearing a small smile. There's the memory of him in you, but there is a memory of him in All Might as well. In the minds of the public who watched the two of them fight. In the minds of those who followed him blindly, seeking for power. In the minds of those like Shigaraki, aiming to take his place. My brother may be gone from your world physically, but he lives on in everyone's mind, in a way. It too must be snuffed out. There is no villain more public or powerful than All for One. Izuku couldn't rack his brain for an even close contender. All for One was one man with many quirks, and everyone else was One for One. He was a man hell-bent on tearing apart the world of heroes and taking away quirks from those in power to let those without revolt. He enjoyed murder, by his own hand or by those he let run loose. He could see the semblance of him growing in Shigaraki, Stain, Overhaul, Muscular, and many of the villains he had seen on the news before. Bits and pieces of him in everyone, with all of them offering something else to form their own twisted view on the world. Shigaraki was one of the few left standing even close to matching the monster behind the mask. You're next. One for All is your quirk, given to you not in the hopes that you would have to face its longtime foe, but that it could live on in someone worthy of its fruits of labor. That it could be used to inspire others and not follow in the trail of blood spilled in the war before even its birth. It was All Might's hopes that with you, the quirk can start a new life beyond the fight. The first wielder turned his head slowly, the white of his iris glistening from the light in his palm. What are your hopes for this quirk? Midoriya Izuku. It was a few minutes past 6 when Izuku woke up, with sunlight barely trickling through the cloudy sky and soft falling snow. The first thing that caught his attention was the creaking outside his door, and the muffled conversations of his classmates passing his door on their way downstairs. It sounded like the usual early risers of Ida and Todoroki, but he could hear the chirpiness of Dark Shadow's voice following them, so he knew there was more than them. Next in line for his attention was Uri, shuffling around in her sleep and pressing a hand into Izuku's cheek. She had managed to spread her limbs like a star atop her doll, a foot draped over his side and a hand loose atop his face. Her snores were only soft exhales punctuated by pressing her hand against his cheek again. Izuku had to be careful to pick himself out of bed this time. He had grabbed his phone to snap a picture of Uri's pose until the open notebook on his desk caught his eye. It was as he left it, open on the page of All for One's rough sketch of a headshot. It was a dead serious look. No smile and no life in the eyes. The mouth was a frown, but it lacked any signs of disappointment. Izuku felt it instead, reminded by the fact he had information to share with All Might. He wished there was a happier note his last semester to his first year at Yuei than that, but he had little an option in the matter. The sooner his mentor knew the truth, the better. Pushing the inevitable aside, Izuku went ahead on capturing a few pictures of Uri's sleeping form and sending them to their mother. He smiled as the young girl rolled her head and drool trailed down the side of her lip, and more so at the bubbly smiling emoticons his mother sent in response. He enjoyed indulging in the happiness over his thoughts of the conversation he had left in his dream. The conversation he had between both ends of that conversation, however, reignited in his mind as he looked to Uri's horn, glistening from the faint light of day. What would your hero name be? He asked aloud softly, knowing full well he wasn't getting a reply in response. What could she use as a hero name? What would be a code name to best suit her? He could list off the top of his fingers the things she absolutely loved. What could he make out of candy, apples, chocolate, Mirio, music, and himself? He had minutes to spare before he needed to join his classmates for homeroom, so he rested himself back on the bed gently beside her. She shifted and leaned towards the sudden weight on the mattress. He took one of her hands in his as it reached for him, and he leaned in as she mumbled in her sleep, "Back ... my daddy. Deku can." His finger brushed over her knuckles as she continued to fight lazily, until the gentle connection of their hands had her grab at his. He let her, ceasing her attempts in the brawl, finding Izuku in the middle of whatever foe she was previously up against. He took notice of her horn, having grown back into a few inches of height, and he pondered what was triggering it. It had spiked before when she used her quirk, but Izuku had seen it bounce between heights as a part of his family. Was it an emotional trigger over the use of her own quirk? Given her comment last night, Izuku leaned to and hoped for the former. She was still afraid of it, he knew. Afraid of what involving it? She wouldn't explain, but he could garner a guess or two for an answer over what she couldn't do with it and what others had done with it in her stead. He wanted to help her pass that no matter how long it would take. With her quirk only affecting people, it could be a long time until she was comfortable using it again. But he believed she could do it. She'd make a fine Deku if she wanted that as her hero name, he chimed in his head. His grip tightened on her hand ever so slightly. What would it be like to have her quirk, if he could test it for her so she wouldn't be afraid? So, All Might's fingers drummed along the side of his teacup. All for One's soul is currently reciting along the rest of our predecessors. Izuku nodded his head gravely. His eyes jumped from his own cup on the table to his mentor across it and back. It wasn't what I wanted to wake up to either, he noted, the bags under his teacher's eyes catching his attention. I'd argue the past few days feel more like a surreal dream than anything, the retired hero commented with a weak laugh. He took a small sip of his drink and leaned back against his office couch. I'd say the new year started off with a bang. Now that he's no longer physically around, but it sounds insensitive no matter who he was, and I don't think celebrating your situation would be any better. It's not like he's actually here, Izuku argued, rubbing his hands over each other. He's like the rest of them. I don't know they're there until I've lost consciousness and I see them in dreams. He's ... he's dead and some younger version of him is left inside One for All, but it's not like he can do anything. It's not like he's a voice constantly talking in the back of my head. Pardon me if it does little to settle my worries. All Might set his cup aside, leaning over his lap towards his apprentice. My efforts to keep All for One out of your hair were not supposed to be his opportunity to dig beneath your scalp. Even if I wanted him to come back simply so you wouldn't have to deal with his presence in any form. His body has already been cremated. The officials in Tartarus and the Heroes Association weren't open to taking the risk of letting him rise from the grave so easily. Izuku could feel the shiver down his spine, even with the windows closed. So he's ... gone. If he wasn't in your head, yes, he would be. But he isn't in my head. Izuku sighed and massaged his temple. He had hoped his mentor and idol would be less stressed over the news than he was. He's not the All for One you fought, that I watched you punch into the ground. He's apparently a him from however long ago it was since he passed on our quirk to his brother, and all he knows is what he knew up until that point and everything we know that the other wielders knew. All he knows is that he lost in the end, that he failed what he wanted to do. The League has been absent for months and he left them with far less than what they had when he was around. With him dead, there's no telling how many of them are even left fighting with Shigaraki or how many will leave him now. He can look through my memories all he wants and all he will know is that his legacy ended in failure. The silent stare All Might gave him wasn't exactly settling Izuku's stomach. The distant clattering of his classmates chatting over lunch down the halls were muffled through the office door. His mind had been plagued by thoughts and assumptions on All for One and the facts of the matter as he knew them, overlapping even his time in class. As far as the once villain had shown himself and his long-deceased brother would explain, Izuku could only assume he was further from danger than he was in it. It wouldn't get rid of the problem at hand. And he wanted nothing more than to get rid of the memories of the man who had plagued the lives of all the heroes before him. But if it wasn't going to be a problem, then why should he consider it as such? You aren't wrong about that, young Midoriya, All Might commented in a hush. All for One did fail, but he's left behind a legacy of many more villains, probably more than we even know about. They may never be as strong as he was or could ever become, but just because he's dead doesn't mean the rest of the world is going to stop with him. I know. Izuku gripped at his lap, his hands white and shaking. But the way he is now, at least we have one less villain to worry about causing us trouble. That we do, All Might agreed. And ... as long as you are alright despite this mess, I'll lay off on discussing it more. I will be telling Chiyo so she knows ahead of time if you have to come to her regarding him, along with everyone else who knows about One for All, is just to get another perspective on this to settle things one way or the other. And with the League's main mode of transportation is still locked away in Tartarus with his master gone from the picture, there may be information we can garner from him to shed light on the situation. Don't tell Kakin. Izuku's interruption stopped All Might quickly, and the greenette flinched slightly from his own action. He's got a lot on his plate right now. He doesn't need to be a part of this, especially if this becomes nothing in the end anyways. He'd hate to waste his time like that. I don't think either of you should have to mull over this during the internships upcoming. Oh, right. Principal Nedzu was having the classes jump back on the internship bandwagon to open their final semester of the school year. He was almost out of luck, watching the rest of his classmates return to their prior districts and agencies from last year while he was sidelined by Bubble Girl and Centipter as they tried to pick up the pace of running the agency Nighteye was previously in charge of. Katsuki was in a similar state of disappointment. What with Best Jeanist Mia in the wake of the Dekia City incident. Speaking of which, I noticed the two of you had applied to intern at Endeavor's agency alongside Shoto. Izuku nodded. He offered it to us over text. Or at least to me since I was home for Christmas. Shoto thinks we'd both be welcomed at Endeavor's agency to learn under him, and I thought it wouldn't be a bad opportunity to learn under him. The retired pro hero mirrored his student's nod. It would be a good experience to learn under a hero like Enji... but he only accepted Bakugu's application and Shoto's return. He turned you down. The reveal jolted Izuku to his feet, nearly knocking his legs into the coffee table between them when he rose. What? Why? Why did he turn me down? Because of what was added to your profile, young Midoriya. And we both know what that is. All Might's statement stilled the young hero in training, leaving the teen to ease himself into a sullen expression. He knew well what his mentor was talking about, the Suicide Watch decision. Izuku had yet to see his own profile since Chain came to the dorms and handed them papers, and he remembered the notes regarding his physical and mental health the Heroes Association had sat on for months since Izuku applied to Yuei. He didn't know how public that information would be to anyone outside of himself and his family, but it seemed it reached far enough for other heroes to be notified of it, that alongside the self-appointed fatherly duties you have over Eri, and the recent developments with Blackwhip still out of your control, and you think you're unfit to keep up with his regimen and teachings, All Might elaborated, that your time and effort would be better spent with an agency with simpler tasks for you to practice your control and keep closer to your family. He'd probably argue Bakugo has less on his plate than you do, too, if we were to ask him. That wasn't something Izuku had taken into account. That Endeavor would outright refuse their applications, much less just his own. He couldn't help collapsing back onto the couch sullenly in response. I'd think to agree with him if I thought micromanaging what you can and can't do was the right way around this. A jolt passed through Izuku's heart for a single beat as his mentor continued. I understand where he's coming from. When he looks at you and finds himself unfitted to teach you what you need to, at least from a surface-level view. As great as learning under the current #1 hero would be, I don't believe even I'd recommend him for teaching you on Blackwhip or any form of therapy he thinks you might need. There are many heroes better suited for that. I don't need therapy, Izuku interjected weakly. I didn't think you need it, either. Eri has a school of people who will help you in raising her and keeping her safe, and you know that. And if All for One really is going to be an afterthought in your head, then I won't press on the matter until it steps out of line. One for All isn't our quirk anymore, young Midoriya, it's yours. You're exploring areas of it I never saw before, and even if I still had it I doubt there's little I could teach you in how to control what you have now, and we know Blackwhip isn't the last of the quirks you might find yourself using. And what happens with it now is more up to you than me. All I can do now is work with the rest of your teachers to help guide you forward. Izuku could feel the bulging in his wrists, threatening to burst from his skin and yank the former #1 across the room. His other hand brushed along the cuff of his sleeve, finding no bumps present. Thank you, All Might. I guess I'll have to look for another agency to intern at. I had someone in mind for that actually. All Might rose from his couch and traversed the room to his desk, swiping a folder from the countertop. It's why I pulled you over once the lunch bell rang. After finding Enji's rejection sent to the school, I decided to spend some time looking for another hero who could take you in. Young Takoyami is in a similar predicament to yourself. Actually, that ectoplasm was helping to find a replacement for that gave me the idea. He made his way back over, passing to Izuku's side of the table and standing beside the green student. The folder hung between his hands. Has Endeavor's words changed your mind on what kind of hero you want to intern under? Or do you still believe intensity and a situation like his is still on the table? Izuku rose to his own feet slowly, analyzing the cream folder his mentor balanced between them before he looked to his teacher's face. I don't want to hold myself back, he replied simply. I don't want anything to. He put on a smile, soft and honest, and his mentor mirrored the expression. Good. The folder was shoved into Izuku's chest. Fill out the application before lunch. It took me too long to convince her to take you in. and she wants an answer as soon as possible. I don't want a kick to the ribs. Izuku kicked himself mentally for the small thought bubble that convinced him Endeavor would have been more stress-inducing to intern under. Endeavor was taller than him, ranking as the current #1 hero in the world, taking Bakugo and Shoto under his wings and running arguably the most popular agency in the world. His body twitched as Maruko's ears did, her eyes continuing to gaze up and down his shivering form. Now he was the tallest in the room, occupied by him and the 5th-ranked pro hero worldwide with no one around to join them because she was the highest-ranking freelanced hero in the business. It was the latter of the information that he was having trouble settling in his head, because he knew just how little heroes would run interns without an agency of their own. "Thank you, All Might," he prayed silently. The old sack of bones was right, Maruko opened, an ear flickering to the mask over his face. "You really do look like a rabbit." "All Might, why?" Izuku sobbed internally, holding himself from falling backwards in tears. He was grateful for how much his mask hid. "So," the hero continued, stalking around him like a predator, "All Might also said you wouldn't button or slow me down on patrols. He was insistent you learn under me directly. And I'm guessing these steel legs of you are part of the problem." Izuku gave a shaky nod to confirm her guess. "I don't do groups, so you best tag along and do your best not to eat my dust or rely on me. You at least got the guts to follow me around and not get in my way if I let you tag along." "Yes, ma'am," he responded in haste. He knew the rules of interning under her, a list she had given his teacher to give to him to skim through and memorize on the train ride over. Her guess based off his boots was spot on, too. Maruko was one of the few heroes Izuku watched online to emulate the fighting style of, given how proficient she and several overheroes were with their legs in battles and even rescue situations. His arms weren't cards off the table just yet, but putting all his attention where he could was a better plan than lagging behind for the rest of his body to catch up. It's not like One for All was showing any new changes yet, so he had no reason to rush what he didn't know. "Good." A clang erupted behind him, startling Izuku out of his thoughts and turning him around. The door to the study room the pro hero had reserved was blasted open, its hinges creaking as it eased away from the wall it had swung into from the rabbit girl's leg. "Then let's go." Izuku shied behind the #5 hero from the eyes of the library that followed them. Maruko had no agency, which meant she had no official place for them to meet, which resulted in a meet-up at a public library and possibly some damages to a wall where a door handle had indented itself. Probably not the best impression to leave on his first visit. Izuku grimaced. Maruko was at least kind enough to leave a stack of yen on the front counter as they left, he acting in her place to bow an apology as he hurried after her. "All right then." Maruko brushed off the attention of civilians that caught attention of her presence, and Izuku attempted the same as he focused on her voice over others' chatter. "That costume's all you need, kid." "Why, yes ma'am," he responded with a quick nod. "Then keep up." Suddenly the rabbit hero was off, shooting from the sidewalk with a kick and leaving a small indent in the concrete where her foot had been. Izuku turned around in a worry, watching her soar off above the buildings and activated full cowl before he took off down the street after her. He launched off into the sky as he reached the first crosswalk, trailing being her figure as he dashed off rooftops to keep up with her fewer and farther launches. She was fast and she was powerful, Izuku had never doubted that. Watching her fly off with each leap while he struggled to follow along running along the rooftops, it reminded him of All Might, the way she posed in the air, her legs tucked together as she soared. There was power in her legs to lift off like that and leave little damage in her wake with each leap. Guess the technique was universal, Izuku assumed, and he'd have to use it himself once he had the power in his legs to match theirs. At least in the meantime in his training, he could take in the sight of the city while following her. Maruko was one of the few heroes to stay in their hometown when she got her license, and Izuku could see why. Hiroshima was a pretty city, and jumping from rooftop to rooftop was he able to experience it better than the TV had ever shown him. There were very little heroes who actually came from the city. In the top 50, there was only one other hero Izuku knew that info of by heart and chose to keep their work within their home limits. With how fast Maruko could move, she possibly had the best excuse to stay close to home when she could reach Tokyo in just a few short movements. If she wasn't so blunt and loud when approaching people and answering questions on interviews, Izuku was positive she would have been a closer runner-up to the #1 position in the rankings. "Where you going, short stack?" Izuku snapped out of his thoughts as his foot caught the edge of a building in surprise and sent him tumbling across the rooftop. His back impacted the ground into a hard stop, and he groaned as he pushed himself up to sit. The rabbit hero's legs fell into his view with a quiet landing in front of him, the hero leaning on one leg as she frowned down at him. "The old pro said you could follow along well," she chided him as he rushed himself up and dusted off his uniform. "Thought you'd be attentive. Space out like that again and I'm leaving you behind for good." Sorry, Maruko," he apologized with a quick bow. His thought bubbles would be the death of his, he chastised internally. "I won't let it happen again." Better not. With a quick turn on her heel, she shot off again, across the street into another rooftop. Izuku took a deep breath through his nose. He needed an internship. And interning with any of the best was exactly what he needed to experience his quirk best. Anything that could push him and his quirk, or even quirks, further is what he needed most of all. He wasn't going to get any better easing around with a quirk like his, not after waiting 11 more years than anyone else to get one. He lost one opportunity already, and he wasn't going to lose another one just as quickly. Full cowl sparked to life again, and he rocketed after the pro hero just as she landed on the other building. Fayumi would often joke about Shoto having a sixth sense, or that he'd make a pretty good detective if he wanted to pursue that career. It was an offer he was all too quick to turn down with his eyes on the prize of becoming the greatest hero. That didn't mean he didn't understand where his joke came from. The Midoriya All-Might bulletin board in his room didn't do much to stop his sister from continuing the nickname of Togata. He could understand fully well where her conclusion on the subject derived from. His tendency to sit back and analyze those around him, picking out from a crowd who would be the most troublesome to deal with. In public places, it was all about sizing up anyone who could snap and threaten the public at any moment. In class, it was about who else was trying their hardest to be the number one and give him a run for his money. Midoriya and Bakugo were easily the ones who fit that classification. But Yaoyorozu, Ida, Kirishima, and even Ashido were strong contenders to outdoing the three of them for the rankings and the public perception. The tendency itself was one his father ingrained in him early on, and while it had died down from being as competitive as it was back at the sports festival, it lingered on in other ways. The Midoriya All-Might was one example, yes, but it wasn't the only digging he did with the little surface information he was given. Bakugo scoffed and brushed his bottom lip with his knuckles, looking over the city skyline from atop the new #1 hero's agency. "It's dumb you kicked Deku from this," he commented, gazing at Endeavor from the corner of his eyes. "Half and half was the one who told us we'd get to intern here. And whether or not you could was still up to me." Shoto's father responded over his shoulder, keeping his own gaze on the city. The flames on his shoulders cackled under the winter weather, and their heat tickled Shoto's skin even from afar. "Had Shoto not brought up either of you to me, I wouldn't have considered this myself. You and Midoriya are both impressive students, don't twist my words. But an internship in my agency isn't an open invitation. Your acceptance was my choice, and Midoriya's denial was too," Shoto commented, drawing an elongated sigh from his father. "With his absence, I wasn't expecting either of you to bring him up more." There was a distaste to his words Shoto could pick up, more disappointed than disgusted, but crude all the same. "I presumed your own desires to get stronger would have preceded most other thoughts." "That's 'cause you excluded the nerd for no good reason," Bakugo retorted, his breath easing out in a long stream of cold air. Shoto was inclined to agree, an act he was all too sure the blonde would try to twist away from. He hadn't given Bakugo or Midoriya the offer to intern under his father with him if he believed the offer wouldn't be open to them. While he was still far from a man Shoto could trust, his father had gradually mellowed in his attitude, so much so that Shoto had heartily believed the old man would have accepted both his classmates to join the internship opportunity. Endeavor took a gaze over to them both, landing on his own son first before turning to the other boy. "Given his profile provided by the Heroes Association, I had every reason to turn down Midoriya's application. The kid has plenty on his plate, and he has other places to be more important than interning under me." A red and a white eyebrow furrowed Midoriya's hot profile. Shoto remembered his own, given to him by the representative the association sent to their dorms last semester with a handful of papers for him and his classmate. He was handed plenty of notes on the use and growth of his quirk and the endless possibilities for sidekick and pro hero work in his future, being labeled as the son of the world's current #1 hero. He wasn't particularly fond of the association's choices of words, and the chain gentlemen who came to their school offered more in the way of businesses built on keeping a hero's family safe when the name they made for themselves worked part-time as a target on their back, on and off the job. Shoto had no so discreetly shoved the papers under his futon and forgotten about their placement once or thrice. Deku's stronger than what any pencil pusher behind a desk can note of him. Bakugo's praise of Midoriya was far more pleasant than Shoto was expecting out of the blonde, as he snapped out of his own thoughts. "I'm sure he is," his father agreed. "But the boy has enough responsibilities as it is. And with a new member in his family self-proclaiming him as her father figure, he should spend more time looking after her and finding a balance in his life instead of committing to this. If he's smart enough, he will have heeded my denial as a message to take it easy for the time being." Shoto dug into a lot of things for information he wasn't given. The Midoriya All-Might was one example, yes, but it wasn't the only digging he did with the little surface information he was given. As surprised as his father's praise and judgment on Midoriya's fatherhood was leaving him, the answer he gave wasn't leaving Shoto satisfied. He doubted the Hero Association would call Midoriya weak in any sense, if not just undertrained. and Eri had more than just the green teen to look to for guidance and support, especially nowadays as she greeted Shoto into the new year asking him to be her mommy along with the rest of the class. If Midoriya needed to find a balance between work and his life outside it, there was no reason Endeavor would turn him down. Not when he had promised to train Shoto and Bakugo about finding their own balances too. His father may not be the best role model as a father, but Shoto didn't doubt the new number one wouldn't have something to say on the matter. Enough about him. Endeavor's costume bellowed a new wave of flames over those pre-existing. The two teenagers before him snapped to attention. I may not be fit to teach the boy what he needs, but I have just enough to teach the two of you. And with one less present, we'll have more time to balance out your attitudes and quirks. I don't expect either of you to be slacking around just because you're a man short. You'll be picking up work in his place as any other hero would. If you want to grow stronger, then I expect you both to give it your all. No holding back. Shoto noted the grimace Bakugo wore before agreeing to Endeavor's words loudly. But the fire and ice user held back his tongue as he nodded along. Something was off. Maybe it was nothing as big as he thought it to be, but something was there nonetheless. There was no reason to push for answers now, however. He'd find out eventually. Better to keep his attention on the now instead.